This girl was staring worriedly at her reflection in the mirror. She felt that her outfit looked nothing like that of a noble princess, not only because she couldn't even secure basic necessities, but also because she was wearing a maid's uniform. Wearing a maid's clothes was her own choice, however. She thought it would be fine if she could just live on as a maid. Her name was Vivian, the empire's most neglected 16th princess. Because she was out of favor, no one in the palace recognized her, and even her personal maids had left one by one. 3 years ago, she was the only one left in her palace, her very existence forgotten. So she shed her magnificent gowns, changed into a maid's uniform, and lived freely under the name Lucia. She had been preparing for her 19th birthday all this time. This was because when she was 12, she started having very strange dreams every night. Everything in her dreams was incredibly realistic, and without exception, they all came true in real life. In her dreams, she had also foreseen a future she could not accept. When she turned 19, the king would die, and she would be sold to the greedy Count Matun, forced into a miserable marriage. When she realized she lacked the power to change her fate, she once despaired and resented the world. She decided to starve herself to death. But after a few days, the thought that it would take a long time for her body to be found if she starved there gave her the courage to live on. As a maid, she stepped out of the palace gates. Looking at the clear sky, she couldn't help but sigh. If I were the only princess of the nation, I wouldn't even dare to dream of leaving the palace on my own. Lucia felt that even though no one knew she was a princess, it was quite nice to be able to come and go from the palace freely disguised as a maid. She walked along the bustling street, where people were cheering for the triumphant return of Duke Turan. Duke Turan was the most popular nobleman among the common people, a godlike figure in war, known as the Lion of the Battlefield. This was the first time Lucia had seen him. If she could sign a marriage contract with him in advance, could she change her tragic fate? Because she had foreseen in a dream that Duke Turan's fiancée was neither a noble's daughter nor a tycoon's heiress, but an innocent and lovely girl next door type. After marrying her, Duke Turan took neither concubines nor lovers. People assumed he was madly in love, but it wasn't long before rumors spread that Duke Turan only needed a wife in name. Although she understood the Duke only needed a nominal wife, given his status, even the crown prince couldn't summon him at will. How could she, a neglected princess, possibly strike up a conversation with him? Just then, Lucia had a thought. Duke Turan just won a major victory, so there must be a celebration banquet tonight. Lucia arrived at the banquet hall. Peeking in, she immediately spotted Duke Turan, who stood a head taller than everyone else. He was dazzling. But the Duke was surrounded by a crowd of fangirls, making it impossible to get close. With a smitten look on her face, Lucia watched the Duke and secretly thought to herself, he's not bad looking at all. But this was no time to be fangirling. She had to find a way to approach the Duke. Just then, the Duke keenly sensed someone staring at him and turned to look at Lucia. Their eyes met for a moment, and Lucia shyly turned away to hide. The Duke also noticed that Lucia seemed to have something to say to him, yet she hesitated to approach. So he left the bustling hall and went to a window. But Lucia still didn't dare to get closer, though she continued to stare intently at him. The Duke had never seen such an urgent look in anyone's eyes before. But what puzzled the Duke was that Lucia said nothing by the end of the first day of the banquet. Out of curiosity, the Duke attended the banquet for 3 consecutive days. But Lucia's gaze and her attire remained unchanged. She just stared at him silently. The Duke was very curious. When would she finally talk to him? Lucia had been observing the Duke with a love-struck expression for 4 whole days at the banquet, yet she couldn't find a chance to speak with him alone. Today was the last day of the banquet, and she silently cheered herself on. No matter what, I have to talk to him today. But how should she approach the Duke? She had no clue. Lucia paced back and forth anxiously, racking her brain for a way to get close to the Duke. In fact, the Duke had noticed Lucia long ago because of her desperate gaze, the likes of which he had never seen. He was also very curious about what she wanted from him. The Duke glanced at Lucia, who was in a corner holding her head in distress, and thought quizzically, "Doesn't she ever need to use the restroom?" He then left the banquet hall. Seeing the Duke about to leave, Lucia knew this was a heaven-sent opportunity. She lifted her skirt and scurried after him. She followed him all the way to a small grove of trees. Lucia was bewildered. What is he doing here? Just as Lucia was hesitating about whether to stop the Duke, a young lady called out to him. Lucia quickly dodged behind a tree. The girl was just about to say the Duke's name, when the Duke cut her off coldly. "Miss Lawrence, you no longer have the right to address me by my first name." Eavesdropping from behind the tree, Lucia broke out in a cold sweat. "That's so cold and ruthless." It turned out Miss Lawrence was the Duke's former lover. She had believed the Duke truly loved her and had come to confess her feelings. To her surprise, her heartfelt confession was met with a special gift, a yellow rose, symbolizing a breakup. Crying, Lawrence said, "You're too cruel. Why are you doing this to me?" However, the Duke stated, "I have never loved anyone, except perhaps in bed, and I certainly won't waste any emotion on you." Hearing this, Lucia was completely thunderstruck. The Duke added a threat: "If you try to provoke me, you can't afford the price. A person's life is their most precious possession." Watching Lawrence's back as she walked away crying, the Duke let out a sigh. Lucia, however, was terrified. That's just too heartless. To threaten a former lover like that. She had a sudden realization, feeling she might have completely misjudged him. Just as Lucia was hesitating about whether to run for it, the Duke suddenly spoke. "You've been eavesdropping long enough. It's time to come out." Hearing this, Lucia's heart pounded with nervousness, but it was too late to escape now. She had no choice but to brace herself and step out. "Your Grace, I am so sorry. I didn't mean to eavesdrop." The Duke looked at the slightly flustered Lucia and remarked that this distance wasn't suitable for a conversation. Lucia broke out in a cold sweat again, unsure of what to do. The Duke looked at the trembling Lucia before him, thinking she resembled a small animal. "All right, if you have something to say, just say it." Lucia was so nervous she stammered, unable to speak for a moment. "You've been staring at me for 4 days. Don't you have something you want to tell me?" Exposed, Lucia's face flushed red, and she lowered her head in shame. But Lucia was still hesitant. "Don't be afraid. Just say it." Encouraged by the Duke, Lucia mustered her courage. "Your Grace, I want to make a contract with you. A contract that will be enough to change your life." A princess with no presence, completely neglected, was actually proposing a contract marriage to Duke Turan, the highest-ranking noble in the kingdom, claiming it would change his life. The Duke crossed his arms, puzzled. Given his status, what kind of contract could it be? The Duke asked Lucia to introduce herself first, but Lucia said she couldn't reveal it yet, neither her identity nor the contract's contents. Lucia suggested they discuss it at the Duke's residence. The Duke was silent for a moment, but then he readily agreed. He wanted to know the exact time, but Lucia replied that she would contact him when she found the time. At this unreasonable demand, the Duke gave a wicked smile, his expression gradually turning grim. "No set time, and you dare make me wait for you to contact me?" The Duke's anger flared, frightening Lucia so much that she broke out in a nervous cold sweat. Although Lucia was screaming, "He's terrifying!" Inside, she forced a calm smile and explained, "This contract is very beneficial to you. It's worth waiting a little while." The Duke found Lucia's courage commendable but hoped she could deliver on her promise. Hearing this, Lucia finally breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, the Duke left her with a harsh parting shot, stating that he was not a magnanimous person and that she had better not be deceiving him. Then he turned and left. Back home, Lucia tossed and turned in bed. She never expected the Duke to be such a cold-blooded person. She couldn't believe she'd actually had expectations for him. Lucia recalled the scene of the Duke threatening his ex-lover's life. She had been terrified just by watching from the sidelines. She had only mentioned a contract. When he found out it was a contract marriage, just imagining the scene sent shivers down her spine. The more Lucia thought about it, the more frightened she became. She didn't know what to do. At that moment, Lucia thought of her best and only friend, Leelman. Only she could help her make this decision now. So she went to Leelman's house to seek her help. Lucia told Leelman that she was at a crossroads that would decide her life. One path was to do nothing, let nature take its course. The end was obvious, but it was full of thorns and there was no turning back. The other path was completely unpredictable. Perhaps even worse, it was a huge gamble with her life. "Leelman, if it were you, what would you choose?" Without a moment's hesitation, Leelman answered decisively, "Gamble, of course!" Such a decisive answer stunned Lucia. Leelman heartily raised her teacup, chugged it down, and then explained, "Life is unpredictable anyway. If you know one path is treacherous with no way back, you should obviously avoid it, even if the unknown path might be more dangerous. Crisis is opportunity." Lucia was silent for a moment. Just then, Leelman suddenly made a fist and cheered for Lucia. "You've got to fight for it in life!" This made Lucia burst out laughing. She thanked Leelman and decided to take a chance on herself. She went to the Duke's residence alone to propose the contract marriage to Duke Turan. When Lucia arrived at the gate of the ducal residence, she found the wide entrance unguarded. She wondered if she had come to the wrong place. Just then, a loud voice boomed from behind her. Lucia spun around in alarm and let out a scream. She looked up and carefully examined the giant before her. He was powerfully built with a head of red hair. Then it clicked for Lucia, because she had seen this man in her dreams. His name was Croton, a loyal subordinate of Duke Turan. Secretly known as the Mad Dog, Croton was very puzzled. "Judging by your clothes, you don't look like a servant here. What are you doing here?" Lucia explained that she was here to see the Duke and that they already had an appointment, asking him to pass on the message. But Croton looked disdainful. He bent down, getting close to Lucia, and said flippantly, "Tell me exactly who you are." Lucia was too frightened by this sudden move to speak. Croton stared at Lucia, guessing her identity. "You don't look like a noble. A small-time merchant, perhaps?" Being stared at so intensely by Croton made Lucia blush. Lucia placed a hand on her chest and declared confidently, "I may be dressed plainly today, but my status is more than sufficient to grant me an audience with the Duke." Croton flashed a wicked grin, then turned and told Lucia to follow him. Croton entered the Duke's office and threw an arm around his shoulder, but the Duke shoved him away with an unfeeling hand and told him to get lost. Grinning, Croton reported to the Duke, "There's a visitor outside." However, the Duke said he had no visitors scheduled for the day. Croton seemed disappointed. He leaned over the desk and described her to the Duke. "This visitor is quite interesting. She looks rather plain but claims to be of high birth. It's really amusing to see someone show up alone to boast like that." After his description, Croton asked curiously, "Don't you want to know what she's here for, Your Grace?" Seeing the Duke was still unmoved, Croton continued, "The visitor is a lady, and she said she had an appointment with you from the victory banquet." Only then did it register with the Duke, and he stood up eagerly. Meanwhile, Lucia was sitting in the parlor, her heart pounding. It's too late for regrets now. Just then, the Duke appeared. He came and stood before Lucia. Lucia introduced herself to the Duke as the 16th princess, and then directly proposed marriage. The Duke was utterly bewildered, and the atmosphere became incredibly awkward. Seeing the Duke's pensive look, Lucia grew nervous. "Doesn't he believe me? Should I have dressed up in formal attire to see him?" Just then, the Duke suddenly asked a question, startling Lucia. "Your Highness, if I recall correctly, you were going to propose a contract to me, weren't you?" Lucia explained to the Duke, "This contract refers to a contract marriage, and it can bring you many benefits." Her bargaining chip was to promise that she would never interfere with his private life and that she was infertile, because she knew the Duke had a son, who was also his designated sole heir. After hearing this, the Duke showed no reaction at all. Instead, calmly taking a sip of his tea, he set down his teacup and gestured for Lucia to continue. Lucia held up a finger and explained to the Duke, "If your son is to inherit the title, you must be legally married. First, I have no family entanglements. Second, I am His Majesty's 16th princess and have absolutely no presence in the royal family, so the dowry won't be too large." Lucia rattled on about her advantages, while the Duke rolled his eyes, thinking, "She's really thought this through." Lucia also stated that she would not interfere with the Duke's private life, and that they could divorce any time after marriage, and that her inability to have children would pose no trouble for the succession of the title. However, the Duke couldn't understand why Lucia was doing this. He said he wanted to have a serious talk with her. The Duke first pointed out, "The Taran family is not poor, so it's not as if we can't afford to take care of our wife's family, and there's certainly no need to save on the dowry. Secondly, the Taran family tradition absolutely forbids divorce." Speaking of his private life, the Duke suddenly became angry and questioned Lucia. "In your eyes, am I the kind of philandering noble who fools around after getting married?" Lucia was thunderstruck, her world crumbling. "Isn't he?" Lucia covered her mouth in disbelief. "Can you guarantee you'll be faithful to your wife and never fall in love with another woman in your life?" Seeing he fall silent, Lucia retorted, "You can't answer, can you?" Just then, the Duke glared at her. "Whether I can guarantee it or not, it's none of your business, right?" But Lucia didn't back down. "Can't I just ask?" Sparks flew as they glared at each other. After calming down, Lucia felt very dejected. Those were all her bargaining chips. She didn't know what conditions would move the Duke. Just then, the Duke's words of rejection to his former lover surfaced in her mind. An idea struck her, and she told the Duke she had one more condition, and that was that she would absolutely never fall in love with him. The Duke looked utterly shocked upon hearing this. Lucia's eyes, however, sparkled with anticipation as she asked the Duke, "How about this condition? I will absolutely never fall in love with you." Hearing this, the Duke's eyes widened, and he froze. When he came to his senses, he burst out laughing. Lucia was bewildered. "What's so funny?" Seeing the Duke calm down but still not give her an answer, a disappointed Lucia prepared to leave. But just then, the Duke stopped her. He suddenly appeared before her, pinching her chin and leaning in close to Lucia. It turned out the Duke just wanted to test whether Lucia would resist physical intimacy if they were to marry. Seeing that Lucia didn't protest, the Duke said he would arrange for a carriage to take her back and left. The Duke's sudden action left Lucia's mind completely blank. It was only after he left that she reacted, her face blushing shyly. Her legs then gave out and she slumped to the floor. She covered her face in embarrassment. She had overlooked this most crucial part of a marriage. Meanwhile, the Duke was drafting the contract marriage agreement. Although he thought such things were meaningless, he had to get married so that the kid could inherit his title. Speaking of marriage, he thought of Lucia's sincere expression and her shy appearance after he'd touched her. The Duke couldn't help but let out a foolish grin. He felt that Lucia was actually quite cute, and besides, he had nothing to lose from her conditions. But before that, he had to thoroughly investigate Lucia's identity. So he summoned his subordinate, Pabian, and ordered him to investigate Lucia. A month later, Pabian handed the Duke a dossier on Lucia's background that was only a few pages long. As the Duke flipped through it, he was puzzled. Why is there so little? Pabian was usually very reliable. According to the file, the only reliable piece of information was her identity as a princess, but she would disguise herself as a maid and leave the palace once a week on the same day. The Duke thought for a moment. Lucia's day to leave the palace was tomorrow, so he told Pabian to bring her over. Just how casual was the Duke about marrying Lucia? He decided to flip a coin. Heads, he would marry her without hesitation. Tails, he wouldn't. But the moment he tossed it, he regretted it. He figured marrying Lucia wasn't such a big deal anyway, so he pocketed the coin and waited for her arrival. Pabian found Lucia and brought her to the ducal residence. He reported to the Duke, "The princess has been brought here." The Duke, however, asked with concern if she had hesitated. When he learned that she hadn't hesitated and had come alone, the Duke flashed a wicked smile. He thought Lucia was incredibly bold to dare come by herself. Meanwhile, Lucia was sitting in the grand hall, leisurely eating dessert. The crisp, sweet taste made Lucia praise the butler effusively. "This is absolutely delicious." The butler was speechless. He had never seen anyone so at ease in the Duke's mansion. Lucia thought that if she became the Duchess, she could enjoy such delicious pastries and tea every day. The benefits were just too good. Just then, the Duke's voice was heard, telling the butler to leave. But Lucia panicked, because she had just taken a huge bite of dessert. In front of the Duke, Lucia had no choice but to cover her mouth and chew desperately, hoping to swallow it quickly. But then, disaster struck. She choked. She quickly grabbed the scalding hot tea on the table, and with tears in her eyes, gulped it down. The Duke watched her silently, completely speechless. Lucia's cheeks gradually turned red. She felt utterly embarrassed. After a large gulp of tea, Lucia finally managed to swallow. The Duke looked at her and sighed. He handed the marriage contract to Lucia, telling her to sign the 2 documents. She looked at them. One was a waiver of rights, and the other was a consent to register the marriage. At that moment, the Duke began to size Lucia up. He thought that while her looks were average and her figure was ordinary, the color of her eyes was quite special, like amber. However, after reading through the documents, Lucia found that none of the conditions she had proposed last time were included. Lucia pressed the Duke as to why they weren't written. "Don't you want freedom in your private life? Is it okay if I cling to you, or if I fall in love with you?" Veins bulged on the Duke's forehead. Utterly speechless, he could only give her his verbal promise. Having received the Duke's promise, Lucia picked up the pen, ready to sign. This startled the Duke so much that he sat up straight. "I'm done with my terms. Don't you have any of your own?" The dumb Lucia asked, confused. "I can make demands too?" She asked the Duke for confirmation repeatedly. The Duke, growing impatient, told her the offer would expire if she didn't sign today. Lucia thought for a moment. She wanted to ask the Duke one last question. "Why won't you accept a lover's affection?" This question made the Duke fall silent. Seeing no reaction from the Duke, Lucia's imagination ran wild. Was the Duke rejected after a proposal once? Did I remind him of a painful memory? At this thought, Lucia covered her mouth, growing restless. If that's the case, will he break the contract? The Duke was helpless, having no idea what was going through her mind this time. The truth was, the Duke was just bored, because it was the first time anyone had asked him that. He did, however, find women to be too much trouble, always wanting answers. Lucia rolled her eyes. "I really was overthinking it. Turns out he's just selfish." She believed that perhaps the Duke would only wake up after being hurt by someone he loved. The Duke told Lucia to name any 2 conditions for the contract marriage. Yet, Lucia wanted neither money nor status. She wanted the Duke to promise not to initiate any physical intimacy with her. And second, she believed that falling for someone was something the brain couldn't control, so if she failed to guard her heart, she wanted the Duke to give her a yellow rose, the symbol of a breakup. The Duke, however, was dismissive. He thought her conditions were too simple and told her to ask for something more realistic. Lucia pondered for a moment. "If I become the Duchess, I shouldn't have to worry about my livelihood. Other than that, I don't think I need any other money." The Duke was speechless. A noble princess worrying about food and shelter. He really wanted to see what was inside this girl's head. She was only 18, but seemed to have lived a lifetime. Lucia gave an innocent smile. "I don't think my 2 requests are excessive." The Duke, however, thought, more than not excessive, they're laughably simple. And so, he agreed to Lucia's terms for the contract marriage. After Lucia signed, he asked if she needed it notarized. She looked at him with her big, sparkling eyes and said no. The contract was complete. Lucia was now officially the Duke's fiancée. The Duke told her to return to the palace before dark, and, in a commanding tone, forbade her from ever sneaking out disguised as a maid again. Lucia was dumbfounded. She didn't understand why the Duke was suddenly speaking to her in such a commanding tone. 100,000 questions flooded her mind. However, the Duke simply stated, "I'm never very polite when I speak to my woman." Hearing this, Lucia's cheeks flushed slightly and she stammered, "When did I become your woman? We haven't even confirmed the marriage yet, have we?" The Duke informed her, "In the Turan family tradition, there is no divorce, and certainly no breaking off engagements." Lucia was dazed and felt a chill run down her spine. But Lucia had one more question. She didn't understand. "Why are you so rude to your own fiancé?" The Duke's reply was simply that he felt like it. Lucia looked at the man before her. At first she thought he was terrifying. Then she believed he was a playboy. She had no idea what his true personality was. A sense of unease crept over her. Sure enough, the Duke brought up the matter of her not leaving the palace again. Lucia was at a loss. She didn't know how to convince the Duke, because she wanted to see her friend Leelman, who lived outside the palace, one last time before the wedding. But then the Duke told her that the reason he didn't want her leaving was to keep their secret engagement from being discovered, not to confine her for life. Lucia's face lit up with ecstatic joy. So you mean, I can leave the palace after we're married, right? The Duke was taken aback by Lucia's sudden change. However, he reminded her, you must not reveal anything about the contract marriage. Lucia quickly chimed in. Of course, I never knew you were so open-minded. The Duke was speechless once again. Just last time, you were calling me narrow-minded and a womanizer. Ever since her engagement to the Duke, Lucia had been feeling terribly bored, so she thought of washing some clothes to find something to do. Standing in a washtub in her dress, she happily stomped around. This was indeed much better than getting lost in her own thoughts. Just then, a court lady discovered Lucia. Lucia was puzzled. Why would a court lady come to her palace? However, the court lady mistook her for a mere maid and asked if the princess was inside. Hearing this, Lucia was stunned. Dressed as she was, even if she told the woman she was the princess, she probably wouldn't be believed. Seeing Lucia hesitate to answer, the court lady began to question her. Are you mute? An honored guest has come to see Her Highness the Princess. Lead the way, quickly. Lucia was still confused. I'm a neglected down-and-out princess. Who would come to visit me? Could this be a mistake? At that moment, the Duke suddenly appeared. He looked at Lucia and said, Your Highness, you have quite a unique hobby. Lucia jumped in fright. The Duke then turned to scold the court lady. As a maid of the royal palace, you don't even recognize the princess? Do you have a death wish? Lucia was completely thunderstruck. She didn't know why the Duke had suddenly come to her palace, nor did she understand what he was here for. The Duke told Lucia to get out of the washtub first. Only then did she realize she was still standing in the washtub, and her cheeks instantly turned beet red. Just as she was about to step out, her foot caught on the edge of the basin, and with a thud, she performed a grand, kneeling bow before the Duke. Lucia was mortified. This is so embarrassing. The worst part was, because she had hurt her foot, she was now stuck on the ground, unable to get up. Just then, the Duke extended a hand to her. Lucia looked at him, her face a mask of astonishment, and then took his hand as he pulled her to her feet. The Duke then noticed that Lucia was barefoot, so he bent down to pick her up. The Duke's sudden movement and proximity startled Lucia, and her cheeks warmed rapidly. Then, the Duke directly picked her up. The sudden action made Lucia let out a small shriek. Lucia reminded the Duke, I'll get your clothes wet. However, the Duke simply ignored her and carried her straight towards the palace. Lucia squeezed her eyes shut, her heart pounding relentlessly. It's so close! But seeing Lucia's shy expression, the Duke let out a soft chuckle. Back in the palace, the Duke set Lucia down. Immediately, maids swarmed around her to help her change. Lucia was speechless. Their attitude changed so fast. A moment ago, they didn't even recognize her, but now that the Duke is here, they've all suddenly appeared. After changing her clothes, Lucia came before the Duke. Seeing the tea the maids had prepared, she wondered where such a high-quality blend had come from. Her palace certainly never had tea this good. She stole a glance at the Duke, then swirled the teacup, her heart filled with emotion. How long has it been since I've had tea prepared by a maid? The Duke said he had something important to discuss with her, and asked her to dismiss the court ladies and bring in a maid she trusted. At this, Lucia hesitated for a moment, then stammered to the Duke, I don't have a maid. The Duke froze for a second, and then invited Lucia for a walk outside. Learning the truth, the Duke was stunned. Lucia, however, didn't think it was a big deal. She didn't find it difficult, as it was just a matter of taking care of herself. The Duke finally understood what Pabian meant when he said she had no permanent maids. He had previously assumed Lucia had a strange personality and frequently replaced her maids. He never imagined her circumstances were so dire, a princess of royal blood living all by herself. The Duke stopped walking and looked at Lucia's back, recalling the first time they met. Back then, Lucia wore a plain gown that looked out of place in the lavish ballroom, and he never even saw her wear any jewelry. Even noble ladies of lower rank would change their gowns daily during a banquet, but Lucia did not. The Duke also finally understood why Lucia had come to him alone to propose marriage, why she had offered such modest terms, and the desperate look in her eyes when she looked at him. Thinking of this, the Duke suddenly felt a pang of sympathy for Lucia. Just then, Lucia turned around and reminded him, Didn't you have something important to discuss with me? As it turned out, His Majesty had already arranged their marriage. The wedding would be held as soon as a date was set, and it would be no more than a month away. Hearing this, Lucia's eyes widened in shock. She never expected the wedding to be so soon. After informing Lucia, the Duke turned to leave, intending to inquire about the maid situation. But Lucia stopped him, saying it wasn't necessary. She believed that if the Duke intervened, the maids would only receive a minor punishment. And besides, she was used to living freely on her own. Lucia added, Not having maids to look after me might actually be a good thing. If I were a prim and proper, sheltered princess, I probably wouldn't have dared to approach you about marriage. The fact that you set the wedding date so quickly must mean you're satisfied with this marriage, right? After listening to Lucia, the Duke looked at her with a blank expression. The next second, the Duke suddenly leaned in and kissed her on the lips. Lucia quickly pulled away, covering her mouth with a bashful look on her face. The Duke, however, showed a hint of a smile, looking quite pleased. He believed Lucia would be more than capable of handling the role of the lady of the house. The Duke told Lucia that after the wedding, they would have to set off for the Taran family's domain in the north, so he wanted to keep the wedding simple. As it happened, Lucia had never even met her own father and didn't want to walk down the aisle on his arm, so she readily agreed to the Duke's proposal. However, she suddenly remembered something more important. "Your Grace, I have a small favor to ask." Lucia took out an envelope and handed it to the Duke. "Do you want me to deliver this letter to your friend outside the palace?" Lucia's eyes sparkled as she nodded eagerly. The Duke had thought it would be some difficult request, so he agreed. Unconsciously, the Duke also realized that Lucia was no longer afraid of him. A few days later, the Duke decided to give Lucia an island containing a diamond mine as a wedding gift. Hearing this, the butler's jaw dropped in astonishment. "That's too extravagant!" Although the gift was immensely valuable, the Duke told the butler, "There's no need to hold a wedding ceremony. Keep everything simple." The butler found this absurd. The great war hero of the nation and a princess were getting married without a ceremony? But then he reconsidered. He thought that a man like the Duke, the master of the Taran family and a true autocrat, probably just needed to get married for the sake of it. Marrying the princess was just a means to an end, treating her as a tool. He felt that the princess was exceptionally pitiful for marrying such a selfish and heartless man. He imagined Her Highness would soon turn to drink, or fill the emptiness in her heart with vanity and extravagance. He believed that no matter how miserable the Duchess became, the Duke wouldn't show her the slightest bit of concern. Indeed, the butler's imagination was running wild. The look on his face when he's proven wrong could be imagined. Meanwhile, as the news that the Duke was going to marry her spread, Lucia finally began to live the life a princess should. Maids would wake her, groom her, and dress her. But she wasn't happy, because she was very unused to the maids' fawning attitudes. She wore magnificent dresses, feasted on delicacies every day, and no longer had to clean or wash clothes. It all happened overnight. His Majesty even gifted her a new palace called the Rose Palace. It was said that in late spring the entire courtyard would be filled with blooming roses, just like its name. Unfortunately, Lucia wouldn't be able to wait for spring. After the wedding, she would be following the Duke to the Taran family's northern domain. Around noon, a chamberlain informed Lucia, "His Majesty is feeling unwell and wishes to see you." Lucia looked astonished. She didn't understand why her father wanted to see her. She had never been summoned before. She smiled at the chamberlain who had summoned her. "I wish him a speedy recovery." The chamberlain's face was a picture of confusion. Lucia, in turn, refused His Majesty's summons, citing that she herself was unwell and unable to walk. The chamberlain tried to persuade her, but she simply told him to leave. She knew the king didn't want to see his daughter, but rather the fiancée of Duke Taran. Lucia lifted her teacup and couldn't help but sigh. The title of Duke Taran's fiancée is truly powerful. Today was Lucia and the Duke's wedding day. Lucia wore a beautiful wedding gown, and the Duke was also dressed in his finest attire. But the wedding was over in a single morning, as they had only symbolically signed a marriage certificate. In the carriage on the way back to the ducal mansion, Lucia stole a glance at the Duke. He was engrossed in reading various documents. Lucia touched her own lips, lamenting that as a married couple, they had even skipped the kiss that symbolized their vows. Just then, the Duke suddenly spoke. "What are you thinking about?" Lost in her thoughts, Lucia jumped in surprise. She could only offer an awkward, tight-lipped smile, but inside, her heart was racing, and her face was burning. She had just been staring at the Duke's lips, and was afraid he might have gotten the wrong idea. However, the Duke merely asked, "Are you willing to accompany me to the northern domain tomorrow? I don't think it's necessary for you to go with me to that bitter cold place, especially since we'll be there for 2 years. Lucia thought for a moment. If she stayed in the capital, her every move would be watched, and she wouldn't be able to sneak out of the palace disguised as a maid anymore. Besides, announcing a separation right after getting married didn't seem appropriate. But then she remembered this marriage was of no use to the Duke. Lucia clutched her dress, unsure how to decide. In the end, she answered, "I am willing to go north with you." Then she asked, "But if you wish for me to stay in the capital, I will." The Duke told her to be prepared, as this was, after all, a marriage of convenience. They finally arrived at the ducal mansion, where the butler was already waiting at the door to welcome the new mistress of the house. As soon as they met, Lucia realized he was the Duke's butler, and inwardly sighed in relief. "Good, I wasn't rude to him last time." With sparkling eyes, Lucia greeted him and added with a cheerful smile, "The pastries you served last time were delicious." The madam was being so polite to him that the butler was a bit stunned. "My lady, you truly don't need to be so formal. You can speak more casually." Lucia covered her mouth. She thought her tone hadn't been in line with the ducal household's etiquette. However, the butler simply replied coolly, "My lady, you are the rules of the Taran household." Lucia broke into a cold sweat, shocked. She hadn't yet realized just how revered her new status was. Just then, Lucia's old headache returned, and she clutched her head. She asked the butler to show her to her room to rest. After some time, Lucia opened her eyes to the sound of a maid calling her. It was time for dinner. Lucia rubbed her eyes. The long nap felt wonderfully refreshing. A maid was ready to take her to the dining hall. Lucia asked the maid, "Will the Duke be dining with me?" But the maid informed her, "His Grace is often busy with work and usually takes a simple meal in his office." Lucia felt as if she'd been struck by lightning. So, she had to face a room full of servants and eat dinner all by herself? After dinner, the butler gave Lucia a tour of the mansion. Before long, however, she was completely dumbfounded, because she realized it was impossible to see the whole place in a single day. Not only that, but the butler also told her, His Grace originally purchased over 100 other mansions, but in the end, he kept only this one, and had the others demolished. Lucia was stunned. It seemed the Taran family was even wealthier than she had imagined. The butler answered all of Lucia's questions along the way, helping her learn a lot about the ducal estate, so she thanked the butler. The butler told her not to mention it, but as he turned away, he gave himself a mental thumbs up. "I'm such an excellent butler." That night, Lucia changed into a sexy nightgown, ready for bed. Just then, a maid came in with fragrant floral oil to smooth her skin. Watching the maid diligently apply the oil, Lucia hesitated, wondering if she should say that the Duke wouldn't be coming that night, but she was afraid of discouraging the maid's enthusiasm. When it was done, Lucia lay on the bed with her arms spread wide. Her thoughts returned to the Duke. "I promised myself I wouldn't fall in love with him, but just looking at his face it's hard to resist. It's better to keep my distance tonight." Then again, she thought, if we're just going by looks, I'm not so bad myself. But when she looked down and thought about her figure, she instantly blushed with shame, and abruptly stood up, deciding to look around the bedroom instead. She took a turn around the room and, to her surprise, found red wine. Delighted, she decided to have a glass to celebrate her successful marriage. Before long, the entire bottle was empty. Lucia was completely drunk. She felt hot and thirsty, and she was the only one in the room anyway. So, she stripped off all her clothes and threw them on the floor, stretching languidly. Without the constraints of clothing, she felt much more comfortable. Just as she was about to have another drink, the door clicked open. That's right, it was the Duke. Their eyes met. Lucia was dumbfounded. She never expected the Duke to show up. After a few seconds of shock, Lucia snapped back to reality, and the wine glass in her hand slipped and shattered on the floor. Fearing she'd be cut by the broken glass, the Duke told her not to move, and then moved closer to her. Lucia covered her mouth and instinctively took a step back. But the Duke swept her into his arms, his gaze lingering on her petite frame. This only intensified Lucia's sense of shame. The Duke placed her on the bed, and Lucia hastily grabbed the covers to hide herself. The Duke asked if she was hurt, but all Lucia wanted was to find a hole to crawl into. Seeing her shy demeanor, the Duke suddenly sat down and chuckled. "I've already seen everything. What's the point in hiding now?" Lucia was completely bewildered. She had no idea why the Duke had suddenly appeared. But the Duke simply stated, "This is my room, after all." Lucia looked aggrieved. "The butler brought me here, but he never said it was your room." Speaking of the butler, the Duke recalled that he might have mentioned it. "Still, it seems you have a fondness for sleeping naked?" Lucia quickly explained, "I was just a little hot." The Duke's gaze shifted and landed on the empty wine bottle on the floor. "You've been drinking?" Discovered naked and drunk by the Duke, Lucia wept internally, feeling her image had been completely shattered. But the Duke just gave a wicked smile. "Even if this was an accident arranged by the butler, a drunken woman waiting for me in my room, naked, is that really a coincidence?" Hearing this, Lucia felt offended. She was furious. "I already told you I didn't know this was your room, and I never thought you would come. And even if I did it on purpose, I am now the only person with the right to do so. Respect is a two-way street, Your Grace." The Duke was taken aback, and they both fell silent. Lucia began to regret her words. He may have deserved it, but was she too impulsive? To her surprise, the Duke moved closer. Lucia squeezed her eyes shut, but unexpectedly, the Duke simply apologized. "If my words made you uncomfortable, then I apologize." Lucia was dumbfounded, finding it hard to believe. Seeing her lack of reaction, the Duke continued, "Do you want me to kneel for you?" Lucia froze again, then quickly shook her head once she processed it. "I was just surprised. I didn't think you were the type to apologize to anyone." Her words struck a nerve with the Duke. "Just how bad is my image in your eyes? Is it because you've heard too many rumors about me?" But Lucia replied, "I never judge a person based on rumors, only on my own feelings. And in my eyes, you are a cold and domineering man." At that, the Duke suddenly moved closer to Lucia, and then pulled back the blanket she was using to cover herself. "Tonight is our wedding night. You just said you were the only woman with the right to be here." Flustered by the Duke's advances, Lucia blushed and averted her gaze. "We're only in a contract marriage. I'm not beautiful or sexy, so there's no need, is there? Besides, we have to leave tomorrow." The Duke replied, "If you're unwilling, then I won't proceed." Lucia said, "From a legal standpoint, I can't refuse." The Duke was baffled. "She is talking to me about the law in a situation like this." The Duke sighed softly. "Your Highness, once we begin, you can't call for a stop." and with that, he pushed her down onto the bed. The Duke slowly drew near, ready to get intimate with Lucia. Just then, Lucia panicked and pushed him away with her hands, crying out, "Your Grace," in resistance. However, the Duke said, "Don't call me Your Grace. Call me by my name." Lucia froze. Seeing her hesitate, the Duke grew puzzled. "You don't possibly know my name, do you?" Hearing this, Lucia hastily and flusteredly defended herself. "Of course I know it!" But when she tried to say it, she was too shy to get the name out. Instead, the Duke, while unbuttoning his shirt, called her by her real name, Vivian. Lucia looked incredibly awkward, as it had been a very long time since anyone had called her by that name. The Duke told her, "You'll be hearing that name often from now on, my Princess Vivian." Lucia blushed furiously at his words. The Duke just chuckled softly and moved in to get close again. This time, Lucia didn't resist, but simply closed her eyes tightly. Early the next morning, Lucia's body felt incredibly heavy. She slowly opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was the Duke sleeping beside her, which surprised her. After a moment, it dawned on her that she was married. Having someone else suddenly in her bed was something she wasn't used to. She gazed at the Duke's sleeping face, and her cheeks began to blush again. She threw back the covers, deciding to get some water. But the moment her feet touched the floor, she collapsed to her knees with a thump. She was shocked to find that her legs had no strength at all. They ached as if she'd been beaten up. She also noticed that she had been naked last night, but she didn't know who had dressed her. Not only that, but the sweat was gone, as if she had been bathed. The more Lucia thought about it, the stranger it seemed. She had a strange feeling, as if she'd been tricked somehow. Just then, the Duke woke up and found her muttering something by the side of the bed. The next second, he was standing right in front of her. Lucia jumped in fright, but the Duke showed off his boyfriend's strength and scooped her right up. Lucia looked left and right, completely bewildered. The Duke started flirting immediately. "You're not mistaken. It's your husband holding you." Hearing that, the temperature of Lucia's cheeks skyrocketed. The Duke was confused. "How did you manage to roll off such a large bed?" Lucia quickly explained, "I just wanted to get a drink of water, but my legs were too weak, and I fell." "I see." The Duke carried her through the messy living room and poured a glass of water for Lucia. Lucia took the glass and dazedly thanked him. The Duke then teased, "Try not to drop the glass next time." Teased by the Duke again, Lucia could only gulp down the water to hide her embarrassment. After she finished, the Duke placed her back on the bed and told her to sleep a bit more. Just then, Lucia suddenly reached out, wanting to fix the Duke's messy hair. But little did Lucia know, the Duke couldn't possibly resist the expression on her face right now. The Duke's pupils dilated, and losing all reason, he leaned down and kissed her directly on the lips. After getting up, the Duke decided to postpone their departure to the northern domain so that Lucia could rest properly. However, as he tucked Lucia in and prepared to leave, Lucia stopped him. "Your Grace, it's still early. Aren't you going to sleep a little longer?" The Duke suddenly became furious. "I told you, don't call me Your Grace anymore." He then called her by her princess name, Vivian. Lucia was startled. The Duke sighed helplessly. "Before you get used to calling me by my name, perhaps you should first get used to not being startled when I call you by yours." Lucia couldn't help it. Very few people ever called her Princess Vivian, so she still wasn't used to it. The Duke was equally helpless. "I can't just not call you by a name, can I?" But Lucia immediately retorted, "Aren't there other names?" Mentioning other names, the Duke thought for a moment, then suddenly said, "Madam? Wifey?" Lucia was completely stunned, but the Duke continued, leaning closer. "Darling? My little cutie?" When she came to her senses, Lucia's cheeks felt like they were on fire. The Duke, however, just smiled, with no intention of letting her off the hook. He sat back down on the edge of the bed. "How about my sunshine, or soulmate, which do you prefer?" Lucia was so shocked by these strange names that her jaw dropped. She quickly said that just calling her by her name would be better. "I think so too, my Lady Vivian." The Duke was just too smooth. Although Lucia had foreseen in her dreams that the Duke would have no other lovers after their marriage, she couldn't help but think he must have one or two hidden away somewhere. The Duke gently patted her and told her to go to sleep. But Lucia wanted to keep asking questions. Just then, the Duke suddenly told her loudly, "Go to sleep!" The Duke's exasperated expression managed to make Lucia laugh. He sighed, gently stroked Lucia's hair, and asked softly, "So, what is it that you want to know?" They talked for a long time until Lucia finally started to feel sleepy. Finally, she apologized to the Duke. "I'm sorry, I was too noisy," and fell asleep. Looking at the sleeping Lucia, the Duke leaned over and kissed her cheek, then whispered softly, "Actually, I don't mind at all." In the council hall, an urgent message arrived from the northern domain. The Duke had to depart for his territory immediately. Before leaving, he made sure to tell the butler to find a female doctor to accompany his wife on the journey. Hearing this, the butler was internally collapsing. "Where on earth am I supposed to find a female doctor for you?" After mounting his horse, the Duke added a final instruction. "She is the mistress of the Terran house. Take good care of her for me." The butler agreed, and the Duke set off in a hurry. The butler, however, thought that the Duke's reference to the mistress of the house was probably just a casual remark. Because of their tiring wedding night activities, Lucia woke up to sharp pains in her body. She tried to get up, but collapsed again from the pain. She had no choice but to ask a maid to prepare some simple food that she could eat in bed. The maid agreed and then informed her, "His Grace has already left for Domain. The butler will be here shortly to report to you." After her meal, the butler came to see Lucia. "My lady, how are you feeling?" "The master asked me to inquire if you need a doctor." Such an embarrassing topic made Lucia blush instantly, and she quickly waved her hands to refuse. But what surprised the butler was that the Duke had left unannounced on their wedding night. Yet his wife showed no signs of anger or sadness. The butler told her, "Although the departure is scheduled for tomorrow, we must wait for your approval, my lady." Lucia's face lit up with an eager expression. "Since it's set for tomorrow, then let's go tomorrow." The butler explained the travel route to her. The two places were originally very far apart, but with a teleporter, the journey would only take about 4 days. Lucia was a little puzzled. It was the first time she had ever heard of a teleporter. The butler went on to explain that teleporter was artifacts left behind by the fallen magic empire, capable of transporting people over certain distances. "Our empire's strength is largely thanks to these teleporters," he added. After the butler's explanation, Lucia understood. But when she tried to stand up, she found that she couldn't. Lucia was mortified. Seeing the lady motionless, the butler was about to ask if he should call a doctor. Just then, Lucia spoke up. "Please call a doctor for me." Meanwhile, a maid led an elderly female doctor to the lady's room. The doctor had arrived at the ducal estate much earlier but had been kept waiting a long time before being called in for the diagnosis. She assumed her patient would be a difficult noblewoman. However, treating the nobility was a rare opportunity, and she was determined to make the most of it, even if the lady had a terrible temper. When the door opened, she was completely taken aback to find that the patient was just a young girl. This put her at ease. During the consultation, she found Lucia to be a very lovely girl. After the examination, she told the butler, "The Duchess is just suffering from muscle overexertion. As long as she takes the medicine I've prescribed and gets plenty of rest, she'll be fine." The butler smiled and asked expectantly, "Does that mean you agree to be her personal physician?" And just like that, the elderly doctor became Lucia's dedicated attendant. The next day, Lucia changed into some comfortable clothes, finally ready to set off for the territory. Before they left, the captain of the guard promised the Duchess, "We will ensure you arrive at the territory safely, but if we encounter danger along the way, you must stay close to Knight Heba." Lucia looked puzzled. "Why not the Knight Captain, but Knight Heba?" The captain clapped Heba on the shoulder and explained, "Because he's the strongest among us." This only confused Lucia more, as she knew that when knights formed a unit, the leader was chosen based on strength, not age. The captain stammered, unsure how to explain. Just then, Knight Heba stepped forward himself. It turned out he was neither a noble nor from a knightly family, but merely a commoner. Lucia still didn't understand. "So, what does that have to do with it?" Heba looked ashamed, assuming the Duchess would be offended by his commoner status. But to his surprise, not only did Lucia not mind, she declared, "Heba will be the captain. Strength has nothing to do with status, and I don't wish to break the knight's rules." This made Heba's youthful face flush with even more embarrassment. After several days of arduous travel, Lucia finally arrived at Roin, the city in the Taran family's domain. There was an unwritten rule here. Not even the king could interfere in the territory's affairs. Thus, the ducal house of Taran was known by some as the King of the North. Yet the Taran family had never entertained thoughts of independence. They never meddled in the capital's affairs, wishing only to maintain their position as lords of the North. But 7 years ago, the previous Duke Taran passed away suddenly, and the Northern Territory faced a great upheaval. The new Duke Taran, then only 18 years old, inherited the title with a great sword on his back. But belying his age, his performance on the battlefield was like a hurricane, striking fear into the hearts of his enemies. He was praised throughout the kingdom. However, the nobles of the kingdom saw Duke Taran as nothing more than a wet behind-the-ears brat. Why should he be allowed to rule the north? The nobles concluded that the Taran family had fallen, and that the new duke was a mere brute. They jointly wrote a petition to the king, hoping to have the Tarans stripped of their position as great lords. Just as Count Braun, the leader of the petition, was gloating, Duke Taran appeared before him, covered in blood and holding his great sword. It was then that he understood. This newly appointed, black-haired, red-eyed duke was no brat. The duke threw the documents of his own impeachment before him. Count Braun's eyes filled with terror, and he immediately fell to his knees, begging for mercy. It was clear the duke had no intention of letting him go. From then on, no one dared to challenge Duke Taran's position again. As soon as Lucia arrived at the Taran palace, she wanted to meet the elders of the ducal household. However, the butler informed her, there are no such people in the residence. The duke is the only remaining blood relative of the family. Lucia was surprised because she knew the duke clearly had a son. She was about to ask the butler, but stopped herself. She thought that perhaps the butler didn't know about the son, and decided to ask another time when the opportunity arose. Lying in the bathtub, Lucia thought back on it, still puzzled. It didn't seem like the duke having a son was a big secret. Lucia figured there must be more to the story. The thought actually made her feel a little thrilled. After her bath, the butler gave her a brief tour of the mansion. When she learned from the butler that there was a garden behind the dining hall, Lucia's eyes sparkled with anticipation. However, the butler advised her not to get her hopes up. Sure enough, when she saw the garden, she was stunned. This is practically a meadow. It turned out that the previous duchess had it built, but because it was so large and there had been no new mistress of the house, it had fallen into neglect. Just as they were about to turn back, Lucia stopped the butler. "You said the Duke is the only blood relative of the Taran family, but he clearly has a son." The butler's heart skipped a beat, and he became flustered. He hadn't expected the Duchess to know everything already. Lucia burst out laughing. "You didn't actually think the Duke wouldn't have told me, did you? He's not that kind of person." The butler was utterly shocked. In his eyes, the Duke was exactly that kind of person. Lucia had expected to meet him as soon as she arrived, but the butler told her, "The young master is not in Rouen at the moment. He's away at boarding school." Hearing this, Lucia suddenly grew serious. "He didn't go to boarding school because of me, did he?" Seeing the panicked look on her face, the butler quickly explained, "Actually, the Duke had decided on this a long time ago." Lucia was puzzled. If it was decided so long ago, how old is the child now? The butler smiled and told her, 8 years old. Lucia was stunned. Did the Duke have a baby when he was 17 or 18? Then she learned from the butler that the young master had never returned since going to boarding school, and the Duke had never visited him there either. Lucia was shocked by the butler's words. She had previously thought the Duke doted on his son, and had even married her to ensure the boy could inherit the title. After that, Lucia's days were very comfortable. The considerate butler prepared lavish meals and a variety of snacks for her every day. She was very content, though a little worried she might be pampered into gaining weight. Besides the butler, everyone in the ducal household treated her well. Lucia thought it was probably because she had just become the Duchess, and they were worried she would be unhappy, so they paid special attention to her food. In reality, however, Lucia wasn't the least bit uncomfortable, and was thoroughly enjoying this life. Just as the butler was pouring her tea, Lucia suddenly asked, "Were you the one who sent yellow roses, symbolizing a breakup, to the Duke's mistress?" Hearing this, the butler froze, and the teapot fell to the floor. He quickly and frantically cleaned up the mess. Fortunately, no tea had spilled on the Duchess. Lucia pressed on. "Whose idea was it to send the roses?" "The Duke isn't that thoughtful of a person." The butler was so nervous he stammered and couldn't get a word out. The gossip-loving Lucia, however, eagerly awaited his answer. It turned out the butler had acted on his own initiative, knowing that the language of yellow roses meant breakup. "I see." Lucia thought the butler must be a very romantic person. "Actually, my sister-in-law owns a flower shop, so I know a bit about the language of flowers." Lucia was surprised. "You have a brother?" He and his brother were not only twins, but his brother was also the Duke's adjutant, Pabian. Lucia then realized, "You two do look very much alike." She found it incredible. "So there are many twins in the ducal household?" "The head chef is a twin, and there are twins among the maids, too." Just then, the butler suddenly mentioned actually the Duke also had a twin brother. Lucia was puzzled. The butler realized he had misspoken and broke out in a nervous sweat. It turned out that the Duke's twin brother had passed away a long time ago. It was something no one spoke of lightly, and the butler advised Lucia not to bring it up in front of the Duke. Lucia sighed. Then she immediately perked up again. "Well then, let's get back to the roses. Who was the last person you sent them to?" The butler felt like crying. He felt as if the Duchess was investigating the Duke's love life and found her strangely terrifying. He believed he was facing the biggest crisis of his career. What he didn't know was that Lucia simply loved to gossip. The butler hastily begged her to stop. Lucia was a bit taken aback. "Why do you look so scared?" The next moment, Lucia smiled. "Then let's talk about the maids. From now on, don't assign me permanent maids. Have them serve me in rotation every few days." The butler was puzzled. "Is your grace dissatisfied with the current maids? Or have they done something wrong?" Lucia explained, "If it's always the same people serving me, conflicts might arise among the maids. I'm afraid it will cause unnecessary trouble." The butler's cheeks flushed slightly. At that moment, he thought the Duchess was a shining angel, not only decisive but also wise and kind. He had thought he would only ever follow the Duke, but it seemed now he had another person to devote himself to. In truth, the Duke's childhood was tragic. He had a twin brother, but their father believed they would one day kill each other over the succession. So, he decided to sell one son to mercenaries as a slave, while the other was raised as the heir. Hugo was chosen, and Hugh, the current Duke, was cast aside. But as time went on, the former Duke came to believe that Hugo, raised as the heir, was too soft. Meanwhile, Hugh, who had been sold into slavery, had made a great name for himself. So, the Duke decided to recall him and have the two switch places. That was the first time they were bound together. Hugo was very naive and would cling to Hugh every day, chattering endlessly about their similar-sounding names. But Hugh told him, "Our names mean demon and devil." Hugo, however, didn't care at all. He was just happy to suddenly have a brother who looked and had a name so similar to his own. Hugh sighed, thinking Hugo was a simpleton. He told Hugo with a serious expression, "One of us is destined to die. Did you know that?" Hugo was silent for a moment, then said something that shocked Hugh. "I'll protect you." Before Hugh could argue, Hugo grinned and took his hand. "And you can just protect me, right?" Their beastly father also began to officially use Hugo as leverage. As long as Hugh obediently played the part of the heir, he guaranteed Hugo's safety. Hugh had no choice but to compromise and be manipulated. He obediently received his education, appeared to the world as Hugo, shed his vulgar manner of speaking, and presented himself with the noble air of a duke. The former duke had tied the two brothers together, easily controlling them. By the time Hugo realized it, the tragedy had already begun. Hugo knew that as long as he existed, and as long as the duke who exploited them was alive, his brother could never be free. Therefore, for Hugh's sake, Hugo killed their father, and then took his own life, leaving Hugh alone to face a cruel and merciless world. From then on, he took the name Hugo and assumed the ducal seat. In a dimly lit hall, the duke stood covered in blood, greatsword in hand, having just slaughtered everyone there. Pabian followed behind him, deeply disapproving of his actions. The duke sat down and stated coldly that he made no exceptions. Meanwhile, Lucia discovered a tall tower. The tower was securely locked. She was puzzled, as it seemed to be the only place in the ducal estate that was off-limits. So she ordered a maid to find the key, but the maid's face went pale, and she advised Lucia not to go in. Lucia looked confused. With a fearful expression, the maid told her, "The West Tower is haunted." Hearing about a ghost, Lucia's eyes widened with even more excitement. She eagerly asked the maid who said so. Trembling, the maid replied with a serious look, "Everyone in Roy knows about it. I'm definitely not making it up." Lucia figured that if the place was haunted, there must be a reason. But the maid didn't know the specifics. She only knew what her parents and friends had told her. Seeing that she wouldn't get any more information from the maid, the butler happened to appear. She hurried over to him and asked with a grin, "May I ask you a question?" The Duchess's sudden approach surprised the butler. He had a feeling her next question might be a tricky one. "Is it true that the West Tower is haunted?" The butler broke out in a cold sweat. The Duchess's questions were certainly unconventional. He told Lucia, "There are such rumors, but I've never seen anything myself. However, the rumors always say that everyone who has entered the West Tower has died a violent death, so it has become a forbidden place." Hearing the butler's explanation, Lucia grew even more curious. She pressed on, "What happened in the West Tower?" The butler hesitated, unsure whether to tell her the truth. But after a moment's pause, he revealed it, "Because people have died in the West Tower. And it wasn't a simple accident, but a murder." Lucia covered her mouth in surprise. But the next moment, she became excited again. She felt like this was a plot straight out of a detective novel. It turned out that the ones who died in the West Tower were the former Duke and Duchess. This was originally a family secret, but the butler felt Lucia, as the new Duchess, had the right to know. And the person who killed the former Duke was the current Duke's twin brother. After the former Duke and Duchess passed away, the current Duke inherited the title. Lucia was aghast. The Duke's twin brother killed his own parents? However, the butler told her, while the former Duke was their biological father, the Duchess was not their biological mother. Their own mother passed away shortly after they were born. Lucia suddenly felt a pang of sympathy. She hadn't realized the Duke had been through something so terrible. That evening, Lucia sat by the window with a book, but she couldn't concentrate at all. Her mind was filled with thoughts of the Duke. She wondered where he was now. A month had passed in a blink of an eye, and Lucia hadn't seen the Duke. She started to worry that something might have happened to him. Just then, a buzzing sound came from outside, mingling with the sound of the rain. The butler suddenly looked tense. It was the first time Lucia had seen him so nervous. It turned out the Duke had returned. Hearing this, Lucia shot up from her seat in surprise. However, the butler told her she didn't need to go out to greet him. Lucia sat back down, disappointed. The reason was that the Duke became extremely sensitive after returning from battle. The butler was afraid Lucia would be frightened. Lucia could only sit down with a downcast expression and look out the window. It was then she remembered that the Duke was known as the Lion of the Battlefield. Several days passed, and Lucia was still dining alone. Since the Duke's return, he had been in meetings, even taking his meals in the conference room. Lucia wore a pitiful expression. While she didn't expect to be close to the Duke, she felt she should at least be kept in the loop about what was happening. She put down her fork and knife, feeling very gloomy. Noticing the Duchess seemed unhappy, the butler asked if the food was not to her liking. The butler's sudden question startled Lucia. She quickly waved her hands in denial, saying she just wasn't very hungry today. Then she pushed back her chair and left. The butler was bewildered. The Duchess never leaves food on her plate. He had no idea what was wrong with her. Lucia went to the study. It was enormous and incredibly tidy, a paradise for someone with OCD. Her only complaint was the lack of a footstool. Lucia stood on her tiptoes, her hands trembling, but she still couldn't reach the book she wanted. Just then, a large figure appeared behind Lucia. He pulled the book out for her, and wrapped his other arm around her slender waist. Lucia turned around and froze. It was the Duke. The Duke calmly handed the book to Lucia. Only then did Lucia realize he was holding her, and she let out a small blushing shriek. Then she took the book, held it to her chest, and leaned back against the bookshelf to thank him. Lucia's heart was pounding, but inwardly she was screaming. Even though it was a contract marriage, interacting with him was still so awkward. She had no idea what to say. Just then, the Duke started to explain why it had taken him so long to see her. Lucia, who had been struggling for words, quickly jumped in and finished his sentence for him. After a few more awkward exchanges, the Duke suddenly asked, "I heard you ate very little for dinner. Was the food not good?" Lucia's cheeks flushed, and she averted her gaze, saying she just didn't have much of an appetite today. But the Duke's expression turned murderous. He assumed someone must have upset Lucia. Lucia quickly denied it, insisting that everyone was treating her very well. Seeing her constantly avoiding his gaze, the Duke lifted a lock of her hair to his nose, a captivated look on his face, and then told Lucia to look at him. Lucia looked up at him. The Duke was puzzled. "Why do you seem so uncomfortable around me?" But Lucia said she wasn't uncomfortable, just a little flustered. The Duke pressed on, asking why. She started to complain, saying she still felt awkward, while he seemed perfectly calm, and besides, they hadn't seen each other in a month. The Duke smirked. "So, are you complaining that I haven't seen you in a month?" Flustered, Lucia blushed furiously and loudly denied it. But the Duke just smiled, gazing at her fondly. Then he lifted her chin, tucked her hair behind her ear, and leaned in to kiss her. He held Lucia's slender waist and kissed her for a long time, until they were both breathless. But the Duke wasn't satisfied. He swept her up into his arms. The sudden movement left Lucia bewildered. The Duke carried her to the bedroom in the study and set her down. Lucia looked horrified, thinking, "He's not going to do it here, is he?" The Duke gently caressed her face. And the next second, he leaned in and kissed her again. Lucia's mind reeled. Is he really going to do that here? At that thought, Lucia quickly pushed he away, but the Duke pounced on her again like a ravenous wolf. Utterly helpless, Lucia covered the Duke's mouth with her hand and, as a delaying tactic, said she wanted to take a bath first. But the Duke told her he had already bathed. Hearing this, Lucia crossed her arms over her chest, even more embarrassed, and frantically explained that she was the one who needed to wash up. The Duke said it didn't matter and moved in for another kiss. As he got closer, Lucia's mind went blank, and she suddenly blurted out that she minded very much. Only then did the Duke stop. Lucia's eyes were wide with a look of utter despair. The Duke was silent for a moment. Then he pulled Lucia up from the bed. With a whoosh, Lucia bolted and disappeared. After Lucia left, the Duke slapped his own head, feeling completely bewildered. According to his original plan, he should still be in the Northern Territory on business, yet he had cancelled 6 months of his schedule and returned directly to Royan. While on his mission, images of Lucia kept flashing through his mind. He tried hard not to think of her, but he found it impossible. He was constantly tormented by the question of why he thought about Lucia. What confused him even more was that he normally hated people entering his study without permission. Yet strangely, he wasn't bothered at all by Lucia's presence there. In fact, he had nearly lost his senses in front of her. The Duke slumped onto a bench, not knowing what was wrong with him. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was the butler. The butler nervously explained, "I was the one who let the Duchess into the study." Just as he braced himself for punishment, the Duke retorted, "Didn't you say she's the mistress of this estate?" The butler was stunned. It seemed he had been too hasty. The Duke didn't mind after all. So he beamed and told the Duke, "Everyone is very fond of the Duchess." He went on, praising Lucia for her exemplary conduct as a mistress, never treating the servants poorly or making unreasonable demands. The Duke was genuinely surprised that Lucia had gained so many admirers in just 1 month. Meanwhile, Lucia was lying in the bathtub with a look of grim resignation, as she was about to be scrubbed clean and taken to the Duke's bedroom. The maids were cheerfully and efficiently bathing her. Lucia was bewildered. Why is everyone so excited? One of the maids couldn't stop complimenting Lucia's skin. Speaking of skin, Lucia hung her head humbly. She felt that even if her skin was nice, she herself was neither sexy nor beautiful. But the silver lining was that she had foreseen in a dream that after his marriage, the Duke never brought another woman to important events. And although he was very cold to his wife, he treated her with respect. She thought that perhaps the Duke would treat her the same way. Lucia made her grand entrance in a bathrobe, and the maids, blushing like schoolgirls, beamed with vicarious delight. The Duke, meanwhile, was waiting for Lucia, swirling a glass of red wine. The maids, trying to suppress their grins, discreetly slipped away. Lucia hadn't yet realized what was happening. Looking at the empty room, Lucia's face suddenly turned bright red. She covered her cheeks with her hands, thinking, "By tomorrow, this will be all over the castle, won't it?" She composed herself and approached the Duke. The Duke said nothing and simply handed her a glass of red wine. She took the wine, thinking a drink might calm her nerves. So she downed it in one go. The Duke was dumbfounded. After finishing, Lucia grimaced. "This wine is terrible. It's so sour and bitter." But the Duke just smirked and poured her more. Lucia held out her glass, asking for another. Halfway through filling the glass, the Duke suddenly pulled Lucia close by the neck. Their eyes met, and the next second, he kissed her. During the kiss, the Duke took the wine glass from Lucia's hand. Then he asked, "Do you like to drink?" Lucia replied, "Only on special occasions." The Duke looked at Lucia with a goofy grin. The next second, he started kissing her again. But this time, the Duke noticed that Lucia was trembling all over, so he comforted her. "Don't be afraid. but Lucia couldn't stop shaking. The Duke had no choice but to pick her up and place her on the bed, letting Lucia rest in the crook of his arm. Then he held her tightly with his other arm. He even comforted her. Is that better? This gentle gesture helped Lucia relax a lot. But the Duke made no further moves. Lying in his arms, Lucia was both shy and confused. It doesn't seem like he's going to. In Lucia's view, a wife's position was secured by constantly receiving her husband's affection. Had the Duke come to the bedroom today just to give outsiders the impression that they had a harmonious relationship, or was he holding back because of her inexperience? Or was it because she had rejected him earlier? Lucia clenched her fists, unsure of what she was even thinking. Just then, the Duke suddenly spoke. "Hey, you're not actually going to sleep, are you? I didn't come here to tuck you in." Lucia was startled. The Duke continued, "Are you tired?" Lucia replied, "I'm not tired, but you must be, right? You've been in meetings ever since you got back." The Duke suddenly took Lucia's hand and kissed it, then looked at her with a dazed expression. "I'm not tired, but I want to hold you. Don't you?" Lucia's face instantly turned beet red at his bold words. The Duke suddenly shifted his position, pinning Lucia beneath him. Then, with a slight blush on his cheeks, he repeated, "I want to hold you. Is that okay?" Lucia looked resigned. The look of longing in the Duke's eyes made her feel like a stunning beauty, and the feeling wasn't half bad. The Duke then promised he wouldn't be like last time. However, Lucia turned her head away angrily and said, "I don't believe you. You lied to me last time." He took Lucia's hand and placed it on his cheek, earnestly pleading for a chance to make up for his mistake, adding, "I know now that your body is frail." The Duke's eager, puppy-like expression left Lucia feeling very conflicted. Seeing him like this, Lucia couldn't help but smile. The next day, the sun rose, and Lucia opened her eyes. She couldn't remember when she had fallen asleep. Just as she was wondering what time it was, the Duke suddenly hugged her from behind. Startled, Lucia cried out, "Your Grace!" However, the Duke moved closer to Lucia, asking her to call him by his name. They lingered in bed for a while longer, and Lucia fell asleep again. By the time she woke up again, it was already very late. After getting dressed, she ate breakfast alone and rested for a bit, and soon it was time for lunch. In the afternoon, she would go for a walk, then read for a while, and before she knew it, it would be dinner time. Although the Duke didn't join Lucia for breakfast or lunch, he was always there for dinner. After bathing, they would spend an exhausting night together, and wake up the next morning. For nearly a month, the Duke appeared every day, causing the already enthusiastic maids to become even more so. Lucia came to understand what a stable and decadent day felt like. Perhaps because this happened every day, Lucia no longer felt shy. Ever since the Duke returned, Lucia was always so tired that she wouldn't get up until the afternoon. While she didn't like it enough to tell the Duke directly, even though she was tired, she didn't dislike it either. To be the esteemed Duchess was a life she had never even dared to imagine. Lucia looked at the overgrown garden outside the window, feeling it was quite desolate. She hesitated, wondering if she should tend to it. After all, in the marital life from her dreams, she wouldn't get to eat if she didn't work, so this leisurely lifestyle was too foreign to her. Although she had heard that some noble ladies passed the time with embroidery or flower arranging, having grown up alone in the royal palace, she only knew basic survival skills besides reading and walking. Just as Lucia was feeling sorry for herself, the butler called out, "My lady," pulling her back to reality. The butler then handed Lucia an envelope. She took the envelope in confusion and opened it to find a list of household expenses. The butler thoughtfully explained from the side, "The household budget does not include employment fees or the basic expenses for maintaining the mansion. Furthermore, this is a new budget established just for you, my lady." Hearing the butler's words, Lucia was very puzzled. As far as she knew, the household budget was the fund given to the lady of the house to run the mansion. But the butler told her, "That may be the case in the future, but for this year, this fund is for you to spend freely, as long as you don't exceed the amount." Lucia was astonished to hear this. In other words, this fund was a household budget in name, but in reality, it was her own personal property. Lucia put the envelope away. She felt this money was motivation for her work, and she had to produce decent results. That evening, Lucia sat at her vanity and asked the Duke, who was behind her, "May I take care of the backyard garden?" The Duke scooped up the petite Lucia and said, "The garden belongs to the lady of the house. You can do whatever you want with it." Lucia told him, "It might require a lot of manpower at the beginning, so I might be hiring many people for a while." Hearing this, the Duke thought her budget wasn't enough, and immediately offered to increase it. She quickly explained that wasn't what she meant. This sum had several more zeros than what she had in her miserable marriage from the dream. Besides, the head of the household determines the amount of the household budget based on the state of the couple's relationship. Thinking about it this way, Lucia felt the Duke must be quite satisfied with her. The Duke then crouched down, placing his hands on either side of Lucia, and looked up at her, reiterating, "You are my legal wife. Whether you want to cut down all the trees in the garden or level it to build a pond, it's all up to you." The Duke had made it so clear, yet the dazed Lucia still didn't understand just how much authority she had. He pushed Lucia down, then looked fondly at Lucia beside him and asked, "How much do you want?" Lucia was surprised to hear the Duke asking for her opinion. but she was asking the Duke precisely because she hadn't been properly taught these things and didn't know. She didn't know what she, as the esteemed Duchess, should do to live up to her title. Hearing Lucia's words, the Duke blamed himself, thinking he should have considered this sooner. The Lucia of the past had no close elders and thus no opportunity to learn. The Duke then promised he would help her find a teacher to instruct her. Hearing this, a delighted Lucia clasped the Duke's hand to express her gratitude. Such an adorable expression made the Duke's pupils suddenly dilate. The next second, before Lucia could react, he leaned in and kissed her. Lucia called out the Duke's name in surprise. The Duke then asked Lucia if she was adjusting to life here, and added, "After we've settled matters in the territory, we will return to the capital." Hearing they were going back to the capital, Lucia looked shocked. In her dream, she had foreseen that the king would pass away next year, and her brother, the crown prince, would ascend the throne, and the Duke would form the closest of alliances with him. Therefore, their return to the capital was inevitable. The Duke noticed Lucia was lost in thought. He lifted her chin directly. "You still have the mind to think about other things right now?" Before Lucia could refuse, he pounced on her. The next day, while they were having dinner together, the Duke told Lucia, "Tomorrow, Countess Corzan will come to be your etiquette teacher." Learning this news, Lucia was full of anticipation. The Duke continued to explain, "The Countess is a formidable woman. She is known as the godmother of the Northern Social Circle. Having lost her husband early on, she never remarried and single-handedly supported the entire earldom. She is a master of etiquette with impeccable upbringing, and many noble ladies line up, hoping to learn from her." Lucia was amazed to learn her teacher was so impressive, but she worried, wasn't it too sudden to ask her to come like this? At that moment, the Duke glanced at the butler. The butler paused for a second, then tactfully led all the servants out of the dining room. Lucia was full of questions, having no idea what the Duke was up to. Only the two of them were left in the vast dining room. It was then that the Duke began to seek praise. He told Lucia with exaggeration, "The Countess is a very stubborn person. Even when her son pestered her for 3 months, she didn't even bat an eye." Naive Lucia, not yet realizing she was being played, asked the Duke how he had managed to persuade the Countess. The Duke gave a slight smile, wearing a praise me now expression, and then told Lucia, "It took a great deal of effort for me to accomplish this." Lucia shyly said, "Thank you," but she wondered if it was her imagination, as she seemed to see a smug look on the Duke's face. The Duke looked at Lucia expectantly. "Are you only going to thank me with words?" Hearing this, Lucia was speechless. She hadn't expected the Duke to be so childish. Blushing, she had no choice but to get up from her chair and plant a kiss on the Duke's lips. However, the Duke gave a sly grin, indicating that wasn't enough. He then lifted Lucia directly onto the dining table and began to kiss her passionately again, his hands wrapping around her slender waist. Lucia finally snapped to her senses, pushed the Duke away, and asked in a panic, "You're not going to do that sort of thing here, are you?" But the Duke moved close to Lucia again and retorted, "Why not here?" Lucia said in shame, "Absolutely not." The Duke grinned mischievously. "If you can give me one good reason, I'll let you go." Lucia never imagined the Duke could be so bold. She had no choice but to yell, "You can't do it in a place where we eat." Seeing her flustered state, the Duke couldn't help but laugh loudly. "Then are other places okay? Like the hallway or the garden?" Lucia grew even more flustered and immediately said no. She was worried someone might see them. But the Duke said, "We can just send everyone in the mansion away." The dazed Lucia actually began to seriously consider it. If no one knows, it should be fine, right? It's the same as in the bedroom anyway, and we are married. The Duke was stunned. He was just joking, but she was seriously thinking it over. Looking at Lucia's dazed expression, the Duke had to close his eyes and tell himself to be serious. After thinking it through, Lucia still felt that it was absolutely not okay to do it here. "Since my lovely wife is unwilling, then let's forget it." The Duke then pulled Lucia up from the table and asked if she wanted to go for a walk with him. The crisis averted, Lucia happily agreed. Seeing her brilliant smile, the Duke actually felt a little shy. He thought to himself, if I had known she would be this happy, I would have gone on walks with her before. The two went outside. Lucia enthusiastically described her plans for the garden. The Duke felt that his mood lifted every time he heard her cheerful chatter. He wished Lucia would talk to him more. As they walked, they came to a large tree. Lucia pointed to it and told the Duke, "I have tea under this tree every day." The Duke, however, replied shamelessly, "If we did it here for the first time, it would definitely be very exciting." Lucia was both flushed and angry at the Duke's outrageous words. Just then, he grabbed her hand, pinned her against the tree, and, wrapping an arm around her back, kissed her. Just as the two were sharing a passionate moment under the tree in the dark, the adjutant, Pabian, who had been in the capital on business, returned. The butler, his twin brother, gave him a hug to welcome him home. Pabian, fighting off sleepiness, said he needed to see the Duke to report, but the butler told him, "I don't know when his grace will be back. He went for a walk with the Duchess." Pabian was utterly stunned. He never would have thought a heartless man like the Duke would go for a walk with his wife. In the butler's eyes, however, this was nothing to be surprised about. After all, they had a very good relationship and ate together almost every day. Hearing this, Pabian, who had just returned, was even more shocked. completely reassessing his understanding of the Duke. Pabian didn't understand. When did his Grace's taste get so bad? As a die-hard fan of the Duchess, hearing someone slander her made the butler furious. With a dark expression, he warned Pabian, "Shut up!" However, Pabian still didn't sense anything was wrong. The next second, the butler threw a heavy punch, knocking him to the ground and reiterating, "I told you to shut up, stop talking nonsense." Pabian, on the ground, said, "I was just making a casual comment. After all, the Duke has never been intimate with the same woman more than 3 times. The only one who lasted more than a year was Countess Lucci." After saying this, he stood up, yawned, and went off to bed. The next day, on a bright and sunny morning, Madame Michel arrived at the ducal estate on time. Lucia looked with admiration at the slightly older, yet very refined and charismatic woman before her. But at that moment, Madame Michel was carefully observing Lucia. She wanted to know what kind of person was so remarkable that she would only begin learning how to be a lady of the house after getting married. She couldn't help but recall how the Duke had written to invite her, which was, in reality, a form of coercion. If she didn't agree, the tyrannical and arrogant Duke Terran would not let her off. Coming back to her senses, Madame Michel saw Lucia lifting her skirt and curtsying elegantly. "It is an honor to meet you. I hope it wasn't too rude of me to suddenly invite you here." Hearing this, Madame Michel was taken aback. She quickly replied, "It is my greatest honor to be your teacher." Lucia was very happy to hear her say that. "I was worried I would be too inadequate and cause you trouble." Lucia then invited Madame Michel into the living room. Her politeness was completely unexpected by Madame Michel. She had assumed that, due to Lucia's status as a princess, she would be somewhat arrogant. After they sat down, Lucia said with some shame, "Because I haven't been properly educated. If my actions or words are offensive, please tell me directly." Seeing such a polite Lucia, Madame Michel smiled with relief. It seemed Lucia was about to gain another fan. Madame Michel told Lucia, "In terms of etiquette, you are already doing very well. The essence of etiquette is to be considerate of others' feelings, and to treat people with sincerity. You already possess both of these qualities, so you don't need further lessons." Receiving praise from Madame Michel made Lucia blush a little. Madame Michel believed that since Lucia had been married for 2 months, it was about time for her to start socializing. So, she decided to start teaching Lucia with the simplest of events, a tea party. Through conversation, Madame Michel taught Lucia many things. Her elegant speech and skilled teaching methods ensured Lucia never felt bored. The whole process made Lucia marvel. How does Madame Michel manage to be so elegant even when just drinking tea? Madame Michel, known for her strictness, not only praised Lucia highly, but was also concerned that Lucia might be too lonely by herself. So she offered to introduce her niece. Resting her cheek on her hand, she explained, "My niece is cheerful, innocent, and easy to get along with, but she is a bit of a troublemaker." Lucia was very curious about what kind of trouble she caused. Madame Michel told her with some embarrassment. Not long ago, her friend's fiancé was cheating, so she dug a pit, filled it with horse manure, and then pushed him in. Lucia was dumbfounded. She thought this was a truly interesting person. She couldn't wait to meet her. Seeing that Lucia didn't mind, Madame Michel smiled. "She would be a very good confidant for you. She loves helping people with their love troubles." But Lucia was confused. "I'm already married, I don't have any love troubles." Madame Michel, however, told her, "Marriage isn't the end. It's the beginning." She then asked Lucia, "How long did you and the Duke date before you got married?" Hearing the word date, Lucia was a bit taken aback. She then told the lady, "I met the Duke 3 times before we were married." Hearing this answer, Madame Michel struggled to keep her composure. She thought to herself, did she really marry the Duke without knowing anything? She then asked Lucia, "What kind of person is the Duke in your eyes?" In Madame Michel's view, Lucia had only been married for a little over 2 months and was still in the phase of fantasizing about married life. Coupled with the fact they had met so few times, this princess surely didn't know her husband. However, to her great surprise, an image of the Duke kissing her hair flashed through Lucia's mind. She then answered, "He is a willful person, although not severely so, but he acts decisively, and once he makes a decision, he doesn't change it easily. He is a cold and ruthless person." Hearing this answer, Madame Michel was completely bewildered. She sighed. "It seems my concerns were unnecessary. You know your husband very well, which is a good thing. It proves you haven't lost yourself. You've done very well in that regard." Although she now knew Lucia understood her husband well, she didn't know just how close Lucia and the Duke were, so she asked a rather impolite question. "How many times a week does His Grace visit your bedroom?" Hearing this question, Lucia's face instantly turned bright red. She covered her face and stammered, "He comes every day." Upon learning this, Madame Michel smiled, thinking to herself, "It seems I was worried for nothing. The one who is hopelessly smitten is the Duke." In the blink of an eye, the first lesson was over. Lucia thanked Madame Michel. "I've learned so much from this lesson." But Madame Michel replied, "I'm confident you will also do very well at the tea party in a week's time." Lucia, however, felt immense pressure. That night, Lucia recalled what happened in class today. As the lady of the ducal house, you must host at least 2 tea parties a month, and you must invite 10 or more guests. She felt very frustrated. She thought she needed to get used to it quickly, so she sat up straight to give herself a pep talk. Just then, A maid's voice interrupted her thoughts. Lucia looked at the maid before her with confusion. The maid, with slightly flushed cheeks, stammered, "My lady, might you be pregnant?" As Lucia hadn't had her period in 2 months, the young maid hopefully assumed she was pregnant and even asked if she should call a doctor. But Lucia directly refused, saying with a hint of disappointment, "There's no such thing. Don't worry about it." But the young maid couldn't help but press on. "Wouldn't it be better to call a doctor?" Before the maid could finish, Lucia angrily cut her off. "That's completely impossible!" The young maid was terrified. She had never seen the Duchess so angry. The next morning, the Duke was in his study handling official business. The butler came in with a cup of coffee and told the Duke, "The lady is preparing for tomorrow's tea party." The Duke smiled and said he had heard. "As this is the first event the lady is hosting, would you like to send a congratulatory gift?" Hearing the butler's words, the Duke stopped his pen and began to think, propping his head up with his hand. The butler added, "She would surely be very happy if you did." An image of Lucia, smiling like a flower and saying thank you to him, flashed through the Duke's mind. He couldn't help but break into a dopey smile, but the next second, his heart sank. What on earth should I give her? The Duke thought about it. Although he had intentionally given Lucia a larger household budget, he had never truly given her a gift, and didn't know what she liked. The Duke's rack-his-brains expression, however, greatly pleased the butler. After all, he had never seen the Duke struggle over a gift for someone before. Just then, there was a knock on the door. The butler opened it and was very surprised. He immediately turned and told the Duke, "Dr. Philip is here." Hearing this name, the Duke's face suddenly darkened, and his eyes seemed to turn blood red. The butler was so startled by the murderous aura coming from the Duke that he broke out in a cold sweat. Dr. Philip's family had served the Terran family for generations, and he was the former Duke's personal physician, but he had suddenly disappeared while the current Duke was away from the territory. At this moment, the Duke ordered the butler, "Let him in." He also commanded that no one else be allowed to enter the room. After the butler complied, he felt that things were indeed not so simple. With a series of footsteps, Philip appeared before the Duke. The Duke, his eyes bloodshot, said bluntly, "I heard you went traveling. It would have been great if you had died on the way." He then told him to say his piece and get lost, never to appear before him again. Philip, however, replied, "Your Grace is truly kind-hearted, to have spared my life." The Duke gave a scornful laugh. But the next second he became murderous again. "Don't get it wrong. I'm not killing you because I owe you a life. Because that fool said he had to protect his savior." After a moment of silence, Philip said, "Young Master Hugo was kind-hearted by nature. By sacrificing himself, he must have wanted you to take this position more than anyone. You both carry the blood of the Taran family, so only the most suitable one can become the Master of Taran. When will you finally accept the fact that you are the Master of the House of Taran?" The Duke replied that it would never be possible, and that he would pass the title to Damien as soon as he came of age. Philip hadn't expected the Duke to be so resistant to the position. In his view, young Master Hugo had paid for this position with his blood, making it all the more noble. The Duke let out a small laugh. He knew Philip was good at being cunning. If he hadn't been prostrated at his feet in silence that day, but had spouted nonsense like he was now, he would probably be long dead. After all, he had killed everyone that day, except for this old man, because the Duke found those people disgusting. He couldn't even stand Philip, the sole survivor. He even thought that if Philip died, the stench would finally be gone. At this point, Philip, oblivious to the danger, continued to mutter, "I believe the former Duke was also forced to make his choice for the sake of the family." Hearing this, the Duke slammed his fist on the table in fury. He couldn't help but recall how his father had threatened him with Hugo, just to make him obediently become the heir. And Hugo knew that as long as he existed, as long as the Duke who used them existed, his brother could never be free. Therefore, he personally killed the Duke, and then ended his own life in front of his brother. Recalling all this, the Duke gnashed his teeth in anger. A guy who wouldn't even kill an insect was forced to do something like that by that old bastard. He felt it wasn't Hugo's intention at all, but was due to his father's ugly greed. Philip had thought the Duke would come to understand all this as he grew older, but he realized he had been overthinking. He couldn't help but wonder, is the noble bloodline of the Terran family to be squandered like this? Then Philip remembered, "I heard you are married, but that the Duchess is unable to bear children. Does she know this herself?" The Duke, full of murderous intent, angrily warned Philip, "Do not go near my wife!" Meanwhile, the butler learned from a maid that the Duchess had missed her period for 2 months. So he went to the garden and stopped Lucia, who was out for a walk. Lucia looked at the young maid with disappointment. She hadn't expected the maid to tell him after all. Lucia reiterated to the butler, "I am not pregnant, and there is nothing wrong with my body." And the Duke knows all of this. But in the butler's view, he couldn't bear the responsibility if something was wrong with the Duchess's health. So he sought Lucia's permission to confirm the matter with the Duke. Lucia's mind was a mess. Although she had told the Duke she couldn't get pregnant when they signed the marriage contract, the Duke had only asked how it could be proven, and then the matter was dropped. Lucia was worried that if she told the Duke the specific reason now, he would be very surprised. Lucia told the butler, "His Grace does indeed know about this, but I can tell him again." But the butler said sternly, "I cannot be certain that you will explain it to His Grace." Seeing the butler's serious expression, Lucia was helpless. She had no choice but to agree to let him mention it to the Duke. The matter was finally resolved, and the butler smiled and apologized to the Duchess. Lucia was also understanding, seeing it as part of his duties. Then, Lucia shot a sharp glance at the maid behind the butler. She felt the maid's tattling was tantamount to spying on her, so she decided to dismiss her that very day. The butler was a little surprised. He had thought the Duchess was an incredibly gentle person, but he hadn't expected her to be as decisive and ruthless as the Duke. The butler showed a gratified smile, feeling delighted inside. Truly a match made in heaven. Meanwhile, the Duke, having just warned Philip, recalled the Taran family's secret. Long ago, people didn't know when the Taran family had emerged, or why they had taken root in the desolate north. Despite their immense power, they were willing to serve as vassals, living a quiet life. The true purpose of the Taran family was known only to the successive heads of the family and a very few others. That was to continue the noble bloodline of the Taran family. To achieve this goal, they had to choose the safest place to survive, and the desolate north was their best option. Now, the only people who still knew these things were himself and this old man before him, because all the others who knew had already been killed by the Duke. If Philip hadn't saved Hugo's life behind the former Duke's back, he probably wouldn't be alive today. At this point, Philip stated, "Young Master Damien needs a wife, otherwise the Taran bloodline cannot be continued." Before Philip could finish, the Duke, enraged, told him to shut up. He felt sickened by those words. He angrily added, "Even barbarians don't marry their own sisters." But Philip stubbornly insisted, "This matter cannot be judged by ordinary standards. The noble blood of the Taran family must be continued." The Duke held his forehead, told Philip to stop spouting nonsense, and warned him, "Never appear in my sight again or I will kill you." Seeing he couldn't persuade the Duke, Philip nodded helplessly and left. Afterwards, the Duke instructed the butler, "Make sure Dr. Philip does not get close to the Duchess." He was worried that the old man would use the continuation of the bloodline as an excuse to encourage Lucia to find a lover for him. He didn't want to see sadness appear in Lucia's amber eyes. The Duke also ordered the butler, "Try your best to keep them from meeting." Suddenly, the butler remembered that the Duchess had asked him about the reason for the West Tower being sealed off a few days ago. The Duke was a little surprised to hear this. The butler said apologetically, "I told the Duchess everything I knew." The Duke thought for a moment. He figured Lucia would find out eventually anyway. He was more concerned about her reaction. The butler replied, "The Duchess was a little shocked, but more than surprised. She was worried about you." Hearing this, the Duke felt as if something had struck his heart, and his pupils suddenly widened. After composing himself, the Duke got up to leave, saying he was going out and might be back very late. After the Duke left, the butler finally realized, what about the Duchess's gift? In no time, the day of Lucia's first tea party arrived. What she had expected to be a tense atmosphere turned out to be very harmonious. It was completely different from the capital's social circle, which was always fraught with tension. Lucia lifted her teacup, thinking, "It's probably because I'm the Duchess of Taran that everyone is only saying nice things." Just then, with a click, the butler pushed the door open. "My lady, I apologize for interrupting your pleasant time. His Grace has sent a gift to congratulate you on hosting your first social event." Lucia was a little surprised. She hadn't expected the Duke to send her a gift. The noble ladies attending the party all murmured with envy. Afterwards, the butler instructed the servants to bring in the flowers. In an instant, the terrace turned into a sea of flowers. Everyone exclaimed, "It's absolutely beautiful!" Lucia looked at the flowers in her arms, her heart thumping uncontrollably. "It's just that the flowers seemed a bit green." She smiled, surprised that the Duke would send her a gift. The butler explained with a smile, "His Grace hopes this gift will fit today's theme." Hearing this, Lucia was especially surprised. She then said, "I will thank His Grace in person." In the blink of an eye, the tea party ended in a pleasant atmosphere. The butler at her side said, "The noble ladies all left in high spirits." It seems everyone was very satisfied with the tea party. Lucia immediately replied, "You've worked hard too. However, there's something I want to ask you." Because every time Lucia asked a question it scared him half to death. The butler's eyes rolled back in his head as soon as he heard this. He had thought the madam had been asking fewer questions lately, but it seemed he was just being optimistic. Lucia dropped a bombshell saying, "The Duke didn't send those flowers, did he?" The butler froze instantly, completely flustered. He never imagined she would find out. Seeing the butler's shocked expression, Lucia couldn't help but cover her mouth and giggle. At first, Lucia had believed it. If it weren't for the Duke's blessing message, she might have been fooled by the butler. Because in her eyes, the Duke would never say something like that. He wasn't that thoughtful of a person. Hearing the lady's words, the butler broke out in a cold sweat, stammering, unsure how to explain. But Lucia said it didn't matter, and even thanked him for the gift. This made him even more nervous. He quickly explained, "His Grace genuinely wanted to send you a gift. He just didn't know what to send, so I made the choice on his behalf." Lucia asked the butler, "Is that true?" The butler nervously replied, "Absolutely." She pretended to think it over seriously, studying the butler. By now, the butler was so nervous that sweat started trickling from the corner of his eye. The next second, Lucia burst out laughing and said, "I understand. I'll be sure to thank His Grace the Duke. Then she dismissed him, wanting to stay for a while by herself in the sea of flowers. Meanwhile, after the Duke finished his meeting, the butler immediately informed him, "The lady is on the terrace." Speaking of the terrace, the Duke finally remembered that Lucia was hosting a tea party today, and he had completely forgotten about the gift. He thought, the day isn't over yet, so it's not too late to send a gift now, right? But the butler told him, the party ended long ago. But since you didn't specify what gift to send the lady, I took the liberty of sending some flowers. Hearing this, the Duke breathed a sigh of relief, praised the butler for a job well done, and said he'd give him a raise. The Duke went to the terrace and found Lucia sitting quietly at a table with her eyes closed. Bathed in the sunset, Lucia was breathtakingly beautiful, as if time had stood still. He leaned his head against the doorframe, watching her. He didn't know what she was thinking. Just then, Lucia suddenly opened her eyes, noticed the Duke's arrival, and gave him a brilliant smile. At that moment, the Duke froze, feeling as if his heart was about to melt. The next second, Lucia ran to the Duke and hugged him tightly. The Duke was completely stunned. He never expected Lucia to do something so adorable. He hugged Lucia back tightly and placed a gentle kiss on the crown of her head. They looked into each other's eyes, about to kiss the next second. Afterwards, the Duke asked Lucia, "Did you have a good time at the tea party?" Lucia replied, "I had a wonderful time. Thank you for the gift." The Duke was about to lean in for another gentle kiss, when suddenly the red roses on the table caught his eye. He was abruptly reminded of the yellow roses, which made him panic. The Duke nervously held Lucia close. He remembered what she had said on the day they signed their contract. "If I fail to stay true to myself, please send me yellow roses, which represent breaking up." At this thought, the Duke suddenly swept Lucia up, pressing her head against his shoulder. Lucia was terrified. The Duke scanned the entire terrace and, seeing no yellow roses, finally sat down with a sigh of relief. He then asked Lucia, "Why do you like flowers so much?" Lucia hesitated for a moment, then replied tactfully, "It's not that I like flowers, but that I like the gift you sent." The Duke was secretly relieved. Good, she didn't remember about the yellow roses. In truth, giving yellow roses was a method of breaking up that the butler had researched, as the language of yellow roses signifies parting. Although the yellow rose issue was resolved, the Duke then recalled 2 additional conditions added when they signed the contract. First, Lucia agreed she would never interfere in the Duke's private life. Second, Lucia promised she would never fall in love with the Duke. The Duke never imagined he would now be desperately trying to win his wife's affection. He felt he must have been insane at the time to superfluously agree to these 2 conditions. The memory of Lucia sincerely telling him, "I will never fall in love with you," suddenly made him feel like he was suffocating. He leaned on Lucia's shoulder, extremely remorseful, and muttered to himself, "I'm such an idiot." But then he reconsidered. Those 2 conditions were only verbal promises and not legally binding. The Duke then thought he had actually been quite far-sighted. Convinced by his own logic, he stopped agonizing over the contract. He smiled and whispered in Lucia's ear, "Since you said you were so satisfied with the gift, you should give a gift in return." Hearing his words, Lucia was speechless. "Doesn't your conscience bother you? The butler was the one who sent the gift. How could someone be so shameless?" Still, Lucia asked aloud, "Is there something you want?" The Duke retorted, "Will you agree to whatever I say?" Lucia stated, "Of course, it has to be within my abilities." Upon hearing this, the Duke slowly leaned closer to her ear and whispered something secretive. After hearing it, Lucia instantly blushed beet red with embarrassment, and immediately said, "No." But the next second, the Duke instantly put on a pleading puppy dog face and begged, "Really? You can't?" After being momentarily swayed, Lucia quickly came to her senses and said again, "No, you may not." The Duke kissed Lucia's neck again, then looked at her adoringly. "When did I become so untrustworthy?" However, Lucia was a little angry and huffed haughtily, "You should search your conscience and think hard about the reason." Before Lucia could finish her sentence, the Duke swept her up and turned her around to face him. Flushed red with embarrassment, Lucia nervously said, "What if someone comes?" But the Duke held her back and told her not to worry. "The butler isn't that indiscreet." Lucia was helpless. "Are your questions just for show?" However, what followed was another barrage of shameless words from the Duke. Lucia couldn't listen anymore. She warned him, "If you dare say one more thing, I'm going to seriously refuse." But the Duke's lips curved into a smile, and the next second, they were intertwined. The next day, the butler summoned Dr. Anna to examine Lucia. After some questions, Dr. Anna concluded that Lucia was likely not pregnant. However, she learned from the butler that the lady had been rather fatigued lately. Anna said she would prescribe a tonic. But the next second, her sharp eyes seemed to notice something. She stared intently at Lucia and said pointedly to the butler, "A person's body isn't made of steel after all. One must act within one's limits. Please relay this to the Duke." At first, both of them were confused, but Dr. Anna continued to explain, "The lady is in the prime of her life, yet she needs a tonic. In that department, some occasional rest is also necessary." The butler, who usually remained expressionless, couldn't help but blush upon hearing this. As for Lucia, her face turned beet red, and she wished she could find a hole to crawl into. But as a doctor with professional ethics, Anna insisted, "The lady must be having a hard time as well. Please, tell His Grace the Duke." Lucia clenched her fists, stammering, unable to say a word for a long time. She was imagining that if she told the doctor she actually liked the Duke coming to her bedroom every night, Dr. Anna's eyes would probably shatter from shock, and the butler would give her a strange look. Lucia cried internally. She would have to be crazy to voice such true thoughts. Dr. Anna didn't forget to remind the butler, "You must tell the Duke to exercise restraint." The butler, blushing, said he would, then coughed awkwardly and asked, "What frequency should be maintained?" Dr. Anna made a gesture and told him, "She needs to rest 1 day for every 5. After the consultation, Lucia went to the balcony alone. Speaking of pregnancy, she recalled a weed that grew all over the empire, called 3-leaf mugwort, because it was everywhere and had a weak hemostatic effect. It had become a backup medicine for commoners. When she got her first period at 15, she didn't know why she was bleeding, and no one had told her about it. The bleeding plunged her into endless fear. She felt like she was dying, so she thought of the ubiquitous 3-leaf mugwort. Miraculously, it worked. Afterwards, she would eat the 3-leaf mugwort every time she got her period. After taking it for half a year, her period stopped coming altogether. At the time, she didn't know what that meant. It wasn't until a prophetic dream that she learned the truth of her infertility. Just when Lucia was about to give up, she met a mysterious traveling doctor in her dream. The doctor told her, although 3-leaf mugwort is considered a poisonous weed by many, eating it can actually purify the body. The only side effect is likely the cessation of menstruation. He also gave Lucia his ancestral secret formula, saying, "As long as you diligently take this medicine I've given you, your period will return." And he sincerely blessed Lucia. "May you have a beautiful child and become a happy mother." Back in reality, although Lucia knew the cure and could start treatment at any time, she remembered her promise to the Duke that she couldn't get pregnant. The reason she said that at the time was because she believed they would eventually divorce. After all, the Duke only needed a nominal lady of the house. But now it seemed the Duke might not agree to a divorce. Lucia clenched her fists tightly. She believed that since she had already prepared for a life without children when she married, she should bear the consequences. But Lucia remembered the traveling doctor's blessing and couldn't help but feel sad. "He went through the trouble of telling me his secret formula, but it seems his blessing, whether in the dream or in reality, cannot be fulfilled." What was that person's name? Lucia struggled to recall. Finally, after racking her brains, she remembered the traveling doctor. It was Dr. Philip. The butler risked his life to relay the doctor's message to the Duke. "Don't visit the lady's bedroom so frequently, and it's best to let her rest once every 5 days." The Duke was very confused after hearing this. Why would the doctor say that? The butler quickly explained, "It's for the sake of her health." Hearing the word health, the Duke froze, then said resignedly, "I understand." After the butler left, the Duke held his forehead, extremely remorseful. "Lucia is so delicate, yet I've been tormenting her day and night for over a month." But when he remembered the butler telling him to rest once every 5 days, he clenched his fists, feeling incredibly frustrated. That night, Lucia nestled in the Duke's arms. His strong heartbeat made her feel very secure. Just then, the Duke told her, "Starting tomorrow, I'll be leaving Rouen for a few days." He planned to inspect his territory once or twice a month. But Lucia looked reluctant. She felt this wasn't something the Lord himself should be doing. But the Duke told her, "Doing this is necessary to maintain order." After speaking, he gave her a kiss on the cheek. Lucia was a little worried. She asked him, "How long will you be gone?" The Duke replied, 3 or 4 days. The thought of not seeing the man before her for 3 or 4 days made Lucia's spirits sink for some reason. She suddenly realized that she had unconsciously grown accustomed to having the Duke by her side. Although she wanted the Duke to return quickly, she worried that saying so would annoy him. At this thought, Lucia couldn't help but hug the Duke tighter. Just then, the Duke mentioned he had a gift for her for the tea party in 2 days, because he felt the gift from the last party wasn't good enough. Hearing that the Duke was giving her a gift, Lucia's heart instantly started to race. She looked at the Duke expectantly. "Can I ask what it is?" To her surprise, the Duke answered instantly, "A necklace." This straightforward move left Lucia dumbfounded. There's no surprise at all. Then, changing the subject, the Duke instructed Lucia not to wander around while he was away, to stay put and be good like she usually was. Lucia was surprised. Although she had no intention of going out, why did the Duke specifically emphasize this? She asked with a puzzled look. "Why is that?" The Duke panicked. He hadn't expected Lucia to press for a reason. He stammered for a moment, then caressed Lucia's face and coaxingly told her, "I don't want you to leave my domain while I'm away, because when I'm not here, the lady of the house must guard the castle." The next second, it dawned on Lucia, "Oh, so that's why." Then she gave an innocent smile and asked the Duke, "Is there anything else you need to tell me?" The thought of not being able to see that smile for several days made the Duke unconsciously lift Lucia's chin and kiss her. The next morning, from a distance, Philip watched the Duke's party depart. Just as he was about to enter the inner city, he was stopped by knights who suddenly appeared. They stated, "As long as you don't enter the inner city, your movements won't be restricted." Philip was furious at this, but the knights said, "We are only following orders." They also told Philip that if he refused to comply, they would have to force him to leave. Seeing the sword at his neck, Philip had no choice but to turn and leave helplessly. It turned out that Lucia and the Duke were a match made in heaven, because of the special Terran family bloodline. If a common woman was to become pregnant, she had to, starting from her first period, continuously consume 3-leaf mugwort for over a year, and then unite with the Terran heir. Then she would have to take an antidote researched by the Philip family to restore her body to its original state, and she would recover after her period resumed. And right now, the only person who knew this method was Philip. He didn't know who the Duchess was or why she would cause such a strong reaction in the Duke. But ever since he became alone, the Duke's eyes held nothing but hatred. He believed the Duke would sooner or later lead the family to ruin, and he understood that continuing the Terran bloodline was just his own obsession. But he couldn't give it up, because this was the sole meaning of his existence. Meanwhile, Lucia stared in surprise at the jewel-encrusted box on the table. The butler excitedly told her, "This is the gift His Grace prepared for you." Just a few days ago, the Duke was holding a stack of design drawings, seriously picking out a gift. The butler, watching the Duke's indecisiveness, couldn't believe His Grace would put so much thought into choosing a gift. However, His Grace the Duke seemed to be enjoying himself. Finally, after days of deep thought, the Duke selected a design and handed it to the butler. The butler took the drawing, only to discover that the necklace on it had already been auctioned off by a foreign royal family. Hearing this, the Duke told the butler, "Find the royal family that won the auction and buy it back for double or triple the price." He wanted to give her a gift special enough to remain in her memory. Wearing the necklace from the Duke, the exquisite piece made Lucia even more beautiful. Even the butler at her side couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. But Lucia looked at the diamond-covered necklace on her neck with some disbelief. After all, it was a world away from the simple necklace she had imagined. Lucia was incredulous. "Is this necklace really for me?" The butler told her. The Duke intended to give it to you personally, but didn't have the time. But Lucia felt the necklace was too extravagant, even a bit of a burden. The butler quickly explained, "This is not extravagant at all for the Duke." Lucia thought to herself, perhaps a precious gift like this is as trivial to him as buying a common comb. Lucia looked at the heavy necklace on the table, not knowing the deeper meaning behind the Duke's gift. Her mind was a mess. She thought, could this be a reward because he enjoys being intimate with me? She felt that if that were the case, she would be very hurt. She caressed the splendid jewels on the box. Lucia thought it might also just be the Duke's habit. After all, he had many lovers in the past, and giving gifts might have become routine. But she felt this assumption was also hurtful. So Lucia helplessly covered her face, calmed herself down, and told herself to stop thinking about it. Perhaps the necklace had no special meaning. Lucia then recalled her married life with the Duke, which was completely different from what she had expected. She originally thought she would live a miserable life, but she never imagined that every day would be filled with so much joy and happiness. But then she remembered her promise to the Duke not to fall in love with him. Yet now, every time they were intimate, her heart wavered. Lucia was terrified that she would become unable to leave the Duke. In the end, Lucia never wore the necklace to any public occasion. A special guest came to the tea party today, Madame Michelle's grandniece, Katie. She graciously introduced herself to Lucia and said, "My grandaunt often speaks of you." Lucia then remembered that Madame Michelle had praised her grandniece profusely. Katie was in disbelief. She couldn't believe her grandaunt would say that, because in her eyes, every time her grandaunt saw her, she would raise her eyebrows with a fierce and menacing look. Seeing Katie's adorable, dazed expression, Lucia smiled and explained, "Madame Michelle is actually very proud to have you as her grandniece." Now Katie was even more confused, because her grandaunt had once warned her, "A troublemaker like you. I don't know if the Duchess can even stand you. If the Duchess is willing to be your friend, you must kneel and thank her with the utmost sincerity." Hearing Katie's animated complaints, Lucia couldn't help but laugh out loud. Katie hadn't expected the Duchess to be so approachable, so she extended her hand and told Lucia, "From now on, just call me by my name." This stunned Lucia. She hadn't expected a noble lady to be so forthright as to offer a handshake. The air suddenly froze. Katie also realized she had been a bit rude, so she awkwardly withdrew her hand and explained, "I just can't seem to break this bad habit." But Lucia chuckled, and then extended her own hand. She felt that Katie was just as Madame Michelle had described, lively, straightforward, and radiating a dazzling light. After Katie left, Lucia felt a bit reluctant to see her go. She thought of Katie as her first friend of the same age, and it was a shame to part like this. She quietly cheered herself on, thinking she must invite her to the next tea party so they could chat more. Then the very next morning, a maid came to announce, "Miss Milton is here to visit." Thinking of Katie, Lucia excitedly stood up and quickly asked the maid, "Where is she?" Seeing Katie again, Lucia was overjoyed, and Katie chattered away, complaining to her nonstop. Lucia had been worried about when she would see Katie again, but she hadn't expected her to visit so often. Over time, the two quickly became good friends who could talk about anything. The Duke, having returned from inspecting his territory, was finally back. After a passionate reunion, Lucia nestled in the Duke's arms and mentioned that Miss Milton, who had visited the mansion that afternoon, had said something very interesting. Hearing the name, the Duke remembered that Count Milton was a vassal of the ducal house, well regarded for his upright character and his children's education. That was why he hadn't interfered with their friendship. The Duke thought, as long as it makes her happy, it's a good thing. Then he asked Lucia, what did she say? Lucia replied, Katie asked me if you're the one who forbids me from going out. Does you hate it when I leave the mansion? The Duke was aghast. Although he did indeed hate Lucia going out, he hadn't expected Miss Milton to be so perceptive. The clueless Lucia naively thought, you're not that kind of person at all. Then, with an expectant look, Lucia asked the Duke, can I learn to ride a horse? She told me it's very fun and good exercise. The Duke pictured Lucia in a riding habit and didn't want any other man to see her. Seeing him hesitate, Lucia looked at him with wide, watery eyes and a pitiful expression. How could the Duke possibly resist that? He remembered this was the first time Lucia had pleaded with him since their marriage. If he refused, she would surely be disappointed. But then he thought, there doesn't seem to be a riding arena exclusively for women. I'll take this opportunity to build one. With his plan set, the Duke told Lucia, you must practice riding safely within the mansion until you've mastered it. But in his mind, he was thinking, it will take a week to learn to ride. I can use this time to build the arena, and I also need to find a female instructor for her. The naive Lucia, upon hearing the Duke's approval, joyfully hugged him and thanked him. She remembered how Katie had thought she was forbidden from going out by the Duke, but now it seemed the Duke wasn't that kind of person at all. Katie, whom she hadn't seen in a few days, was very surprised. She praised Lucia's rapid progress in riding and added, the women's only riding arena opens tomorrow. You'll definitely be able to show off your skills. Hearing Katie's generous praise, Lucia felt a little shy, but she believed her rapid improvement was also thanks to the white horse the Duke had given her. Because even when her commands were muddled, it could keep up. Katie also thought it was a fine horse and a good match for Lucia. After all, a gift from Duke Taran couldn't possibly be bad. However, what Katie found strange was that a women's only riding arena was unprecedented in the entire country, yet it appeared just as Lucia was learning to ride. The timing was a bit too coincidental. Just then, Lucia's voice interrupted her thoughts. Lucia invited her to eat, and after Katie agreed, she didn't think much more of it. That night, nestled in the Duke's arms, Lucia mentioned a very large lake east of Rouen. The Duke thought Lucia wanted to go out, so he offered to take her to see it. But Lucia propped herself up and asked the Duke, I heard many nobles have their own boats. Don't you have one? The Duke did not, because in his view, it was just a pastime for idle people. But seeing Lucia's expectant face, he thought, it seems I'll have to buy a boat. Just then, Lucia leaned on the Duke and said, in that case, Miss Katie asked me to go boating with her. Can I go? The Duke's heart skipped a beat. Her again? He told Lucia it might not be safe. But Lucia pleaded with the Duke with an expectant look. Miss Katie guarantees their family's boat is very sturdy and has never had a boating accident. Lucia's alluring gaze made it impossible for the Duke to refuse. He had to ask her, when are you going? Lucia happily replied, in 4 days. The next day, Katie's father told her, a new notice has been posted in the city. To rectify public morals, boating on the lake will be restricted, and on designated days, only women will be allowed to go on the lake. Hearing her father's words, Katie was shocked, because the boating restriction started in 3 days, and the time she had arranged with Lucia was exactly 3 days later. Leaving the study, Katie found it very strange. She thought, this can't be a coincidence. She horrifyingly wondered, could it be that Lucia is being held captive? But then she remembered Lucia's flower-like smile and felt it was unlikely. Suddenly, she had a flash of insight, and a mischievous smile appeared on her face, as if she had discovered something. Then, over the next few days, Katie tried every means to invite Lucia out. The naive Lucia would relay the requests to the Duke, seeking his permission. The immensely possessive Duke suffered greatly from this. One day, Lucia happily told the Duke, Miss Katie came to visit. The Duke instinctively flinched. Lucia went on to say that she had heard about a type of fox hunt and really wanted to see it. While tidying his clothes, the Duke repeated his old excuse, telling Lucia he was worried about dangerous wild animals. But Lucia felt that the small woods didn't have anything dangerous. From Lucia's description, the Duke roughly guessed the location. He stroked his chin and thought, if it's just that place, I could fence it off and control access. But I'll need to confirm if it's safe enough for only women to go. Seeing the Duke's continued hesitation, Lucia looked at him with sparkling, expectant eyes and asked, I can't go! The Duke simply couldn't refuse this version of Lucia. After a moment's thought, he agreed. The next second, Lucia broke into an incredibly radiant smile and threw herself into the Duke's arms. The Duke hugged her tightly as well, but his heart was burning with rage. It's that damned Miss Katie again. Night fell again, and Lucia, nestled in the Duke's arms, told him, I want to go to Miss Katie's birthday celebration. Then she looked at the Duke, her expectant eyes blinking. How could the Duke resist? He had to reluctantly agree to his lovely wife's request. The only silver lining was that compared to her previous requests, a birthday banquet was relatively tame. But the next second, Lucia added, "There's a sleepover party after the banquet. I want to stay the night and come back." The Duke's face contorted in pain. He knew it wouldn't be that simple. He sternly rebuked Lucia. "You are a married woman. Do you intend to stay overnight elsewhere?" Hearing this, Lucia was very disappointed and said she would come back right after the banquet. This made the Duke even more upset. He had just wanted Lucia to plead with him a little, but she immediately gave in. He wished Lucia would demand gifts and jewels from him. Even the necklace he gave her she found too extravagant and never wore. At his wit's end, the Duke sullenly agreed, adding irritably, "Are you that happy to leave your husband to an empty bed?" But Lucia retorted that the Duke was also away for several days when he inspected his territory. However, in the Duke's view, that's work. It's different from this. Lucia pouted in dissatisfaction, accusing the Duke of being unfair. Looking at his adorable wife, the Duke couldn't help but smile, and then leaned in and gave her a peck. The Duke told Lucia, "While it's good that you're close with the Milton's daughter, don't learn any strange things from her." In the morning, Lucia was in the garden as usual, enjoying the fragrance of the flowers, while the Duke stood at the window, watching her with a dazed expression. Just then, the butler brought coffee to the study, only to find His Grace on the terrace again. Whenever Lucia personally tended to the flowers in the garden, His Grace, the Duke, would gaze at her obsessively. The butler had noticed that the Duke had been like a different person ever since marrying the lady. He once thought the Duke's marriage was just a whim, but now it seemed that wasn't the case. He wondered if the Duke himself had noticed that whenever he was with his wife, his eyes could see nothing else, fixing solely on her. It was so obvious to any onlooker, yet Lucia remained oblivious. However, the butler also sensed a subtle tension in their relationship. Although their affection was strong, it seemed as if an invisible wall stood between them. The butler placed the coffee on the table. He felt he could no longer keep the matter of the lady's health a secret, so he came to the balcony, looking troubled and hesitating for a long time before telling the Duke, "Madam has not had her monthly period, nor is she pregnant. She also refuses a more detailed examination." The Duke's pupils trembled in utter shock. He suddenly remembered that when they signed the marriage contract, Lucia had said she couldn't get pregnant, a fact he hadn't paid any mind to at the time. The Duke felt as if he'd been struck by a blow, feeling inexplicably suffocated. Coming to his senses, the Duke asked what the attending physician was doing. The butler replied that the symptom wasn't obvious, so the doctor couldn't make a diagnosis unless the lady mentioned it. Then, with a grim look on his face, the Duke ordered the butler to summon the doctor at once. After the butler left, the Duke felt as if all the strength had been drained from him. He leaned on the railing, a look of sorrow appearing in his red eyes, and clenched his fists, muttering, "Damn it." The Duke thought of Lucia again. She was the ideal wife he had always dreamed of, never annoying, never demanding, and never complaining. But he felt this wasn't normal. He had thought he knew Lucia well, but now he realized he had no idea what she was thinking. On the surface, they seemed like a loving couple, but it felt as though Lucia had never truly opened her heart to him. She always greeted him with a smile, and he had assumed she had given him her all. Suddenly, as if remembering something, the Duke summoned the butler and ordered him to bring all of Lucia's expense records for his review. The Duke held the few thin sheets of paper. Incredulous, he stared at the list of expenditures, his red eyes filled with shock. He clutched the papers tightly. Aside from the costs of maintaining the garden and a few tea parties, there wasn't a single personal expense for Lucia. The butler told the Duke that Madame would alter the former Duchess's old dresses to wear, and her jewelry was all heirlooms from the Terran family. Hearing this, the Duke grew angry, though he didn't know why. This was exactly the kind of marriage he had once wanted. He had wanted a wife who was as quiet and docile as a doll, because he only needed a wife in name. That's why he had agreed to the deal with Lucia and signed the contract. It was mutually beneficial for both of them. Lucia had told him that all she needed was the title of Duchess. The Duke had naturally assumed Lucia would become infatuated with power and status, but the facts showed that she couldn't care less about such things. This was clearly no loss for him. He should have been pleased. Yet, at this moment, he felt inexplicably irritated, unsure why he was feeling this way. In reality, Lucia's appearances in the garden were just an excuse. She just wanted to steal more glances of the Duke. The Duke was incredibly busy, so Lucia could only see him at dinner. Although they lived under the same roof, he always felt somewhat out of reach. Lucia thought with a sigh of resignation that the Duke was truly a dedicated lord. One day, Lucia accidentally discovered that the garden was right below the Duke's balcony, and though he was busy at his affairs, he would occasionally appear on the balcony. She was so surprised by her discovery that she covered her mouth. The next moment, Lucia appeared in the garden. She realized she could use tending the garden as an excuse to secretly watch the Duke, and others would just think she was there to admire the flowers. At this thought, Lucia couldn't help but steal a glance at the balcony. Then she spun around abruptly, her heart pounding, because she saw the Duke standing right there. Lucia shyly covered her face. She felt incredibly happy, even if the Duke wasn't looking at her. But now Lucia was conflicted. She desperately wanted to look at the Duke, but she was afraid he would discover her secret intentions. Having found such a good excuse to be here, it felt like a waste not to look at him at all. After a moment's thought, Lucia figured she could just pretend to glance back casually. But when she turned around, Lucia was disappointed to find the balcony empty of the Duke's figure. She knew the Duke was busy and couldn't possibly stare at the garden all day, but she couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment whenever she looked at the empty balcony. Lucia understood that the Duke had fulfilled his duties as a husband. He dined and talked with her almost every evening, and he would come to her bedroom at night. She felt a little sad. She knew she shouldn't be too greedy, but she couldn't help wanting more. Just then, a maid appeared, interrupting Lucia's thoughts and asking her to come inside. She was a bit confused, then realized that only His Grace, the Duke, could summon her like this. She pushed open the door and saw her attending physician. She realized the butler must have told the Duke about her infertility. Although she knew she'd have to talk to the Duke about it eventually, she never expected he would call the doctor. Seeing Lucia standing dazed at the door, the Duke rose and approached to lead her in, but Lucia flinched and took a step back as if startled. The Duke didn't understand what was wrong. Lucia seemed very reluctant. Then, he thoughtfully extended his hand to her. Lucia hesitated for a moment before placing her hand in his. The Duke led her to sit beside him. Dr. Anna asked Lucia a series of questions. When Anna asked if she had ever eaten anything she shouldn't have, she fell silent. She felt that the doctor's questioning made it sound like she had a serious illness. But then the Duke urged her to explain the situation to the doctor. Lucia looked at the Duke's cold gaze with a hint of terror, then turned her head and said that she had taken the wrong medicine as a child. Dr. Anna then asked why she took the medicine, how much, and what its name was. Lucia knew that even if she told the doctor it was 3-leaf mugwort, she couldn't be cured, and moreover, she was unwilling to tell her. So, after a moment of hesitation, she said she didn't know because she was too young at the time to remember clearly. At this point, Dr. Anna was so nervous she was breaking out in a cold sweat. The Duke glanced at Lucia and sensed that something was off. He then ordered everyone to leave the room. Then the Duke looked at Lucia, wanting to have a serious talk. He asked her why she lied. Lucia stared blankly at the Duke. His gentle voice made her feel like the familiar Duke had returned. She told the Duke she hadn't lied, but the Duke said that hiding things was also a form of lying. Lucia was shocked to find that the Duke seemed to have read her mind, guessing her inner thoughts. He pulled Lucia into a tight embrace. "You're not good at lying. It's written all over your face." But Lucia suddenly broke free from his embrace and apologized. "I'm sorry to have worried you." The Duke explained that he didn't blame her for this, but Lucia told him not to worry, as she would never get better anyway. Hearing this, the Duke was confused. He took her hand and asked, "What do you mean by that? How can I not worry when you're unwell?" Lucia retorted, "I told you from the very beginning I couldn't have children. You didn't care then, nor did you ask why. So, why do you want to know now?" The Duke invited Lucia to sit down. "Do you want to talk about the past again?" Speaking of the past, Lucia felt deeply sad. At the time of signing the contract, the Duke had been completely indifferent to the fact that she couldn't have children. The Duke told Lucia he was worried about her health, which is why he hoped she would talk to the doctor and accept treatment. But Lucia's heart was in turmoil. She knew there wasn't a trace of love in the Duke's gentle touches and concerned words, yet they had already stirred up a storm in her heart. Lucia felt that if the Duke didn't love her, it would be better if he were cold to her. That way, she would have a reason to hate him. She told him she didn't want treatment because if she got better, it would make things difficult for him. The Duke, not understanding, pressed her for a reason. At this, Lucia suddenly lost control and yelled at the Duke, "Don't you want to have a child with me?" But the Duke knew it wasn't that he didn't want a child. It was just that he had learned after harshly interrogating Philip that for a common woman without Terran blood to bear his heir, she would have to consume the father's Terran-blooded blood for over a year and spend her first night with him. He knew he couldn't get Lucia pregnant, and besides, he never intended to leave an heir because he didn't want to continue his bloodline. But to make Lucia understand, he would have to reveal many secrets. The Duke looked at the sorrowful Lucia, unsure how to begin. Seeing the Duke's lack of response, Lucia gave a helpless, forced smile. "It seems you don't care at all whether I can get pregnant." Just then, the Duke wanted to tell Lucia the real reason he didn't seem to care, but he quickly covered his mouth. He held his forehead, finally realizing that what Lucia wanted was his concern. At that moment, Lucia's world suddenly fell apart. She recalled the scene of the Duke breaking up with an old lover. She was terrified that if he knew her secret feelings, he would draw a line between them. Lucia wanted to continue living as she was, a life of luxury with a husband whose actions were more considerate than his words. Even if she couldn't have his heart, just being by his side was enough. Lucia knew she had fallen too deep. Not wanting to be a burden, she explained to the Duke that she had never forgotten their agreement from the wedding. The Duke thought with great frustration, "Why did I ever make such an agreement with her?" Suddenly, the Duke pulled Lucia into his arms. He realized he had never seen Lucia angry before. In his memory, Lucia always greeted him with a smile, but he found himself wanting to see more sides of her. The Duke looked at Lucia with sincerity, hoping she would open her heart to him. He still hoped Lucia would accept treatment, but Lucia was still hesitant. She looked at him with hopeful eyes and asked, "If I'm cured, can we have a child?" The Duke remembered Lucia saying she was infertile. She had said it so casually that it made him think she didn't care. but now it was clear that she cared about it a great deal. The Duke gripped Lucia's shoulders tightly. He thought to himself that because of his bloodline, Lucia couldn't get pregnant anyway. If he agreed, it would probably make her very happy. But then he reconsidered, feeling he couldn't deceive her. In the end, the Duke let go of her shoulders. He told Lucia that he did not need an heir. She assumed he was afraid that if she had a child, it would lead to a fight for the inheritance. She looked at the Duke with pleading eyes, assuring him that she could agree to renounce any claim to the inheritance. But the Duke said it wasn't about that. He simply didn't want to continue his bloodline. Hearing this, Lucia pressed him urgently. "Don't you already have a child?" Speaking of the boy, the Duke knew he couldn't say too much. Right now, only Philip knew that Demian wasn't his biological son. He needed to keep these secrets. Lucia pulled away from the Duke's embrace in disappointment, feeling she had expected too much. Then, Lucia suddenly asked worriedly, "You're not going to divorce me, are you?" Hearing this, the Duke instantly lost his composure. He stood up and told her firmly, "Divorce? Not a chance. We agreed from the beginning that divorce was not an option." Lucia looked at the Duke, stunned. Then she sadly acknowledged it. She believed the no-divorce rule was simply a Terran family tradition. The Duke told Lucia he wanted to continue living as they were, but Lucia wished for someone to keep her company when she was alone. She believed the Duke didn't love her at all. He just wanted a wife who wouldn't cause trouble. Heartbroken, Lucia lashed out at the Duke. "Then I won't love you anymore either." At that moment, Lucia only wanted to hurt the Duke. She felt that if he didn't care about her, she had to make him miserable too. But the Duke was already deeply hurt. Lucia looked at the Duke, stunned. She had expected him to retort with cold words, but for a moment, his face was filled with indescribable despair. He lowered his head in anguish and closed his eyes. The next second, when he looked up, all emotion was gone, and his usual cold expression had returned. Lucia covered her mouth in regret. She had only wanted to vent her long-suppressed emotions. But in that moment, she felt as if she had seen the real Duke beneath his cold facade. Lucia wanted to go and hug him, just as she reached out her hand. The Duke said heartlessly, "The end was set from the beginning." That evening, Lucia looked at the delicious food before her with no appetite. The butler offered to prepare something else if the food wasn't to her liking. Lucia waved her hand, declining. Then she glanced at the empty main seat. Sensing her gaze, the butler immediately explained that His Grace was busy with official duties lately. Lucia, disappointed, reminded the butler to take good care of the Duke. Then she cut a piece of steak and put it in her mouth. She had been dining alone for a week now. Lucia heard the Duke was in his office all day, but she knew he was clearly avoiding her. Suddenly, a sharp pain pierced through Lucia's head. The knife and fork in her hand clattered to the floor. The butler looked at her with concern, but Lucia said it was just a small headache and some medicine would fix it. Then she stood up, told the butler she was finished, and prepared to go upstairs. The butler glanced at the steak on the table and saw that she had barely touched it. Back in her bedroom, Lucia tossed and turned, unable to sleep, staring at the closed door. She remembered how the Duke used to quietly come in and hold her, no matter how late he worked. But now, after only a week of his absence, it felt like 1,000 years had passed. Lucia caressed the spot on the bed where the Duke used to sleep. She didn't know what she would do if 1 week turned into a month, or even a year. Although it was a marriage of convenience, all the sweet little moments from before made the present agony unbearable. She stared at the door that would not open, thinking that she had prepared herself for a life of solitude. But then the Duke had been so gentle and considerate, only to suddenly sever all ties. She remembered the adoring look in his eyes, remembered all their wonderful moments together. Lucia thought resentfully that this was all that man's fault. But the next second, tears streamed down her face as she blamed herself for being so greedy. She had given up on having children from the start and married him to change her future. Not long ago, everything was fine. Lucia broke down in uncontrollable sobs, knowing she was the one who had messed everything up. Meanwhile, the Duke stared at the pouring rain outside, his mood extremely foul. Since their argument, Lucia had been coming to the courtyard for a stroll every day, and the Duke would time it to secretly watch her from the window. But if it was raining, he couldn't see her. At this thought, the Duke ran his hands through his hair in frustration. He wanted to see Lucia right now, but then he remembered the look in her eyes on the day of their fight, and so he forced himself to restrain the impulse. Although he had been avoiding her these past few days, in truth, it hadn't even been 2 days before he was already stealing glances whenever she was in the courtyard. The Duke clenched his fists, feeling pathetic. It felt like every day was a year. To avoid Lucia, he buried himself in work, but nothing seemed to go right. He picked up his pen to work, merely trying to prove to himself that he wouldn't be affected by anyone, that he couldn't be swayed by a woman. But Lucia's voice kept echoing in his mind. Just then, there was a knock on the door. His secretary, Ashen, came in holding a stack of documents and placed them on the Duke's desk. The Duke looked helplessly at the mountain of paper. Just as the secretary was about to slip out, the Duke stopped him. "When does that boy have his break?" The secretary knew that boy was young Master Demian. He told the Duke that the young master didn't have a break but could apply for leave. The Duke said, "Then have him come out." Ashen gave a wry smile and reported that school had just started, making it very difficult for the young master to get leave. The Duke spoke coldly. "Since when did you learn to talk back?" Feeling the Duke's stare, Ashen swallowed nervously and said he would see to it at once. The Duke instructed him to prepare the household registration documents. Ashen assumed His Grace had already discussed adding the young lord to the family register with her ladyship. But he couldn't help thinking that if her ladyship also had a child, a battle for succession would be inevitable. Demian, as the Duke's illegitimate son, was a forbidden topic. He was sent to boarding school by the Duke when he was only 6. Just as he was about to leave, Elio knocked on the study door from outside, requesting an audience. Elio handed a letter to the Duke. After reading it, the Duke let out a fierce laugh. He then ordered Elio to mobilize the troops, thinking it had been a long time since he'd gone hunting. This terrified the secretary Ashen, who was standing nearby. After all, the Duke's prey was human. A few years ago, he had accompanied the Duke to the battlefield and learned that His Grace killed without batting an eye, like a veritable demon. What was even more terrifying was his ability to hide his emotions, instantly transforming back into an elegant nobleman. Ashen asked if the Duke would be gone for long, as the young lord might return during that time. After a moment's thought, the Duke ordered Ashen to go pick Demian up, instructing him to warn the boy to be utterly respectful to his mother. He didn't want to hear any gossip upon his return. Trembling, Ashen promised that would not happen. After Ashen left, the Duke leaned back in his chair, recalling reports from the academy that Demian, while not as kind as his father, showed no signs of cruelty either. He knew that even at 8 years old, Demian had Tehran blood, and in front of him, the innocent Lucia was like a helpless rabbit. The Duke worried that Lucia might get hurt while he was away. He recalled how his past feelings for Hugo had made him vulnerable to the former Duke. The Duke warned himself that such a thing could only happen once. His heart must be hard, his will firm. There could be no special exceptions. So he sat down again, picked up his pen, and started to work. But the image of Lucia saying she no longer loved him kept replaying in his mind. Just then, the butler came in to ask about dinner arrangements. The Duke told him not to prepare anything, as he was leaving immediately. The butler suggested that since it was late, the Duke should depart tomorrow. He flatly refused and told the butler to inform her ladyship. The butler looked at the Duke with complex emotions. "May I ask, has her ladyship committed some grave mistake?" The Duke was stunned by the question. Meanwhile, Lucia was shocked to see Dr. Anna at her door. The doctor, with tears streaming down her face, begged Lucia to undergo an examination. She pleaded with Lucia to save her. It turned out the Duke had been summoning her every night to ask about the progress of the treatment. Lucia remembered the Duke saying it was up to her whether she received treatment, yet now he was sending the doctor over every day. Seeing the doctor's look of utter despair, Lucia had no choice but to let her in. Hearing her permission, Dr. Anna thanked her profusely as if she'd been saved. Lucia was speechless, wondering if she should march to his office and slap him to show him she wasn't to be trifled with. Lucia decided to tell Dr. Anna everything. After understanding the situation, Dr. Anna said dejectedly that she didn't know how to treat it either. She then assured Lucia that she would do her best to find a solution. Back in the study, the butler was pleading on her ladyship's behalf with a serious expression. "If her ladyship has done something wrong, I beg your grace to be magnanimous. You haven't spoken to her in days." The Duke warned him impatiently. "You are overstepping." But the butler walked up to the Duke and continued, urging him to cherish his wife. "Her ladyship came to the unfamiliar north all alone. If even you avoid her, she will be truly helpless." The Duke roared in anger. "Shut up!" He clenched his fist and warned the butler, "Why don't you let her say it herself?" The butler, thinking the Duke had misunderstood, quickly explained, "This wasn't at her ladyship's request." The next second, a cup flew past the butler and smashed on the floor. The Duke warned again, "Shut up!" Then he turned and left the study. After the Duke left, the butler dropped to his knees, utterly distraught, feeling he couldn't face her ladyship. He had only made the misunderstanding worse. The Duke covered his face, remembering the butler's words. "If even you avoid her, she will be truly helpless." The timeline returns to the day of their fight. When Lucia learned the Duke wouldn't have a child with her, the light in her eyes died. No matter what the Duke said, she just agreed numbly, her heart like dead ashes. Furious, the Duke pushed Lucia down onto the sofa. He demanded loudly, "Do you even know what I'm saying? You just agree?" But Lucia simply closed her eyes. The Duke looked at the Duchess before him, as docile as a puppet. This was the perfect wife he had always dreamed of. But he didn't know why he felt so miserable now. His pupils suddenly trembled. He realized he had fallen in love with the woman before him. Unable to accept it, he shot to his feet, terrified of being swayed by Lucia. Unwittingly, Lucia had already captured his heart. The Duke paced the room anxiously, telling himself this couldn't be happening. He turned back and once again demanded that Lucia accept treatment. Lucia stated that if she accepted treatment, she might get pregnant. But the Duke told her it was impossible to have a child. She pressed on, "What if I do get pregnant?" Covering his face, the Duke blurted out, "Then the child is definitely not mine!" After saying it, the Duke suddenly realized his mistake. He panicked, preparing to explain himself to Lucia. But Lucia was already deeply wounded. She cut him off. "Do you mean you won't acknowledge the child? Or are you accusing me of being unchaste?" At that moment, the Duke knew he needed to soothe Lucia, to explain and apologize quickly, but the words wouldn't come out. In the end, he just threw out a whatever and fled, leaving Lucia alone and heartbroken. Back in the present, the Duke recalled the butler's words again. Has her ladyship committed some grave mistake? He had an epiphany. He was the one who had made the mistake. Without realizing it, he had wandered into the garden. Just as he was about to turn back, he saw Lucia's figure. He hesitated for a moment, then clenched his fist as if he had made a decision, and walked towards her. Lucia turned and saw him too. Their eyes met. Seeing the Duke again, Lucia suddenly felt the urge to cry, but the next second, she smiled at him. The Duke froze. In that instant, it felt as if everything but Lucia had lost its color. The anguish and irritation that had been tormenting him vanished in a puff of smoke. He finally understood what he was truly afraid of. It wasn't being swayed by her, but the fear of losing that smile. Lucia told him, "The flowers in the garden are about to bloom. I hear you've been very busy lately." The Duke replied, "The busy work is all done, but I have some other matters to attend to out of town." He suddenly noticed that Lucia's maids were nowhere near her. Lucia happily told him that since the rain had stopped, she thought it would be romantic to have some tea here. She then asked if he would like to join her if he wasn't busy. The two of them then went to the greenhouse together. The Duke watched Lucia with a sad, dazed look in his eyes. While Lucia feigned happiness, her gaze averted. The Duke uncontrollably took Lucia's hand and asked what she had been up to lately. Lucia found him a bit strange and joked, "We're talking as if we haven't seen each other in a long time, but it's only been a few days." Hearing this, a storm raged inside the Duke. For him, these few short days had felt like an eternity. He thought about how he'd been unable to eat or sleep, while Lucia appeared completely unfazed, which pained him. Yet, he didn't want Lucia to suffer as he had. The Duke gently caressed her cheek. He never imagined that such a delicate woman could cause him so much turmoil. He looked at Lucia and then sincerely apologized for his reckless words. He told Lucia that he never meant to call her unchaste, but that the Terran family bloodline was rare, making conception extremely difficult. She would likely have trouble having children, and he didn't want her to get her hopes up only to be disappointed, which caused him to misspeak. "I'm sorry for hurting you with such bastardly words." The Duke gripped Lucia's hand tightly again. Lucia wanted to tell him it was all right, but tears streamed uncontrollably down her cheeks. She covered her mouth, not understanding what was happening. She was trying to smile, but the tears just wouldn't stop falling. Lucia frantically wiped the tears from her face. She couldn't hold it in any longer and, covering her face, she burst into tears. The Duke panicked even more. He knelt before Lucia and apologized again. "I'm sorry, I was wrong." Until a moment ago, Lucia felt as if she were in hell, thinking she would definitely slap the Duke the moment she saw him. But the instant she truly saw him, all her accumulated resentment vanished completely. She remembered a similar situation from before. It was the first time she had seen the Duke. In a sea of people, he was the only one who caught her eye, as if they were the only two people in the world. Lucia knew clearly that she loved the Duke. When they had met, just now, Lucia was terrified that if the Duke knew her true feelings, he would distance himself from her. So she told herself to hide this love, to never let him find out. She had to smile as if nothing was wrong, just like she always did. Lucia covered her mouth, looking at the somewhat flustered man before her. Even though she had already forgiven him, she couldn't stop the tears from welling up. It wasn't because of how deeply the Duke had hurt her, but because of his gentle tone now, and the hand caressing her cheek filled her with immense joy. Lucia hugged the Duke tightly, wanting to return to how they were a few months ago. With tears in her eyes, she let out a long sigh of relief, feeling much more at ease now that she had clarified her own feelings. Lucia stole a glance at the Duke. She finally understood now that he must like her. She thought that no matter how much of a flirtatious the Duke had been, she was now his legal wife. She decided to love him with all her might on an equal footing, even if it took her entire life. At this thought, Lucia suddenly pushed the Duke away, and with tears in her eyes, she demanded to know if he admitted his mistake. The Duke hastily and obediently nodded. The next second, Lucia said, "I forgive you, but on 2 conditions." The Duke was a little uneasy. "There are conditions?" He asked Lucia what they were. With tears still on her cheeks, Lucia told the Duke, "First, give me a reconciliation kiss." The Duke was a bit surprised. He hadn't expected such a condition. Of course, he was happy to accept. The next moment, the two were kissing. "The second condition," Lucia stated, "is that I want to change the contract. The original contract stipulated that I couldn't interfere with your private life. Lucia demands that he cannot have other lovers." The Duke felt quite helpless. He hadn't so much as glanced at another woman since their marriage. Yet in Lucia's eyes, he seemed like a despicable person, and he couldn't refute it. He took Lucia's hand, placed a light kiss on its back, and replied gently, "As you wish." After their agreement, Lucia finally smiled. Just then, a subordinate came to report that it was time for the Duke to depart. The Duke looked at Lucia. Although he now understood his feelings for her, there were still many secrets he needed time to decide how much to confess, and this trip would give him that time to think. Meanwhile, the secretary, Ashen, was ordered. to pick up the young master, Demian, from school and bring him home. After introducing himself, the two quickly boarded the carriage back to the mansion. Inside the bumpy carriage, Ashen looked at the cold young master. He felt that enduring this awkward atmosphere all the way to Royan would be sheer torture. So, Ashen deliberately cleared his throat twice, and then asked with a smile how the young master was doing at school. Demian just glanced at him, then coldly turned his head back to the window. Ashen was speechless. Indeed, blood ties don't lie. The young master, in both appearance and aura, was the spitting image of the Duke. No paternity test was needed. Just as he was marveling at how the young master was so mature for his age, Demian suddenly turned his head, his sharp gaze questioning, "Your rank doesn't seem to permit you to pick me up, does it?" Ashen was stunned. He hadn't expected the 8-year-old master Demian to not only remember him but also recall his position so clearly. He couldn't help but sigh in admiration. The Terran family bloodline was truly extraordinary. Ashen swallowed nervously and explained that he was here on the Duke's orders because the ducal household had recently welcomed a new mistress. Upon hearing this, Demian recalled that although he had been boarding at school for a long time, he had always diligently received family news according to the Duke's wishes, so he had naturally heard about this matter. Ashen figured that since the young master and the Duchess now had a mother-son relationship, the Duke probably wanted them to get to know each other. When Demian heard mother-son relationship, he realized he might have overestimated the secretary, because in his eyes, the Duke was not a thoughtful person. Demian was a bit puzzled. Did the Duke not have any other instructions? At this, Ashen's eyes darted around, and he stammered that the Duke hoped the young master would not be disrespectful to his mother and should be completely reverent. However, Demian interpreted this as a warning from the Duke to know his place, because he understood that as an illegitimate son, if he wanted to make his identity public, the Duchess's assistance would be indispensable. At this thought, Demian suddenly asked, "Is she beautiful?" Ashen was baffled as to why the young master would suddenly ask this, but he still reported truthfully, "I haven't seen her many times, so I'm not too sure." Demian thought one could tell if someone was beautiful at a single glance. It seemed she probably wasn't very pretty. He then continued to look out the carriage window. He believed his new mother would never welcome him, so he planned to hide in his room and not come out, preparing himself to be tormented. In any case, it wouldn't last more than a week. He would just have to endure it. In the blink of an eye, the Duke had been gone for several days. Lucia wondered when he would return. The butler, however, helplessly told her it would be at least a month. Lucia only knew the Duke had gone to handle matters in his territory. Previously, she had deliberately ignored such things, but now she wanted to know more about him. The butler, unaware that the two had reconciled, feared the Duchess would misunderstand, and explained that the Duke's trip was just an annual routine affair. Lucia sipped her tea while listening to the butler's description. Suddenly, she gasped, covering her mouth. The butler beside her jumped in fright. Lucia remembered she had completely forgotten that today was the Duke's birthday. She had been so busy being angry with the Duke that she had forgotten about it. Tearfully, she blamed the butler for not reminding her, otherwise she could have celebrated with the Duke before he left. The butler dejectedly told Lucia that the Duke had never celebrated his birthday and was unwilling to talk about his childhood experiences. Lucia suddenly felt sad. Did the Duke not have any fond childhood memories? Even though her own childhood wasn't great, she had shared happy times with her mother before entering the palace. Lucia recalled the West Tower tragedy the butler had once mentioned. She felt there must be an unspeakable truth behind it. Why did his brother have to make such a choice? The Duke had said the Terran family line was thin. Logically, they should want more heirs, which made his resistance to her pregnancy even more illogical. But Lucia remembered the Duke mentioning he didn't need to leave his bloodline. She could feel the bone-deep disgust in his tone. Lucia grew curious. Could it be that Demian was a child a woman had secretly born against his will? But then again, the Duke was too cold to Demian, as if he weren't his biological son. Lucia was shocked by her own absurd idea, and quickly dismissed her speculation. In the evening, a maid prepared the medicine for Lucia to drink. Lucia had also heard that Dr. Anna had been relentlessly searching for a cure. It seemed she had changed the prescription again. She picked up the medicinal soup and took only a small sip. It was incredibly bitter, but for Dr. Anna's sake, she had to force herself to drink it. After finishing it, however, she discovered that the taste of this herbal medicine was surprisingly similar to the prescription Dr. Philip had given her in her dream. The next day, looking at the bright sunny weather, Lucia remarked that it was a perfect day for horseback riding. Just then, a maid rushed over to tell Lucia that the young master, Demian, had returned. Suddenly learning of Demian's return, she hurried to the entrance. Upon seeing Demian, Lucia was utterly stunned, because she found that Demian was a miniature version of the Duke. She had previously suspected Demian wasn't the Duke's biological son, but now it seemed absolutely impossible that he wasn't. Demian looked at the dumbfounded Lucia. He thought she must be speechless right now, having just married only to discover her husband had an illegitimate son. He even imagined Lucia's next move. A. Glare furiously from the shock. B. Storm off in anger. C. Look down on him with disgust. D. Without a second thought, slap him across the face. But in reality, Lucia simply said politely, "Hello." This was completely beyond his expectations. In his view, compared to those who showed their emotions on their faces, The Duchess, who showed no trace of her feelings, was more like a high-level opponent, very difficult to deal with. He remembered his conversation with Ashton earlier. It turned out she was very beautiful after all. The butler, standing aside, reminded Lucia that the young master was tired from his long journey and needed rest. She then asked Damien if he had eaten lunch. Damien replied that he had no appetite, but Lucia insisted, "You're at a growing age. You can't be like this." She instructed the butler to prepare some easily digestible food for the young master. After bowing politely to Lucia, Damien followed a servant into the mansion. Lucia watched his departing back and sighed in admiration. She thought Damien was absolutely adorable. Seeing him was like seeing the Duke as a child. She then asked the butler curiously, "Is Damien really only 8 years old?" The butler didn't know how to explain and could only reply, "Perhaps the young master is just naturally built differently." Lucia thought about it and agreed, after all, the Duke's son couldn't possibly be short. The butler suddenly worried that Damien's appearance might be too much for the Duchess to accept all at once. But the next second, Lucia was surrounded by pink, heart-shaped bubbles, exclaiming that Damien was so cute and looked so well-behaved. The usually composed butler was completely floored. He had no idea where Lucia got the idea that Master Damien was cute when he was clearly as aloof as the Duke. He even suspected the Duchess's eyesight might be failing. But Lucia was already starting to look forward to having dinner with Damien. The butler watched Lucia hum a little tune as she left, thinking that either the Duchess had gone mad, or he had. The butler couldn't understand why Lucia could be so happy about a suddenly appearing illegitimate son. Or was she just too shocked to react? At this thought, the butler wiped his tears, feeling that the Duchess was just too pitiful. In the evening, Damien awoke from his nap to the scent of flowers. He went out to the terrace, and seeing the garden in full bloom, he decided to go take a closer look. Just as Damien was lost in the fragrance of the flowers, a voice called out. He turned to see a smiling Lucia. He was confused as to why the Duchess seemed so happy to see him. Lucia then gently expressed her concern, asking if he was hungry. This made Damien realize that not only was the Duchess beautiful, but her voice was also very kind. He increasingly felt that the Duchess was a formidable character. The two of them were not on the same channel, and Lucia thought she was disturbing him. Damien quickly denied it, shyly explaining that he had never spoken with a young woman before, had no memory of his birth mother, and his academy was all male, so he was a bit timid. The usually cold Damien even, for the first time ever, praised the garden for being beautiful. Hearing this, Lucia was even happier, and invited Damien to take a walk with her. He was so much like the Duke that Lucia couldn't help but steal glances at him. She found that looking at Damien could slightly ease her longing for the Duke. Just then, Damien suddenly turned and stared back at Lucia. Caught in the act, Lucia felt a bit awkward. She quickly changed the subject, asking Damien, "Are you on vacation now?" Damien replied that he didn't have vacations but could apply for leave from school. Lucia was even more surprised. She felt Damien's mature tone was also very similar to the Duke's. Damien continued to explain. "His Grace ordered me to return. He also told me to pay my respects to the Duchess." Damien actually called her the Duchess. Was he trying to draw a line between them starting with the title? On second thought, Lucia figured she would probably be startled if he called her mother directly. Thinking of this, Lucia told Damien with a serious expression, "To be honest, it's also hard for me to think of you as my son right away." Hearing this, Damien was flustered. He hadn't expected the Duchess to answer in such a way. Lucia continued, "I suppose it's also difficult for you to see me as your mother." Damien thought he must have done something wrong for Lucia to say such a thing. But Lucia explained, "I'm not blaming you. It's just that we've only just met and are strangers to each other, so it's natural to feel a sense of distance." Damien's brow furrowed. He didn't know what the Duchess's purpose was in saying all this to him. Lucia was surprised to see that Damien was now on guard, like a small black panther with its fur standing on end. She covered her irrepressible smile. She thought Damien was absolutely adorable like this. She wanted to pinch his little cheeks and ruffle his hair. But she worried that doing so would only make him more wary of her. So, Lucia gave a strategic cough to calm herself down. She remembered she was only 10 years older than Damien. After a moment of thought, she said with a straight face, "If that were the case, it would mean I had a child at 10, which would make your father a criminal." Hearing this, Damien almost burst out laughing. Then she told Damien not to be so formal and not to call her the Duchess so coldly. She extended her hand to him, telling him to just call her Lucia. Damien didn't understand why Lucia was doing this. To her, he was someone who shouldn't exist, and if the Duchess had her own child, he would become a stumbling block. As the Duchess, there was absolutely no need for her to build a good relationship with him. Seeing Damien's lack of response, Lucia thought he was unwilling. Damien had no idea what Lucia was up to, so he could only extend his hand and decide to take things one step at a time. She realized Damien was on high alert around her. Lucia knew that even if she told him now that she wasn't an enemy, he probably wouldn't believe her. After all, as an illegitimate child without a mother, The first thing he likely learned was to be wary of others. But that was alright. Lucia believed that time would eventually reveal a person's true heart. Every day, Damien would have lunch and dinner with Lucia. Before meals, he would thoughtfully pull out her chair for her, and Lucia would thank him. He stole a glance at Lucia sitting across from him. He found it amazing. Even though the time he spent with her each day wasn't long, just meals and a walk afterward, for some reason, he found himself looking forward to this time more and more. And because of the Duchess's unconcealed kindness towards him, even the servants became more meticulous when attending to him. Damien believed this was all thanks to the Duchess. In the evening, Lucia learned from Katie's letter that Madame Michel had sprained her ankle. She gave a letter to the butler, instructing him to send fine medicine and flowers to Madame Michel. Lucia thought she should find time to visit. She then suddenly wondered what Damien was doing and asked the butler. The butler told her that, aside from dining and walking with her, the young master spent all his time studying. The next day, when Lucia saw Damien, she praised him for his diligence in studying, complimenting him, such a good boy. Suddenly praised, Damien blushed slightly. Lucia thought a blushing Damien was truly adorable. He explained, "I'm only studying hard to avoid falling behind when I go back to school." Just then, Lucia suddenly stopped and faced Damien. "Why don't you call him father? Did he tell you not to?" Damien was a bit surprised, then lowered his head in disappointment. He felt the Duke would hate being called that. Lucia couldn't understand why he would think that. She encouraged Damien, "Call him father. He definitely won't hate it." She then remembered Damien hadn't called her by her name either, so she pouted and complained, "You don't call me by my name either." But in her heart she thought, "I know you're deliberately omitting the address." His little trick discovered, Damien became flustered and quickly denied it. "It's not like that." Lucia leaned down slightly and gently invited Damien to call her by her name, adding, "Don't I call you Damien?" After a moment's hesitation, he called out the name, "Lucia." Lucia's attending physician, Dr. Anna, happened to run into Dr. Philip. She had heard that Dr. Philip was also a physician for the ducal family and was highly skilled. In order to cure the Duchess, Dr. Anna paid him a visit. However, she ultimately did not tell Dr. Philip about the Duchess's infertility. She felt that as a woman of noble status, it was inappropriate to disclose her condition to others. Upon her return, the butler summoned Dr. Anna. He had learned that she had visited Dr. Philip and warned her not to let Dr. Philip see the Duchess or mention anything about her, as these were the Duke's orders. Although Dr. Anna knew Dr. Philip was highly skilled, the butler's words left her feeling helpless. Meanwhile, Katie, whom Lucia hadn't seen in a long time, arrived. She enthusiastically linked arms with Lucia, telling her that her grandaunt was much better and thanking Lucia for sending the medicine. Hearing Katie's words, Lucia finally felt relieved. At first, Madame Michel often came to Rouen to mentor her, but after Lucia's tea parties began running smoothly, she reduced her visits, citing her health. Later, they only communicated occasionally through messages passed by Katie. Just then, Katie had someone bring over a basket. Cradling it like a treasure, she told Lucia, "This is the gift I promised you last time." Lucia was very curious about what Katie had prepared. She let Lucia open it herself. A fluffy little fox appeared before her eyes. Lucia was instantly charmed, exclaiming how adorable the little fox was. Katie also smiled, saying, "It's my first time seeing such a beautiful little fox too. It might be even more handsome when it grows up." A few weeks ago, Katie had promised to give Lucia a fox for fox hunting. Lucia thought she was just saying it, but she didn't expect Katie to actually remember. She was very moved and thanked Katie for such a wonderful gift. But Katie replied, "I'm happy if you like it." At that moment, Lucia covered her mouth, suddenly remembering it was time to go riding. She then invited Katie to go with her. But before that, she had someone to introduce. Lucia handed the little fox to a maid and asked her to bring Damien over. Katie, however, was confused about who this Damien was. Lucia explained, "Damien is the Duke's son, and of course, now he's my son too." Katie was instantly dumbfounded. Meanwhile, Dr. Anna was diligently studying medical texts. Ever since the butler had spoken to her, she hadn't gone to see Dr. Philip again, but she felt that Dr. Philip was incredibly knowledgeable and didn't want to miss any opportunity to cure the Duchess. So, she unconsciously found herself at Dr. Philip's doorstep. While she was still debating whether to go in, Dr. Philip suddenly opened the door with a bright smile and invited her in. The two talked until evening, and Dr. Anna finally thanked him and prepared to leave. Just then, Dr. Anna stopped and turned back to ask, "Can I come and see you again next time?" Dr. Philip smiled and said, "Of course, anytime at all." From then on, Dr. Anna visited him frequently, and Dr. Philip would teach her everything he knew. Lucia called Damien over and introduced him to her good friend Katie. At this, Katie's expression was extremely tense. She thought, "I'm not mentally prepared for this." Damien politely greeted Katie. Katie also stammered that it was an honor to meet the young lord. Katie felt that even when she had tripped at a banquet before, she had never found it this hard to control her expression. However, Lucia really liked Damien's composed manner of speaking. Lucia then asked Damien if he knew how to ride a horse. Damien said he had learned at school, so Lucia wanted to invite him to go riding with them. Hearing this, Katie looked horrified and incredulous. Damien had intended to use studying as an excuse to decline Lucia's invitation, but Lucia persuaded him that it wasn't good to be cooped up indoors all the time, adding that if he kept it up, he might not grow tall. Damien flinched at her words and obediently nodded in agreement. Just then, Katie reminded her, "Isn't the stable we're going to for ladies only?" But Lucia tilted her head and said she knew. She argued that since Damien was only 8, he didn't count as a man. Damien's jaw dropped at the unexpected "doesn't count as a man." Katie couldn't help but laugh out loud. Looking at Damien's slightly shy expression, she thought, this is how a boy his age should be. Arriving at the racecourse, whenever Lucia greeted the noble ladies, she would introduce Damien to them each time. And these ladies would, without exception, look as if they had swallowed a fly, even thinking she was being irrational. But Lucia didn't care. At first, Katie couldn't understand why she was doing this either, and even suspected she might have ulterior motives. But after careful observation, Katie realized Lucia was not a two-faced or duplicitous person. Under Lucia's influence, she even slowly came to accept the situation. After their ride, the three went to the lounge. Lucia couldn't understand why everyone looked at Damien with such cold eyes when he was the heir personally announced by the Duke. Katie told her, it's probably because of an unspoken tradition. After all, there's never been a precedent of an illegitimate son inheriting a title after being officially registered. Lucia was chatting with Katie in the lounge at the stables. Just then, Countess Philia arrived with 2 baskets of yellow roses, saying she wanted to give them to Lucia and Katie. She told Lucia that she recently had a new granddaughter, and it was a northern custom to give yellow flowers to people around them to bless the granddaughter with health and beauty. Lucia was surprised, as she had never heard of such a custom. She happily offered her congratulations to the Countess. After the Countess left, Katie leaned in and whispered to Lucia, although it's a northern custom, very few people actually do it because yellow roses are far too expensive. In the carriage on the way back to the city, Lucia stared blankly at the basket of yellow roses. Just then, Damien suddenly spoke up. Can I ask you a question? Don't you hate me? Damien believed Lucia had every reason to hate him. But Lucia lifted Damien's chin and told him, negative emotions torment you first. Why would you make things hard for yourself? I don't hate you, and I don't plan to. Damien thought it over. If Lucia were to have a child, he would become a stumbling block, and her kindness would instantly turn into malice. Damien told himself he couldn't trust her words. Just then, Lucia continued, I knew about you before I got married. In fact, my acceptance of your existence was the condition your father agreed to marry me. Damien was suddenly and shamefully incredulous. He had never heard of this before. Lucia explained to him, the Duke may not be a loving father, but don't think he hates you because of it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made you his heir. Damien suddenly wanted to believe Lucia, because no one had ever said such things to him before. Damien greatly admired the Duke, because he felt the Duke was very powerful. He remembered the Duke had promised that as long as he could graduate, the position of heir would be passed to him. He believed his goal now was to secure his position as heir, because he was afraid that if he didn't even have the value of a qualified successor, he would be mercilessly abandoned. He felt that being acknowledged by his grace was enough for him. As for fatherly love, he had never expected it. Lucia encouraged him. You will definitely become as powerful as the Duke, because you are his son. Damien shyly agreed. When Lucia returned carrying a basket of yellow roses, the butler looked as if he had been struck by lightning, frozen on the spot. Those were the Duke's most hated flower, yellow roses. She handed the flowers to the butler, and then left with Damien, leaving the butler alone, disheveled in the wind with tears streaming down his face. He looked at the yellow roses in his hands, having no idea what to do with them. The scene changes to Lucia and Damien having afternoon tea. Lucia suddenly mentioned again that there seemed to be no roses in the garden. So she turned to the butler and said, I'd like to turn the garden into a rose garden next spring. Hearing this, the butler froze. He then tried to persuade Lucia to reconsider, because his grace was not very fond of them. Hearing this, Lucia turned to ask Damien, did you ever notice that there are no roses in the garden? Damien sat up straight and answered seriously, no. She figured that unless someone paid special attention to flowers, they generally wouldn't notice. The butler's tears streamed down his face as he thought, his grace is precisely that kind of person. Lucia even doubted if the Duke knew the different types of flowers. Then she suddenly remembered there was one kind he definitely knew. Before she could say it, the butler deliberately interrupted her with a cough. The butler's antics successfully made Lucia laugh. She said that even if she planted roses, she would exclude that color, telling the butler not to worry. But the butler was on the verge of a breakdown. It wasn't about the color at all. The Duke had once ordered that roses were forbidden from ever appearing in his sight. Late at night, the air was thick with the smell of blood. The butler, along with knights and servants, was waiting at the entrance to greet them. It turned out that the Duke who went to inspect the territory had returned. After learning from the butler that the Duchess was already asleep, the Duke nodded, and then unconsciously found himself at the door to Lucia's bedroom. After a month, he didn't know how Lucia was doing. Just as he was about to open the door, he suddenly stopped. He looked at his blood-stained body and clenched his fists. He realized that the smell of blood, which he had never cared about before, had become so pungent. The Duke didn't want Lucia to see him like this. He then went to the bathroom. He felt he couldn't wash away the stench of blood from his body. He remembered what Dr. Philip had once said. The special trait of the Terran bloodline is its ability to pass down extraordinary physical prowess and perception to its descendants. And the blood flowing in your veins is purer than anyone else's. After his bath, the Duke sat down by Lucia's bed. He found that just looking at her flawless face stirred something deep within him. He carefully pulled back the covers and lay down beside her. Gazing at her sound asleep, he couldn't help but let out a doting, foolish smile. He gently placed a kiss on her cheek, then held Lucia tightly in his arms. The Duke found that holding her soft body in his embrace could actually calm the ferocity within him. But after only a moment, he suddenly blushed. Realizing his own heart couldn't seem to settle, the Duke warned himself not to wake Lucia, who was sleeping soundly. He'd only intended to hold her until he fell asleep. Yet, he also thought it was a bit much that Lucia was just sleeping soundly when he had finally returned. Convinced by his own excuse, the Duke leaned close to Lucia's ear, intending to gently wake her, but he found Lucia unresponsive. So he wrapped his arms around Lucia's slender waist, gently shook her twice, and softly called her name. But Lucia still didn't react. The Duke was speechless that she couldn't be woken up even like this. His fighting spirit roused, he had no intention of letting Lucia off the hook, so he directly pulled off the blanket and began kissing Lucia's neck. Suddenly, Lucia was startled awake by the strange sensation, and the Duke appeared before her. She reached out a hand, almost disbelieving, and caressed his cheek. She had thought it was a dream, but he had truly returned. The next second, Lucia hugged the Duke tightly, and then initiated a kiss. The Duke held Lucia's back, and Lucia wrapped her arms around his neck. Both were eager to feel each other's affection. The Duke kissed Lucia's neck, which made Lucia feel very ticklish. So the Duke suggested, "Then let's do something that isn't ticklish," and leaned in for a kiss. Just then, Lucia suddenly slapped his hand and pushed him away, saying, "No, I have to get up early tomorrow." The Duke looked at Lucia with great confusion. It turned out Lucia was preparing for the garden banquet 3 days later. Since it was her first time opening the garden to outsiders, she vowed to make it a beautiful success. The Duke suddenly realized Lucia seemed to have been doing quite well during his absence. While he didn't wish for Lucia to cry all day, he was still a bit displeased. Then Lucia suddenly told the Duke that Damien had returned, and she hoped the father and son could get along well. So she suggested they could have lunch together. However, the Duke said he wouldn't have time until dinner and then retorted, "Has Damien been disrespectful to you?" Hearing this, Lucia was stunned. She was speechless to find that the Duke completely misunderstood his son. Damien was clearly mature and steady, and his conduct with others was beyond reproach. The Duke continued, "If that brat disrespects you, just tell me and I'll beat him up." To the Duke's utter surprise, Lucia told him that would never happen, adding, "We got along wonderfully while you were away." After saying this, she snuggled into the Duke's embrace and fell into a deep sleep. The next day, Lucia woke up to the dazzling sunlight. She tried to move her limbs, only to find her entire body felt weak. However, remembering that the Duke had truly returned last night, she couldn't help but secretly let out a smile, hiding under the covers. She recalled how the Duke had looked when he returned last night. Lucia felt like she was floating on clouds. How could she be so happy? She felt she could do anything now, and encouraged herself to prepare diligently for the banquet. But before that, she first had to get through the awkward bathing time. The Duke had come straight to her room last night as soon as he returned, so the maids would surely be gossiping about her and the Duke again. The busy day quickly came to an end. Lucia, full of anticipation, thought, after a whole day of busyness, I finally waited for the healing dinner time. This is our family's first dinner together. Just the three of us. But when the three sat at the dining table, the atmosphere was quiet. The Duke and Damien were immediately awkward. However, Lucia, with her unique way of thinking, found the father and son now resembled a charming lion king and a little cub. The maids nearby, observing the atmosphere, thought, "Madame is truly amazing. If I had to eat in such an atmosphere, I'd probably choke." Lucia believed the Duke didn't dislike Damien, and Damien had also said he respected his father. So, she thought, as long as she mediated, it should be fine. So she told the Duke she wanted to bring Damien to the banquet. The Duke cast a cold glance at Damien. However, Damien, who had just learned of this, was now utterly terrified and flustered. The Duke was somewhat curious. Isn't this a ladies' banquet? In Lucia's eyes, Damien was only 8 years old, so he shouldn't be considered a man yet. As soon as these words were spoken, silence fell over the dining room. Then the Duke chuckled and agreed with Lucia's point of view. Damien, whose face was already flushed with embarrassment, was instantly startled. The Duke actually spoke such indecent words at the dining table. After her attempts to dissuade him failed, Lucia stood up in shame and anger, storming out and slamming the door. The innocent Damien, however, was full of questions, not knowing which remark had angered her. The Duke was amused by Lucia's angry expression. When he laughed, Damien was utterly shocked for an eternity. He then realized that the Duke could actually laugh. This laugh was neither a sneer nor mockery, but a genuine heartfelt laugh. And all of this was because of Lucia. Just then, Lucia returned, poking her head in from outside the door, and asked Damien to join her for a walk. The Duke and Damien both froze for a moment. After realizing what was happening, Damien secretly glanced at the Duke, then scurried over to Lucia's side, leaving him alone in the empty dining room. The Duke was still full of questions, wondering what exactly was going on. Lucia and Damien took a stroll in the garden. Damien secretly glanced at Lucia, finding it amazing that she wasn't afraid of the Duke. Lucia was amused by his comment. She told Damien that no wife would be afraid of her husband, and countered, "If you get married someday, would you want your wife to be afraid of you?" Damien shook his head. His reaction brought a relieved smile to Lucia's face. But Damien still didn't understand. Lucia was a delicate, kind herbivore, while the Duke was a powerful, fierce carnivore. How could two people at such opposite extremes get along so well? Then Lucia curiously asked Damien if he was afraid of his father. Damien admitted, "A little," but when Lucia asked him why he was afraid of the Duke, he couldn't answer. She closed her eyes and earnestly told Damien, "It's because you don't understand your father that you're afraid of him." Lucia told him to repeat the word father after her. The unfamiliar word made Damien very hesitant, but Lucia kept urging him. Finally, Damien, blushing, uttered the words, "Father." Lucia smiled with relief, instinctively wanting to reach out and pat his head, but before she could touch him, he cautiously dodged away. At this moment, Damien was like a startled kitten. Lucia then realized she had overstepped. She apologized to Damien and explained, "People usually pat children's heads when they praise them. If you don't like it, I won't do it." Damien lowered his head and hesitated for a moment, then shyly mumbled that he didn't dislike it. He just had never been so close to anyone before. Lucia found Damien's reaction adorable. She tentatively asked, "Can I pat you now?" Damien shyly nodded. She carefully extended her hand and placed it on his head, her heart pounding. After patting him for a while, Lucia was amused by Damien's obedient demeanor and let out a silly giggle. Damien, with his little face flushed, obediently allowed Lucia to caress him. Lucia suddenly remembered that since Damien had been at school, he probably didn't have a tuxedo to wear to the banquet. She was a bit troubled about what to do. Just then, Damien from behind her said, "Actually, it's fine if I don't go." Before he could finish, Lucia directly rejected his request. Although Lucia didn't want Damien to do anything against his will, there was a social custom that children who would enter society in the future needed to be introduced in advance, and this banquet had invited all the prominent figures of the northern social circles. Lucia believed that if Damien were formally introduced on such an occasion, his status would certainly be vastly different. Just then, the Duke arrived. He told Lucia that ready-made clothes could be prepared for Damien, as it was only a garden banquet, and there was no need to overemphasize attire. Lucia thought that she would need to prepare clothes for Damien that would be suitable for a 12-year-old, but the Duke was puzzled. Damien was clearly only 8 years old. Lucia explained that although Damien was only 8, he was a giant compared to his peers. She even teased the Duke. "He might even be taller than you were at 8. Before she finished speaking, Damien beside her turned pale, as he noticed a sharp gaze sweeping towards him. Lucia then asked the Duke why he hadn't gone to his office after dinner. Hearing this, the Duke felt as if he were hindering them both. Then Lucia came over to him, wanting to use this opportunity to have Damien formally bow to him. She waved to Damien. Damien, blushing, reluctantly approached the Duke, then bowed. "It's been a long time since I've greeted you. How have you been these past few days?" Lucia quietly reminded Damien to call him father. Damien lowered his head and remained silent for a moment, then looked up at the Duke with resolute eyes and called out, "Father!" At this moment, Damien was extremely nervous. He had never uttered that word before and was terrified the Duke would reject him. Hearing the word father, the Duke was somewhat stunned. Then Lucia gently nudged him with her arm, and flashed a brilliant smile that was like a silent pressure. The Duke could only turn and look at Damien, acknowledging his address of father. Receiving his response, Damien instantly felt relieved and showed a contented smile. Lucia, seeing this scene, was also filled with relief. Then she smiled and suggested they all go for a walk. The Duke, however, raised an eyebrow and glanced at Damien. Damien, guided by his carnivore instincts, sensed a hint of danger. Although he didn't know why, he felt there seemed to be no place for him here. So he immediately bowed to Lucia and said goodbye, finally wishing them both a good evening. With that, he turned and scurried away. Watching Damien's retreating back, the Duke suddenly felt that he wasn't entirely useless after all. However, the Duke truly hadn't expected Lucia to get along so well with Damien. He had previously prepared himself to tolerate them as long as they didn't become irreconcilable enemies. But he found that Lucia always seemed to exceed his expectations in various ways. The Duke didn't know why Lucia wanted to bring Damien to the garden banquet. She explained to him that since Damien was now his son, he was also her son, so she wanted to introduce him to everyone. The Duke was somewhat surprised that Lucia could say the word son so easily. Lucia paused for a moment. "Do you wish me to be indifferent to the child?" Then she sadly thought, Or do you think I'm approaching Demian with ulterior motives? The Duke quickly grasped her shoulders and explained it wasn't like that. It was just the scene of Lucia petting Demian earlier. That reminded him of how Hugo also used to like patting his head a long time ago. Even when he disliked it, he couldn't stop Hugo's goofy smile. Hugo would even actively let him pat his head. Thinking of this, the Duke hugged Lucia tightly, his face beaming with a happy smile, as if he had gained the whole world. He now finally understood how Hugo had felt when he showed such an expression back then. He wanted to tell Hugo that he too had met such a woman, and that he had already married her. After their walk, the Duke went to the study. Fabian presented a thick stack of reports. Although they were all minor rumors that caused no real harm, the Duke found that the capital was gossiping about him giving Lucia a mine as a betrothal gift. What shocked the Duke even more was the rumor circulating that the Duchess is a peerless beauty, and the Duke, to prevent her from showing her face, simply abducted her back to his territory. The phrase peerless beauty reminded the Duke of Lucia's radiant smile, and he felt the rumor wasn't entirely baseless. After reading the full report, he thought these rumors didn't seem to be anything that could cause major problems. Lucia never expected that she had just showered, and her hair wasn't even dry yet when the Duke eagerly scooped her up in his arms, and ignoring her struggles, immediately began to kiss her. Although Lucia protested verbally, her arms wrapped around the Duke's neck. The Duke found Lucia's feigned reluctance adorable. After their intimate moment, Lucia was curious why the Duke had sent Demian to a boarding school. The Duke, holding Lucia, explained that due to Demian's status as an illegitimate child, there would be criticism among vassals and nobles, as there had never been a precedent for an illegitimate son becoming an heir. To protect Demian from strange looks and rumors, he was sent to a boarding school where no one could interfere. After learning the reason, Lucia suggested having Demian stay in Rouen, but the Duke told her that he had promised Demian that once he graduated, he would inherit his position. If he were to stop attending boarding school now, Demian might feel that his right to inheritance was being taken away. After hearing his words, Lucia realized she hadn't considered everything thoroughly. The Duke instinctively reached out to gently caress her cheek, then embraced Lucia and kissed her. The next morning, Lucia opened her eyes, but a moment later she started feeling sleepy again due to exhaustion. When she woke up again, she found a pair of warm hands stroking her forehead. It turned out the Duke had heard Lucia hadn't woken up yet, so he was a bit worried and came to check on her. The Duke leaned close to Lucia and thankfully said, "Good, it seems there's nothing serious." After saying that, he couldn't help but lean in and kiss her. Just then, Lucia suddenly shrieked, and then pulled the blanket tightly around herself. The Duke was worried, wondering what was wrong with her. Lucia stammered for a long time, unable to speak. The Duke thought Lucia was ill, so he abruptly got up to call a doctor. Lucia quickly stopped the Duke. She poked her head out from the blanket and told the Duke, "Because I didn't dry my wet hair properly yesterday. My hair is a mess now." Lucia didn't want the person she liked to see her looking messy. The Duke rolled his eyes and yanked open Lucia's blanket, then sat down, gazing foolishly at Lucia, and declared, "You're truly beautiful." But Lucia retorted with a disdainful look, "You philanderer, you say that to everyone?" Then she lay down huffily. The Duke was helpless. He thought Lucia must have a long grudge book, having recorded him like that. Lucia was startled by his words. She then sat up and pressed the Duke. "What grudge book?" The Duke was a bit embarrassed, but patiently explained to Lucia, "It's a grudge book in your mind where you record your dissatisfactions with me and curse me. Are you diligently jotting down every single one?" Hearing this, Lucia's expression slowly lost control. Then she burst into laughter, holding her stomach. The Duke, watching Lucia laugh until her stomach hurt, found it inexplicable. He didn't understand why she suddenly burst into laughter when he was talking about something serious. Lucia also hadn't expected the dignified the Duke to have such a strange idea, and to explain it to her with such a serious face. Watching Lucia laugh until tears streamed down her face, the Duke was speechless, still unable to understand what she was laughing about. Lucia wiped away the tears from the corners of her eyes and continued to ask, "When will new entries be added to that grudge book?" The Duke coldly countered, "Why are you asking me? Shouldn't you know better?" This sentence made Lucia burst into laughter again, clutching her stomach and rolling on the bed. The Duke beside her was utterly confused. Lucia never imagined the Duke had such an innocent side. She explained to him with a smile, "I don't have that kind of grudge book you mentioned, nor have I accumulated so many complex emotions." Then the Duke suddenly moved closer to Lucia and questioned, "Then what did you mean by calling me a philanderer just now?" Lucia paused for a moment, then shyly replied, "That's because you suddenly said words like, 'You're beautiful.'" Because Lucia felt the word beautiful didn't seem to apply to her. The Duke couldn't understand. Was it wrong to simply say what he saw and felt? Lucia's heart instantly fluttered. She found that a casual remark from the Duke could stir her heart. Tugging at her hair, she asked him, both shyly and hesitantly, "Do I really look beautiful like this?" The Duke sighed helplessly. "I don't know what you're agonizing over." Then he looked at Lucia with a serious expression. "You are truly beautiful." Lucia froze. She thought, the Duke is so excellent. Even if he did nothing, many women would cling to him. So he probably wouldn't need to say such polite words, right? Could the Duke be telling the truth? Thinking of this, the temperature of Lucia's cheeks instantly rose. The Duke saw that Lucia was slow to react, and thought there might be an issue with his way of expressing himself. He then used all his knowledge to praise Lucia, saying she was indescribably beautiful, radiant like the stars, and so beautiful that one dared not look directly at her. Seeing how easily he said it, Lucia suddenly felt again that he was just teasing her. The Duke was getting a little impatient. He didn't know what about him was making Lucia dissatisfied. Then Lucia bashfully asked the Duke again, "Am I really beautiful?" Lucia knew that even if the Duke was being insincere, she would still be happy to hear his praise. The Duke looked at Lucia and stated seriously once more, "You are truly beautiful." This answer completely captivated Lucia, and she flashed an incredibly sweet smile. Just then, the Duke warned Lucia, "Don't smile like that anymore, I won't be able to control myself." The Duke noticed that Lucia seemed more relaxed than before he went to battle. During the time he was away, he had constantly thought of her. Although he was glad they had reconciled before he left, he still felt something unfinished lingering in his heart. The Duke now understood. He wanted Lucia completely, both her body and her heart. Then Lucia smiled and gently asked him how his work had been recently. The Duke was surprised to find Lucia's tone seemed much softer than before. He realized that being complimented on her beauty made Lucia happy. The Duke thought this was a good discovery. Lucia confidently asserted that the Duke couldn't stop working and had to work hard to earn money to support his wife. Her naive thought made the Duke chuckle. Lucia was very confused. Although she loved to see him smile, she really didn't understand what she had said that was so funny. The Duke said, "Supporting you isn't hard. You don't seem to be very good at spending money even when I earn it for you." Lucia looked wronged. "I clearly spend money. After all, hosting a banquet costs a lot, and I also bought flowers to plant in the garden." However, in the Duke's eyes, these were insignificant. He wanted Lucia to spend his money on personal items, like dresses and jewelry. But Lucia, having been self-reliant since childhood, was used to thrifty living. She believed tailoring dresses cost a fortune, and the ornaments in Tyron's family vault were already enough for her lifetime. Titled families generally had inherited clothes and ornaments, but if there was a divorce, these wouldn't belong to the wife. So, this is to prevent the noble ladies from making an effort to buy a lot of jewelry. The Duke didn't think Lucia could be unaware of this, so he asked her, blushing, "Do you not want to spend my money?" Lucia was surprised. She had never seen the Duke like this. She covered her face with her hands, heart bubbles involuntarily appearing, finding the Duke incredibly adorable. Lucia also hadn't expected the Duke's thoughts to be so delicate. She smiled and explained to him that she simply didn't like buying non-essential items. Knowing the reason, the Duke was still unhappy. He wanted Lucia to spend his money, but he couldn't just order her to. Meanwhile, Lucia continued to gaze at the Duke, covering her face in adoration. It was the Duke's first time meeting someone like Lucia, who had no desire for power or money. He wanted to know what she truly sought, so he could firmly keep her from leaving him. The Duke suddenly wondered, could it be a child? Thinking of this, he helplessly clenched his fist. This was something he could never give her. Suddenly, the Duke thought again that if he could make Lucia feel lonely, isolated, and sleepless when he wasn't around, then perhaps this primal desire could keep her. But before that, he had to confirm with Lucia if she liked it. The Duke secretly glanced at Lucia, then directly asked her if she enjoyed spending nights with him. Hearing this, Lucia was stunned. Then her cheeks instantly flushed hot. She then turned and lay down, pulling the blanket over herself, stating she wanted to sleep more and telling him to go to work quickly. However, the Duke kept pestering her relentlessly. Lucia had no choice but to throw off the blanket and loudly declare, "I like it very much," and told the Duke to stop talking. Hearing this, the Duke was overjoyed. He then stood up and moved closer to Lucia. At this moment, Lucia was frantic. "Don't you have any sense of occasion?" The next day, early in the morning, the Duke looked through the window and saw Lucia and Damien again, strolling and chatting in the garden. He noticed their relationship seemed to be getting better and better. The Duke couldn't understand. Damien hardly ever got close to anyone, yet Lucia, in just a few weeks, had tamed a beast-like child into an obedient puppy. He also recalled the butler's uncontrollable smile when introducing Lucia. He found that Lucia seemed to possess some kind of superpower, getting everyone on her side. However, Lucia was hosting the garden banquet tomorrow, and the Duke wondered if bringing Damien would truly be without issue. After all, nobles in society wouldn't believe that a duchess would genuinely care for her husband's illegitimate son. Many would surely doubt his intentions. When Dr. Philip brought Damien years ago, he told him this was Hugo's son. At first, he didn't believe it. But Dr. Philip explained that young Master Hugo already had a lover. The Duke also remembered Hugo once saying he had someone he wanted to marry. However, after Hugo's death, Damien's mother also died due to difficult childbirth. At that time, the Duke, busy with war, hastily found a wet nurse for Damien and went to battle, never stating that Damien was his own son. But to his surprise, half a year later when he returned to Rouen, he found that everyone considered Damien to be his biological son. Meanwhile, Lucia held the little fox given by Katie and asked Damien to name it. Damien looked down at the docile and adorable little fox, then replied, Let's call it Asha. Lucia was curious. Does the name Asha have any special meaning? Demian stated that he hoped it would have tenacious vitality and grow up healthy, just like the name suggested. Actually, when Lucia asked him to name the little fox, he even put aside his studies and frantically went through dictionaries just to find this name. Of course, he didn't plan to tell Lucia that. Lucia nuzzled the adorable little fox against her face. She thought Asha was truly a good name. Then she directly handed Asha to Demian. You named it, now hold it. He instantly became nervous and didn't know what to do, his hands flustered. However, Lucia continued to urge him. He hesitantly reached out and took Asha, holding it tightly in his arms. He found that he could actually feel the tiny creature's pulse beating. He told Lucia that his feelings were very peculiar. Lucia bent down anxiously and asked, "What's wrong?" Demian felt he didn't dislike this feeling, but it was a bit uncomfortable, and his heart felt warm. Lucia leaned down to Demian's eye level and told him, "This is an emotion called affection. When affection overflows, your heart tightens." Just then, Asha suddenly yawned and nuzzled its tiny head against Demian's chest. This scene brought a heartfelt smile to Demian's face. Just then, the Duke arrived. Lucia told him it was a little fox given to her by Katie. The Duke glanced at the little fox, thinking, it seems she plans to take this little fellow everywhere from now on. Lucia often took Demian with her when she went out, and now there was a little fox too. The Duke couldn't help but sigh. It seems I still have a long way to go to completely win Lucia over. So he earnestly told Demian, fox hunting is a boring pastime. It's not conducive to real hunting. He also told him to return the little fox to its owner. Hearing this, Lucia was very angry. How could he say petting a little fox was a boring pastime? It was clearly so much fun. However, Demian dared not disobey the Duke's words, so he obediently returned Asha to Lucia. The Duke then turned and told Demian to follow him. Lucia, holding Asha, was confused about where the Duke was taking Demian. The Duke replied, "We're going to have a man-to-man talk." Demian then looked up at the Duke and followed him away, leaving Lucia standing foolishly in place. Lucia was displeased and loudly demanded, "Are you two trying to exclude me now?" After complaining, Lucia revealed an angelic smile again. She sincerely hoped the father and son would become so close that it would make her jealous. The Duke looked at the bewildered Demian, feeling a bit awkward. He realized that although he had brought the boy with him, he didn't know what to say. So he casually asked about Demian's situation at school. When he learned that Demian enjoyed reading books, he took him to his study. Demian was astonished by the enormous study. The study had, until now, only allowed Lucia access. Just then, the observant Demian noticed another door in the study. He curiously pointed to it and asked, "Is that a study too?" The Duke, however, told him, "That room is full of trash." In reality, that room held the secrets of the Terran family. Only members of the Terran family could enter, and the Duke intended to burn everything inside before Demian inherited the title. He told Demian, "You can look around freely. If you want to read, you can come in any time." After thanking the Duke, Demian eagerly trotted towards the study. He recalled Demian smiling while holding the little fox. It was exactly like his deceased brother. The Duke realized that the person he missed the most had been by his side all along. Demian had not inherited the madness in the Terran family blood. He was kind, pure, and loved life. He believed that the Terran family would surely be revitalized under Demian's guidance. In the blink of an eye, the second day's banquet arrived. The invited ladies gradually arrived at the Duke's mansion. Katie warmly greeted Lucia, but Lucia noticed that Madame Michelle hadn't arrived. Katie expressed some regret, telling Lucia that she was not feeling well and thus couldn't make it. Just then, a maid told Lucia that the young master was waiting in the first-floor hall. So she hastily bid Katie farewell and left with the servant. Meanwhile, Katie was also concerned whether this banquet would proceed smoothly. She knew Lucia wanted Demian to make his formal appearance at this banquet, but those noble women were ignorant and arrogant, especially regarding the issue of an illegitimate child inheriting a title. Their attitude was one of strong disapproval. She didn't know if Lucia could handle it. The biggest obstacle for this banquet was Countess Wells. She held a similar status to Madame Michelle, and although her reputation was high, she was most obsessed with power, enjoying the flattery of others. Katie only hoped that Countess Wells would not cause trouble and ruin the banquet today. The Duke was working in his study, but he still couldn't shake his concern for today's banquet. He asked the butler about the progress of the banquet. Although the butler said everything was going smoothly, the idea of Demian appearing at the banquet still made him uneasy. Then the Duke seemed to remember something. He asked the butler if he had ever heard the name Lucia. The butler answered truthfully, "I have heard it. It's the Madame's pet name. I only found out by chance when I heard Miss Katie calling her that." Hearing this, the Duke looked horrified. Then he leaned back in his chair as if deflated. The Duke had also only heard this nickname by chance during a conversation with Demian. He had thought it was a special name between them. Now he found that everyone knew Vivian had the nickname Lucia, and only he didn't. The Duke believed that Lucia's heart remained closed to him, never truly open. Ever since his brother's death, the Duke's world had seemed to lose its color. But meeting Lucia brought color back into his world, and his heart, which he thought had long been frozen, began to beat again. The Duke understood that although Lucia was now his wife, Marriage could not bind a person's heart. He worried about what he would do if Lucia were to fall for someone else one day. On the other side, the maid led Lucia to Damien, who was waiting in the hall. Lucia gasped in astonishment, covering her mouth. She found that Damien, in a tuxedo, looked exactly like the Duke. She then urged Damien to follow her, but he stood still, clenching his fists. He was still a bit hesitant. Lucia understood his worry. She told Damien, "You will stand before many more people in the future. Today is just the beginning. You don't need to feel any burden at all." She even put her hands on her hips and declared, "If anyone bullies you, I'll stand up for you." Damien stared blankly at Lucia. Lucia thought Damien found her unreliable, so she said, "I can also go tell your father. He'll definitely teach them a good lesson for you." Damien was successfully amused by Lucia. She directly took Damien's hand and told him to follow her. Damien, with a flushed face, looked up at Lucia's back. For some reason, he found Lucia so dazzling at that moment, her radiance too captivating for him to look away. Meanwhile, on the Duke's side, his secretary, Ashen, delivered an urgent epidemic report. Dozens of residents in a territory not far from Royan had developed the same symptoms and suffered a collective outbreak. The Duke sighed helplessly, then instructed Ashen to arrange for immediate departure and to find a doctor who could ride along. Lucia stood on the terrace smiling, welcoming all the guests. Although she had often organized small tea parties before, this garden banquet was arguably the largest she had ever hosted, with guests of varying identities and statuses. Lucia announced to the guests at the banquet, "I would like to take this opportunity to introduce someone to all of you." Then she led Damien to her side. His appearance caused a stir in the garden. Katie, although a bit worried, silently cheered for Lucia in her heart. Lucia introduced to the guests, "Damien is the young master of the Terran family, and he will eventually inherit the title of the Duke and become the head of the Terran family." At these words, the guests in the garden were somewhat surprised. Countess Wells, however, slammed her teacup heavily onto the table with a bang. This action caught Lucia's attention. She looked at the Countess and asked, "Is something wrong?" The Countess coldly stated, "As far as I know, today's banquet is for ladies. This doesn't seem to follow the rules, does it?" Lucia shielded Damien behind her, retorting with a firm gaze, "He's just a child. Although he's a boy, this sort of thing is common in the capital." Lucia knew her firm attitude might wound the Countess's pride, but she wanted to warn the Countess that even celebrities in the northern social circles were just frogs in a well compared to the capital. The Countess hadn't expected Lucia to dare speak to her this way, and a cold sneer appeared on her face. She had heard all sorts of rumors about the Duchess circulating in the capital, and Lucia's marriage to the Duke was full of suspicious points. She believed the Duke was by no means a man who would settle down for one woman, so the rumors of the ducal couple being deeply in love must be false. The Countess cleverly assumed that if Lucia wanted to hold her high position for long, she would need a reliable ally. Her actions today were meant to show Lucia her influence, thereby befriending her. She coughed twice, and the once bustling courtyard suddenly fell eerily silent. The guests all covered their mouths, sitting as motionless and expressionless as dolls. Except for Katie, because she realized this was the beginning of a banquet breaking. She tried hard to ease the atmosphere, striking up conversations with her neighbors, but to no avail. Banquet breaking is a phenomenon of verbal sparring between the host and the guests. The method of banquet breaking is for the attendees to remain silent. If a problem occurs during a banquet leading to this, the guests will protest with silence until the issue is resolved. If no one of a similar social standing to the instigator steps in to break the deadlock, then according to custom, everyone else should tacitly follow suit. Katie clutched her skirt, thinking that if her grandaunt were here, things wouldn't have come to this. All she could do was try to make some noise by eating. This feeling was sometimes crueler and more terrifying than a real battlefield. Lucia also realized it was a banquet breaking. She had witnessed it in her dreams. Banquet breaking only occurred at large-scale ladies' banquets, and the solution was for the host and guests to reach a superficial reconciliation. Otherwise, the banquet falling apart midway would be a great humiliation for the host. Of course, Lucia knew that sending Damien away would break the deadlock, but she had no intention of doing so. So, with a determined gaze, she faced the crowd in the courtyard and announced that the banquet was suspended. This news caused an uproar among the guests. Back in her room, Lucia sighed helplessly. She covered her face, unable to understand why Countess Wells would publicly humiliate her. It was clearly not worth the trouble for the Countess. After all, in the north, the power of the Terran family was paramount. Like a deflated balloon, Lucia leaned against the sofa. She felt she should have been more cautious about Damien's naturalization and inheritance of the title. Lucia didn't know how the Duke would have handled this if he were present. But then she remembered his indifferent expression when he learned she was taking Damien to a social banquet. Perhaps the Duke hadn't given it a second thought. She only blamed herself for being too impatient. She was worried that Damien would be going back to boarding school soon, so she felt that she couldn't waste this opportunity, but she ended up messing it up. Lucia got up and looked out the window. She didn't know what Damien would think of this incident. At this thought, Lucia felt a headache coming on. Then, she remembered she had sent a maid to call for Damien, but he hadn't arrived yet. It turned out the maid had already gone to get Damien, but he had ignored her. Lucia pressed on, asking what Damien was doing outside. The maid stammered. "The young master, he's just staring at them with a blank expression." Meanwhile, the courtyard was in an uproar. The guests were all gossiping. The Duchess, who is usually so gentle, actually got angry. As for Countess Wells, she was feeling an unprecedented fear. She recalled the harsh words Lucia had thrown at them as she stormed off. "You humiliate the mistress of the Taran family today, and you will soon find it was not a wise move. One day, your sons or grandsons will serve my son as their master. Let your descendants bear the cost of this." Countess Wells had expected Lucia to panic at the banquet breaking, frantically sending the young master away to ease the tension. Then, as Lucia calmed down, the Countess would bow her head in apology, allowing the Duchess's wounded pride to heal, and thus forming a close alliance with her. But she never imagined that everything would go so far beyond her expectations. In the room, Lucia was composing herself. Just then, Katie took her hand, comforting her not to be too sad or feel too ashamed. Lucia didn't actually care about that. She was grateful for Katie's support at the banquet. What truly saddened her was the sense of helplessness she felt upon learning from the butler that the Duke was not at the estate. She was somewhat relieved the Duke wasn't there, yet felt melancholic because of his absence. Afterward, she told the butler, "I will tell the Duke about today's events myself. You don't need to relay it." After the butler left, Damien came to the room. Lucia casually beckoned him over. To her surprise, Damien lowered his head and knelt directly before her. "I'm sorry, it's all my fault." Lucia stood up, stunned. Her eyes welled with tears. "You don't have to apologize. This isn't your fault." Lucia recalled the events of the banquet, and blaming herself, she hugged Damien tightly, tears streaming down her face. Damien had said from the beginning that he didn't want to go. It was she who had insisted, only for it to end in such chaos. Lucia believed it was all her fault. In truth, Damien didn't care about the stares of strangers. He was already used to such gossip. As she kept apologizing, Lucia's sorrowful tears fell like a spring. Damien slowly reached out his arms to hug her back. He was truly fine, but he didn't know why he couldn't stop his own tears. Damien wanted to tell Lucia not to worry, because the moment you said "my son," I'd already forgotten their words. He wanted her to stop crying for him, but his throat felt blocked, unable to make a sound. It was the first time someone had cried for him. In the evening, the Duke finally returned, exhausted. Seeing the Duke's return, the butler hurried forward to greet him. Upon learning from the butler that dinner was not yet ready, the Duke went to his study. As soon as he sat down, he saw a mountain of documents before him. He casually picked up a file and asked about the courtyard banquet. The butler paused, remembering the Duchess had said she would tell the Duke herself. So, he had no choice but to reply. The banquet went very smoothly. When Lucia suddenly heard the Duke was back, she ordered her maid to quickly bring her a towel soaked in cold water. Her face flushed as she thought, "My face clearly looks like I've been crying hard. I can't let the Duke know I cried like this over such a trivial matter." After a cold compress, her eyes looked a bit more normal, but they were still slightly swollen. Lucia was in low spirits. "I shouldn't have cried so much over something so small." She then asked the maid beside her, "Is the swelling in my eyes very obvious?" The maid told her, at first glance, "You can't really tell." Lucia had thought it over. She decided to get through dinner, and then later in the evening she would casually tell the Duke what happened. She was a little curious about how he would react. Lucia never expected the Duke to be so observant. The moment he entered the dining room and sat down, his pupils dilated as he noticed her red, swollen eyes from crying. He then lifted Lucia's chin and asked with concern, "What's wrong? Did you cry?" Lucia averted her gaze, not wanting the Duke to see her like this. She told him they could talk after finished eating. But the Duke couldn't calm down at all. Seething with rage, he demanded to know what happened from the butler. The butler told the Duke the truth. At the courtyard banquet, the noble ladies initiated a banquet breaking. Learning the reason, the Duke was filled with self-reproach. "I shouldn't have left at a time like this. Letting those decadent and ignorant women hurt you?" The Duke was desperate to know what those people had done to Lucia. Lucia had planned to tell the Duke casually after dinner, but now she was like a wronged child. She wanted to tell him it was nothing, but as the words reached her lips, large tears started to fall. This broke the Duke's heart. He had no choice but to scoop Lucia up, letting her lean on his shoulder, and then ordered the butler to bring their meal upstairs to the second floor. Before leaving, he didn't forget to tell Damien, "Go back to your room after dinner." With that, he carried Lucia back to the bedroom. Damien was a little worried. He knew Lucia hadn't left her room all day. He hoped to see his mother smiling as usual tomorrow. Back in the bedroom, the Duke gently patted Lucia's back to comfort her. But Lucia couldn't hold back and began to wail, like a child who cries even more easily when coaxed. It was because the Duke seemed to be telling her, "This isn't your fault." Although the Duke was gently comforting Lucia, a raging fire had already ignited in his heart. He didn't know what those people had done to make his precious wife, whom he wouldn't even dare to touch a hair on, so heartbroken. The Duke thought, I absolutely cannot let them get away with this, because he knew that while Lucia looked delicate, she was incredibly strong inside. And yet, such a woman was crying her heart out. After calming down, Lucia rubbed her swollen eyes. She noticed the Duke's clothes were soaked, and only then did she realize what she had done to her husband who had just returned from work. Lucia felt a little ashamed, so she reached out to unbutton his shirt, intending to help him change. However, when she had undone all the buttons, his captivating physique made her swallow involuntarily, and she unconsciously reached out to caress him. Then Lucia snapped back to reality, quickly turning her head away with a blush, saying she would go get a fresh shirt, but the Duke grabbed her hand, pulled her back, and gave her a mischievous smile. Looking at the Duke's fiery gaze, Lucia's heart couldn't help but race. She was used to being the only one in the Duke's eyes, and she was afraid that the fire in his eyes when he looked at her would cool down. So she took the initiative again and moved closer to kiss him. Then she pushed him away and said, "It's all my fault you didn't get to eat dinner." The Duke was speechless. You can still think about food in a situation like this? After saying that, he pulled Lucia close to him again. Lucia struggled, telling the Duke to wait, but of course he couldn't. He told her, "It's fine if I miss a meal or two." Then Lucia suddenly put on a pitiful expression and said she was hungry too. Helpless, the Duke had no choice but to straighten Lucia's messy clothes and then scoop her up in his arms. He felt it didn't matter if he was hungry, but he couldn't let his dear wife go without eating. Lucia didn't expect the Duke to actually get up without hesitation. She actually felt a little disappointed. What a duplicitous woman. After they finished eating, the Duke came to Lucia's side, leaned down, and gently asked if she was still sad. The petite Lucia leaned on the Duke's shoulder and replied, "I'm fine now. I feel much better after a good cry." Lucia then curiously asked the Duke, "Have you never had a moment like this?" The Duke thought of his deceased brother, but he didn't want to bring it up. He told Lucia, "I have never cried." Then the Duke changed the subject, asking Lucia to tell him what really happened today. Lucia said casually, "It was just that introducing Demian displeased the guests, and I didn't want to back down, so I ended the banquet." She didn't forget to add, "It's just a common occurrence." The Duke didn't believe a word of her nonsense. He pressed on, "What else happened that made you cry until your eyes were red and swollen?" Lucia reiterated, "Really, nothing else. I was just sad because I had hurt Demian." The Duke thought for a moment and figured she wouldn't reveal more. But speaking of Demian, the Duke remembered that Lucia had never asked him about Demian. He had previously thought she didn't care at all, but he never expected her to cry for that boy. So he asked Lucia, "Why have you never asked me about Demian?" The reason Lucia never brought it up was that when they were signing the marriage contract, she had mentioned Demian and noticed the Duke became very guarded. If she delved deeper after their marriage, she was afraid he would suspect she had an ulterior motive. The Duke was suddenly at a loss for words. He found that Lucia always had a way of seeing through people in subtle ways. After their chat, not only did Lucia refuse to be intimate with the Duke, she even tried to send him to the study to sleep. Just now, the Duke had told Lucia, "I called Demian back because of the naturalization." Lucia was a bit surprised. She had thought it was already taken care of. The Duke looked at Lucia and explained, "Even if you had already agreed, I wouldn't have just gone and done it without a word." She truly hadn't expected the Duke to care so much about her feelings. Seeing her surprised expression, the Duke knew she must have been thinking of him as a villain again. So he turned his head with a wronged look and complained to her. This made Lucia feel suddenly guilty, feeling she had wronged him. So she quickly patted her chest and explained, "I wasn't thinking that at all," and frantically praised the Duke as a super great lord. "Before I came to the north, I had no idea it was such a peaceful and livable place." Faced with her explanation, His Grace the Duke seemed unsatisfied. Lucia quickly changed the subject again, saying, "From now on, Demian is my son." Thinking of Demian's radiant smile made her very content. She made a silent vow. Even if she and her husband divorced in the future, Demian would always be her son. However, the Duke told Lucia, "You can treat your son however you like, just don't let him bully you in return." Hearing this, Lucia became very angry and retorted loudly, "Demian would never bully me! You have no idea how well-behaved he is." The Duke moved closer to her, puzzled as to where her trust came from. Facing the Duke so close, Lucia nervously swallowed and then explained, "Because Demian is a lot like you." The Duke stared intently at Lucia and replied, with a hint of intimidation, "If he's like me, then you should be even more careful. You haven't heard the stories about me, have you?" The Duke's intimidating presence made Lucia very nervous. She thought he was referring to drinking blood. He looked utterly confused, not knowing what Lucia meant. Just then, the slow-to-react Lucia realized she had said the wrong thing, and hastily gestured while explaining, "Just some rumors about you." The Duke couldn't help but laugh. He had never heard any rumors about himself. Then he hugged the petite Lucia tightly and asked, "Why are you curious about this?" Lucia quickly denied it. That was in the past. "I would absolutely never think that way now." Watching Lucia's flustered defense, the Duke couldn't help but let out a doting laugh, and couldn't resist leaning closer to tease her. "You really are a bold woman, daring to marry a blood-drinking monster." Lucia shyly replied, "Please don't make fun of me." With that, the Duke wrapped his arms around her and kissed her. But just then, Lucia suddenly pushed the Duke away, saying, "No kissing, you should get to work." Then she shot up, made up an excuse that she was too exhausted today and had a headache, so she needed to go for a walk to get some fresh air. With that, she pushed the Duke hard, urging him to leave. The Duke was helpless, but comforted himself. Anyway, there's still a chance before bed tonight. However, when he came to the bedroom all washed up, Lucia told him to go back to his own room. The Duke was very confused. What's wrong now? Lucia's explanation was, "I've cried so much I have no energy left." A fire of rage instantly ignited in the Duke's heart. He believed it was all the fault of those despicable women, and that he absolutely could not let them off easy. He helplessly promised Lucia, "I'll just sleep beside you quietly, I won't do anything," although Lucia found it hard to believe. She remembered last night, because she had the banquet today, she needed to sleep early. And after she told him, he really had just held her while she slept. While Lucia was still considering, the Duke suddenly slipped under the covers and hugged Lucia, once again promising he would just hold her and sleep. But Lucia noticed his hands seemed a bit restless. Blushing, Lucia scolded him to keep his distance. However, the Duke closed his eyes and complained, "Lately you've been busy with the banquet and Damien's affairs. Now that the banquet is over and Damien's naturalization is done, isn't it time to pay some attention to your husband?" Speaking of Damien, Lucia was curious why he was sent to a boarding school. It turned out the Duke believed, the status of the academy is rising, and it's a good place to build connections. It will definitely be helpful to Damien in the future. The Duke answered so frankly, which surprised Lucia. She realized that it seemed every time she asked a question, he would answer it as detailedly as possible. To confirm her theory, Lucia asked the Duke a few more questions. Without exception, he answered each one seriously and in detail. Lucia found it magical. He would actually answer all of her questions. Just then, he reached out and gently stroked Lucia's swollen eyes, his own eyes filled with heartache. Lucia then snuggled into his arms and said, "It should be better tomorrow." The Duke suddenly asked, "Who started it?" Lucia looked up at the Duke's dark eyes. She knew he wanted to stand up for her, so she quickly stopped him, telling him not to do anything. However, the Duke remained silent. Lucia anxiously urged the Duke to promise her, "If you get involved in high society matters, they won't dare to trouble you, but they'll stab me in the back behind my back." Hearing this, the Duke retorted furiously, "Who would dare?" But Lucia just stared at the Duke with teary eyes. How could the Duke resist this ultimate move? He had no choice but to shyly turn his head and give in. Lucia's expression changed in an instant as she reiterated, "You promised me." Unable to escape her offensive, he helplessly covered his face and said, "I know." Just last night, the Duke had promised Lucia he wouldn't interfere with the banquet affair. But this morning, he summoned the ministers of his domain with the guest list in hand, and announced in a cold voice, "For the long-term development of the family, it is better to rectify the family conduct." The Duke's tone made the ministers feel as if they were facing a great enemy, as if he were announcing that everyone on the list had to die. After saying this, the Duke smugly thought that this level of action shouldn't count as breaking his promise to Lucia. After all, he hadn't done anything. The butler at his side, however, instantly knew something big was about to happen. The ladies who attended the banquet are in for it now. Sure enough, it wasn't long before a rumor began to spread through society. If anyone provokes the Duchess of Tehran, the Duke will come for them, like a fire-breathing dragon. A week passed in the blink of an eye. The domain remained as calm as ever, as if nothing had happened. But Damien could not forget the bone-deep feeling of powerlessness from the courtyard banquet. He clenched his fists, blaming himself for being too weak. If his father had been there, things certainly wouldn't have turned out this way. Only by becoming stronger could he better protect Lucia. The most useful thing he learned at the academy was that ability is power. So he went to the Duke and told him, "I plan to return to the academy." He also stated with a determined gaze that he wanted to be first in his class. "However," the Duke replied, "as long as you graduate smoothly, the position is yours." To this, Damien explained, "I need to temper myself to become stronger. Only then will I have the strength to protect the person I cherish." Hearing the word stronger, the Duke finally glanced up at Damien. "How can you prove that what you learn at the academy will make you stronger?" Damien knew that regardless of his grades, as long as he graduated, the dukedom would be his. But besides what his father gave him, he also wanted to achieve something with his own hands. Damien knew clearly that he didn't have the ability to become a man like his father, so he needed to find his own way to become strong. So he told the Duke with a determined look, "I want to become the president of the student council at the academy, the Sita." Hearing this, the pen in the Duke's hand suddenly stopped. He knew what Damien's Sita meant. In recent years, the influence of the Sita had become particularly prominent in warfare, and it would only grow. The Duke was puzzled. Damien had never been interested in anything other than studying. Why would he suddenly want power now? He reminded Damien, "This is not a position you can get just by burying your head in books. It doesn't look at any graduation results. If you want to reach the top and stay there, you have to be so strong that no one else dares to covet it." Finally, the Duke told him, "You are now legally your mother's son." Speaking of his mother, Damien suddenly became a little shy. The Duke then told Damien to go and inform Lucia that he was returning to the academy. When Lucia suddenly learned that Damien was returning to the academy, she was sad, thinking it was because of the banquet incident. Damien shook his head and explained, "I just need to keep up with my coursework." But Lucia still felt a little dejected. Seeing that Lucia wasn't saying anything, Damien asked her what was wrong. Lucia thought, "If you're leaving tomorrow, can you take a day off from studying today?" She looked at Damien expectantly. "Why don't you chat with me? Tell me what life at the academy is like." Damien happily agreed. The two of them spent a rare and wonderful time together. Today was the day Damien returned to the academy. Lucia turned into a mother hen, nagging him endlessly to eat well and take care of his health. The Duke, however, reminded her with some impatience, "That's about enough." Lucia tried hard to think if there was anything else she needed to tell him. Just then, the butler brought a basket over and gave it to Lucia. She took the basket and handed it to Damien. "Asha seems to have accepted you as master, so take it with you." But Damien was a bit worried. The academy doesn't seem to allow pets. At this, Lucia looked at the Duke and said, "You don't have to worry about that. Your father will take care of it." The Duke also nodded. Lucia hoped that with Asha's company, Damien wouldn't be so lonely in his academy life. Damien was stunned for a moment, then took Asha and thanked Lucia. Finally, he bowed and said, "I must be going now. Please take care of yourself." Just as Damien turned to get on the carriage, Lucia suddenly called out to him. Damien stopped and looked at her, poking his head out of the carriage in confusion. Lucia wanted one last hug before he left. After Damien agreed, Lucia ran to him and hugged him tightly. This period of time together had made Damien understand that the relationship between the Duke and Duchess was very intimate, so sooner or later they would have a child of their own. His own position would then become precarious, and he could never compete with a legitimate heir. Damien hugged Lucia back with both arms, but now, he no longer cared. He just wanted to protect this warmth and his mother's smile. Lucia told Damien affectionately, "Because of you, I've been happy every single day. I'll miss you, and I'll write to you." These words brought immense warmth to Damien, who had never felt a mother's love. He felt he would never forget this moment for the rest of his life, including Lucia's expression and this warm embrace. And he would remember this day as he strived to become stronger. Finally, Damien gave Lucia a kiss on the hand and confessed affectionately, "Dear mother, though I don't know when we'll meet again, I wish you peace and happiness." Lucia was so moved by the word mother that tears welled up in her eyes. Watching Damien's carriage recede into the distance, Lucia leaned against the Duke's chest, unable to calm down for a long time. Meanwhile, in the carriage, Damien gently stroked Asha, understanding that even if one day a younger brother or sister was born to take his place as heir, he would willingly give it up, because even if that happened, this precious feeling would not change. After Damien left, Lucia was in very low spirits. She remembered that was the first time Damien had called her mother, and now she couldn't hear it anymore. But then she remembered the image of Damien kissing the back of her hand, and thought, Damien is so young, and already such a flirt. He's truly the Duke's son. Lucia automatically tuned out the maid's repeated calls for her to take a bath. Completely lost in her own world, Lucia thought, I absolutely cannot raise Damien to be the kind of bad man who makes girls cry. At first she worried that Damien was too mature, but after spending time with him she realized her worries might have been unfounded. Damien wasn't precocious because of his environment. His thought process had been adult-like from the very beginning. He must be a genius. He was too intelligent, which made it difficult for him to have a normal childhood. In her dreams, Lucia had seen a child similar to Damien. His name was Bruno, a year older than Damien, with silver white hair and gray eyes. Bruno would often cause trouble to vent his dissatisfaction with his father, like using clever little tricks to drive away tutors. It ended with his father rewarding Bruno by sending him to study at the academy. Although both were genius boys, Lucia thought, Damien is much cuter than Bruno. Just then, the Duke suddenly appeared and lifted Lucia's chin. Lucia was still surprised by his appearance, but the Duke went straight in for a kiss, pushing her down onto the sofa. Only then did Lucia react and push the Duke away, saying with a blush, I haven't bathed yet. The Duke was speechless. Why do you always have to torture me like this? Then, with a burst of boyfriend power, he lifted Lucia high and carried her on his shoulder to the bathroom. Lucia wanted to ask the maids to save her, but unexpectedly, the maids tactfully slipped away from the bathroom as if their feet were greased. Lucia covered her flushed face in shame, feeling utterly mortified. After their bath, they went to the bedroom, and Lucia snuggled in the Duke's arms. She still had many questions about Damien, but to her surprise, the Duke said, I don't want to hear you talk about other men in bed. Lucia was speechless. What other men? He's your son. But the Duke retorted, even so, he's not a daughter. Lucia was somehow convinced, feeling that he might have a point. But what she found strange was that although the Duke had said he didn't dislike Damien, he had never shown a father's loving side. His attitude was bordering on indifference. What surprised her even more was that such a cold Duke could have such a well-behaved and kind child like Damien. So she wanted to know what kind of person Damien's birth mother was. Lucia believed that seeing his birth mother occasionally would be better for the child's development. as no matter how hard she tried, her love could never compare to that of a biological mother. However, the Duke told Lucia, "She's dead." This answer was completely unexpected. Still, she thought, Damien's birth mother must have been a great beauty. Unexpectedly, the Duke replied in a cold tone, "I don't know, I've never even met her." These words made Lucia furious. The Duke also realized he had misspoken, and grabbed Lucia's arm, wanting to explain, but not knowing how to start. The Duke's hesitation to explain made Lucia even angrier. She said coldly, "Go to sleep and lay down." Lucia was deeply hurt, and she couldn't help but wonder, if a woman who bore him a child isn't even worth remembering, how much do I, who can't even have children, weigh in his heart? At this thought, Lucia resentfully questioned the Duke. "You'll probably forget what I look like in the future, won't you? After all, you can't even remember the woman who gave you a child." The Duke was flustered but still didn't know how to explain. All along, Lucia had told herself not to be impatient, because the path to loving him was bound to be difficult. But every time she saw the Duke's ruthless and cold side, her seemingly firm resolve would crack a little. She didn't even dare to hope she could melt the Duke's icy heart. Lucia knew the Duke didn't dislike her. Perhaps he even liked her a lot, but it wasn't love. At this thought, Lucia's emotions suddenly broke down. She sat up and demanded loudly, "What on earth do you mean, never even met her? How can someone you've never met bear your child?" The Duke frantically tried to calm her down, but the current Lucia was in no mood to listen. The Duke had no choice but to look into her eyes and shout, "Lucia!" After Lucia calmed down, the Duke finally confessed, "Damien is actually my twin brother's son, so technically he's my nephew," although Lucia was utterly shocked. She was more concerned about whether Damien himself knew. The Duke said, "Besides myself, no one knows about this, including you now." Lucia asked the Duke, "When Damien grows up, will you tell him the truth?" The Duke's plan was, "As long as he doesn't ask, I won't tell him." She was a bit surprised. "If you never tell him, does that mean I have to keep this secret forever?" But what puzzled Lucia was, since Damien isn't an illegitimate child, he shouldn't be subjected to all this prejudice. Then she thought again, and felt that wasn't right either. Being an illegitimate son is better than having the title of a patricidal, rebellious son, because in the version of the story Lucia had heard, the abandoned twin brother had killed his father for revenge. Just then, the Duke told Lucia, "Actually, there's more to that story. That fellow was forced into it. He had no choice but to do what he did." Of course, the former Duke brought some of it upon himself. Lucia was very surprised. She noticed the Duke referred to his twin brother very naturally, as if they had known each other for years. She wanted to know more about how close the Duke and his brother were, but the Duke's eyes grew sad, and he only replied, "Very close," not wanting to reveal more. He clenched his fist and explained to Lucia, "It's not that I'm unwilling to tell you, but this is something I would rather die than let anyone know." At that moment, Lucia took the Duke's hand. She understood him very well, because she had her own secrets. All the things she had experienced in her dreams, she planned to take to her grave. Lucia comforted him. "If telling your secret brings you pain, then you don't have to tell anyone." But the Duke was worried. "But not telling you this secret will cause you pain," Lucia replied. "In that case, I'll leave it to you. Please decide then whether you can tell me this secret or not." The Duke paused for a moment, then smiled and said, "I understand." Lucia caressed his cheek, and they looked at each other with deep affection, then embraced tightly. Lucia whispered in the Duke's ear, "Damien is your son, and he is also my son. That will not change." Although her feelings for Damien wouldn't change, Lucia still felt a little regretful that she couldn't be the mother of her own biological child. Lucia realized the Duke seemed terrified that if they had a child, the Terran family history would become public, just as she was afraid the events from her dreams would become reality. After learning Damien's true parentage, Lucia finally understood why she always felt Damien and the Duke were not alike. Hearing this, the Duke was speechless. "Didn't you say before that we were cast from the same mold?" Lucia explained. "In terms of looks, that's true, but their inner selves are completely different. Damien is pure, kind, and well-behaved. Those words don't seem to fit you at all." The Duke instantly felt like he had taken 10,000 points of critical damage, but the next second he smiled, hugged Lucia tighter and said, "But I'm also pure and well-behaved for you." Lucia was instantly flustered and blushed. The next second, she hugged the Duke's head and laughed happily. The Duke then took the opportunity to push her down. Lucia was curious. "Since Damien looks so much like you, your brother must have looked exactly like you, right?" But the Duke grumbled, "That guy only looks okay on the outside, but he's actually a goody-goody." Lucia understood. It seems Damien takes after his father. That's why he's so pure and adorable. Lucia also wanted to know the name of Damien's father. Speaking of the name brought back painful memories for the Duke. Lucia noticed the Duke's hesitation and said, "It's okay if you don't want to say it." But after a moment's hesitation, the Duke still told her that his brother's name was Hugo. Lucia covered her mouth in surprise, because she found that name was so similar to the Duke's. The Duke was puzzled. "How is it similar?" Lucia repeated Hugh and Hugo, and then said, "If you say them quickly, don't they sound the same?" The Duke was stunned, because what Lucia had just said and her expression while saying it were exactly like his deceased brother. Lucia caressed the Duke's cheek. "Does your name contain both your and your brother's names?" The Duke held Lucia tightly, calling her name over and over. Lucia responded passionately. The Duke now understood that his heart was no longer his own. Without Lucia, he might die. The next day, the Duke finally found an opportunity to take revenge on Countess Wells for making Lucia cry. He gave a wicked smile. Although Lucia had asked him not to intervene, the Duke had held a grudge. He had been waiting for a chance to get leverage on the Wells family, and this time, he wouldn't let them off easily. The Duke ordered his subordinate, Elio, to investigate the past transaction details and taxes paid by the involved merchant guild. He specifically emphasized, "Don't miss a single speck of dust." Although Elio didn't know what had happened, he understood that the Wells Merchant Guild was now thoroughly targeted by his master. And the Duke was not only someone who held a grudge, but his retaliation was also relentless. Not long after, Lucia hosted another tea party, and Katie came specially to support her. Lucia was grateful that Katie always worried about her. Katie had heard from her father. The Duke of Tehran became infamous for killing all the lords and their families in the rebellious territories, striking extreme fear into the northern nobility. During that time, the Duke also specially summoned the nobles for a stern reprimand because Lucia had been insulted. So the husbands or fathers of the noblewomen specifically demanded that they attend Lucia's tea parties. Everyone was being swept up by the storm. Only Lucia, at the center of the storm, was completely unaware and appeared very calm. Katie knew that only she could explain the current situation to Lucia, but she felt there was no need to tell her and make her worry about it. Ever since the Duke stood up for Lucia, the noble women of the north would rack their brains to attend the banquets she hosted. Lucia also felt the atmosphere was a bit strange on the day of her tea party. Although everyone's attitude was more or less the same. Those who had attended before looked a bit bewildered and were especially cautious. And those who hadn't attended the courtyard banquet kept bringing up Demian as if they were trying to curry favor. Katie was excited inside, wanting to tell Lucia the truth. "It's all because your husband is terrifying." But she knew she absolutely couldn't say that, so she just told Lucia not to worry too much. Katie was ecstatic inside. No one will ever dare to mess with Lucia again. Lucia looked at Katie's smile and felt it was strangely odd. After that, Lucia received a letter from Demian, and it was 3 pages long, filled with dense text. Demian's letter was like a report. What classes he attended, what he said were all clearly laid out, as if she could witness his life firsthand. The letter ended with, "The weather is getting cold. Please take care of your health. Sincerely, Demian." After reading the whole letter, Lucia was very pleased. Then she remembered that the end of the year was approaching, and she needed to start preparing a gift for Demian. Just then, a maid informed Lucia that she had a visitor. It was the haggard-looking Countess Wells. At first, Lucia was very confused about who this person was. After the maid explained, Lucia was shocked. She's lost weight so quickly. Then Lucia composed herself and said coldly, "I was very displeased with what you did at the banquet." However, to Lucia's surprise, Countess Wells directly admitted, "It was I who was old and foolish," and even pleaded for Lucia's magnanimity and forgiveness. Lucia was a bit surprised. She never expected Countess Wells to bow her head and admit her mistake so easily, which made her suspect something was amiss. But since Countess Wells had apologized, the kind-hearted Lucia didn't plan to pursue the matter further, so she accepted the apology and prepared to leave. Just then, Countess Wells called out to Lucia. She had an impertinent request to ask of her. Hearing this, Lucia was a little angry. How dare she ask me for a favor? It turned out she wanted to ask Lucia to appease the Duke's anger. And she confided in Lucia about the difficulties her family's merchant guild was facing, hoping His Grace the Duke would show mercy. That evening, Lucia brought this up with the Duke. However, the Duke believed, as a leader, it is perfectly reasonable to summon my vassals to rectify their family conduct, but Lucia found it absurd. There are already rumors that you severely punished the Countess Wells's merchant guild because of the courtyard banquet. You are someone who clearly separates public and private matters. The Duke felt very awkward, and could only say guiltily, "Of course." Shortly after, following a thorough investigation, the Countess Wells's merchant guild was finally cleared of wrongdoing. But the amount of the levied fine remained unchanged. Thus, the Duke of Tehran's identity as a fiercely protective husband became a consensus in northern society.